The hero kicked him out of the party because he wasn't doing anything. No damage, no flashy skills, just standing there. So he left without arguing. The only problem? The moment he walked away, the entire party started falling apart. Because the strongest team in the world wasn't strong on their own, they were standing inside his fully automatic buff the whole time. He buffs allies without even thinking, and weakens enemies just by existing. The story begins with Ares, the group's leader, telling the protagonist, Slad to pack his things and get out of their group. The protagonist thought, no offense, after all, Ares is the only one who can save the world. He thanked the leader out loud for caring about him and asked him to do everything he could to save the world. He's a hero. He wondered, however, if he could cope without his support. After a while, MC thought about it. He'd been kicked out of the hero's group the night before, making him a former adventurer. Initially, an old friend had asked him to join the group. He begged him to just hang out and keep his skills a secret. Slad thought he could help, but that wasn't the issue right now. He had no money for travel or food. Looking at the 2 coins, the empty flask, and a couple of requests, he realized he couldn't do anything without reason, or everything would be taken from him. Well, consider it a gift for the hero. It couldn't be helped. He needed to find a job. He came to the Adventurers Guild. This organization collects medicinal herbs and materials, as well as slays monsters. He said he hasn't been here in a long time. The protagonist resolutely walked towards the guild. Along the way, he encountered an elderly woman whose back suddenly started to hurt, causing her to drop a bag of groceries. The protagonist approached her and asked if she was okay. He can help. He couldn't just ignore her. She said, let him forgive her. Her back is giving out because of her age. Suddenly, the woman straightened up and said in surprise, I think she feels better, as if her body had become lighter. He replied with a smile, that's great. He thought, full automatic support. His ability must have worked on its own, since he helped the old woman. The effect is a temporary increase in physical capabilities and compensation for ailments by supporting muscles. As the name suggests, his skill is not under his control, but he knows that it will be triggered by his desire to help someone. He thought about his former group, wondering if everything is alright with the others, but then he stopped himself. No, automatic support is not such a great skill. This is a group of heroes. They are strong without it. After a while, the woman thanked him for seeing her off. There was no need to overexert himself like that. MC countered that one should always help those in trouble. He can't use automatic support on himself, but he uses it for the benefit of others. If he can't save the world directly, then at least he will help those around him. The woman smiled and asked if he wanted some honey. Slad thought it was very tasty. How he loved sweets. But out of modesty, he began to refuse the treat. At that moment, his stomach growled treacherously, and she insisted he go eat. He thanked her for the treat. Sometime later, the protagonist arrived at the guild. The room was very lively. Adventurers were drinking foamy drinks, arm wrestling, and having a great time. The registrar, Selenia, greeted him and asked if he wanted to join the guild. He sheepishly replied that he had once been an adventurer but had retired. The girl asked, then, does he have an adventurer's badge? The protagonist, confused, said he didn't think he'd need one. He didn't have one with him. Selenia handed him a pen case and some paper and said, then, let's fill out this form so they can verify the information with their headquarters. He asked, surprised, if this would somehow identify him. The girl replied, exactly. After all, it was magic ink. MC looked at the object in bewilderment and thought, wow, this pen can really help identify him? Then he needs to write every letter clearly. After he did everything, Selenia told him she'd call him as soon as they confirmed his identity. So please let him wait. At that moment, Gonza's rough voice rang out, shouting at Ethica. Have she completely lost her nerve? The elf replied irritably. Instead of groping someone, he should at least go hunt one goblin. Does he even know he's a bearded old man? Gonza was indignant at her words. Slad thought in surprise, looking at the girl. An elf? He'd heard that race doesn't like the smell of alcohol, so you don't often see them in establishments like this. She's practically naked. She's wearing minimal clothing. Then he looked at Gonza and noted, given his equipment, he was most likely a veteran. And this elf, she probably only recently arrived from her homeland. The adventurer slammed his hands on the table and exclaimed, does she even know? The protagonist decided to intervene, stood between them, and asked why they couldn't just disperse peacefully. Ethica exclaimed angrily, what is he talking about? Let him stay out of it. Hansa supported her. She was right. Then he told her, he just christened her in the guild. She should be grateful. Ethica was outraged. What did he say? The MC decided not to give in. He asked the disputants to cool down and told the girl not to give in to the provocations of someone head and shoulders above her. Then he looked at the adventurer and said, it was terrible of him to treat her so rudely. Hansa exclaimed in bewilderment, what? Filling with anger, he continued gloomily. He hadn't seen his face before. Judging by his equipment, he's just another newbie. Slad realized the man was furious, and indeed, he angrily threw the mug of drink back, spilling its contents, and his swing created a powerful current of his power. The adventurer angrily shouted in the protagonist's face, any insolent person in this guild needs to be disciplined. They should leave. The protagonist responded with confusion. He didn't think they needed to go that far, but seeing the man's reaction, he thought it best to agree to his proposal. Hansa abruptly moved toward the exit, MC rushing after him. Suddenly, Suddenly, Ethica caught his arm and exclaimed with excitement. It's her fault. She'd crossed the line, so he shouldn't do it. Hansa stopped, turned around, and sternly told her, this concerns only him and this insolent person, not her. Slad yanked his hand from Ethica's and left. Everyone watched them tensely. After a while, the protagonist asked their opponent if he wanted to do this right on the main street. Maybe they should go around a corner somewhere. The adventurer muttered, it's fine, he needs to punish him so everyone can see. Wasting no time, Gonza lunged at him like an enraged beast. At that moment, the protagonist heard the onlookers muttering, isn't that Gonza, the bear slayer? He's a rank B adventurer in the guild. There's no one stronger in the area. Ethica was confused, thinking, such a strong opponent? So this guy protected her? At that moment, Selenia appeared and thanked MC for waiting. But realizing he wasn't there, she asked in surprise, has anyone seen where the guy who was standing there disappeared to? Ethica told her that the guy named Gonza got angry and took the newcomer out into the street. Selenia asked in confusion, Gonza? Did that newbie have black hair by any chance? Looking at the elf's confusion, she realized it was him. She rushed out into the street, screaming, we need to save Gonz quickly. Ethica, completely astonished, repeated, save Gonz? At that moment, the adventurer delivered a powerful blow to the protagonist's face. He thought about his opponent. This man looks like a huge bear. Unexpected speed and savagery beyond all bounds. These blows are quite powerful. No, they should have been powerful. The adventurer attacked him again, but MC began to deftly dodge his blows, periodically blocking them. Gonz exclaimed in surprise, how fast? Is he really a newbie? Slag calmly replied, no, he's just slow. The adventurer swung again in irritation, but felt short of breath and weak. He was surprised. Why was he so out of breath? Someone in the crowd of onlookers shouted, who is this guy? How boring their duel was. Why was Hansa toying with him? Let him stop pitying him. The protagonist, looking his opponent in the eye, asked if they should finish. He didn't want to humiliate such a promising adventurer. Wasn't his armor heavy? Hansa roared angrily. He shouldn't be messing with him like that. He tried to rush toward the insolent newcomer, but his body wouldn't obey him. He exclaimed in bewilderment that he couldn't move. What had this insolent man done to him? The protagonist calmly replied, nothing. Because he was being turned against him, his skill was making him weaker and weaker through automatic weakening. The adventurer, confused, asked again, automatic weakening? What kind of skill is that? MC declared, it's a unique skill. These skills are incomparable. They can't be acquired naturally. Those who possess such skills have always gone down in history as heroes, and each such gift is unique. One can only receive it once in a lifetime. Hansa thought in surprise. If this guy possessed a unique skill, then he was incredibly powerful. He asked why he was revealing his abilities to someone like him. There must be people who envy his abilities and want to kill him, or organizations that would like to take advantage of them. Information about skills should be the most secret knowledge. The protagonist replied that it was because he wanted him to stay alive. Please, let him surrender. Hansa asked irritably, surrender? How could he lose to such a rookie? The protagonist told him to be quiet. If he didn't surrender, his muscles would gradually weaken and his bones would break. Without them, his internal organs would be torn apart. Then he would lose consciousness and die. The adventurer, again stopping short of moving, angrily exclaimed, don't joke around with him. There was no way he, a B-rank adventurer, would succumb to something like this. This was sheer nonsense. At that moment, the destroyer began to break down so much that the aura around him changed. He screamed in an inhuman voice, as if he were being torn apart. He could barely speak. The armor suddenly felt heavy. MC replied, that's why he asked about the armor. The rate of muscle loss is more noticeable than expected. If this continues, it will be quite dangerous. Let him say that he wants to surrender. The same thought repeatedly crossed Gonza's mind. Surrender? Lose to some newbie? The protagonist began to hurry him, but the adventurer still wouldn't give up. Would the strongest adventurer in the city lose to some newbie? At that moment, Selenia addressed the protagonist as an SSS-ranked adventurer and said that the guildmaster wanted to meet him. Gonz, hearing her words, thought in bewilderment, so he's not a newbie. After that, he lowered his head to the ground, indicating his surrender. MC thought, great, it seems his hostility has disappeared. Suddenly, Ethica ran towards the protagonist, and he noted with surprise that she was completely naked. The elf threw herself at him with an embrace, knocking him to the floor. The protagonist thought with confusion, suddenly being hugged by a nearly naked woman? What on earth was going on? Ethica exclaimed. She was so happy. She was so afraid he would get hurt because of her. Tears welled up in her eyes. He threw her off and said, so that's it, let her forgive him for making her worry. The girl saw his questioning look and told him her name. He apologized again for bothering her and thanked her. Those present murmured in confusion, and the receptionist said, he's an SSS-ranked adventurer? That can't be. At that moment, someone greeted the guildmaster who had arrived. He addressed the MC as an SSS-ranked adventurer and said that their guild apologized for the inconvenience. Everyone present confirmed his rank and exclaimed in surprise, wow. Slad thought sheepishly. He would have been glad if the guildmaster hadn't said that. Sometime later, over tea, the guildmaster said enthusiastically, to think that an SSS-ranked adventurer could appear in a guild like theirs. The protagonist sheepishly replied, what was he talking about? That was in the past. The guildmaster remarked, what modesty. The weakest dragon slayer, peerless, invincible, unemployed. He had heard rumors from overseas about his nicknames. The protagonist said, I see. He thought he was truly at a loss. His abilities were quite ordinary, but two unique skills, auto buff and auto debuff, make allies stronger and enemies weaker. He hoped to start a new life here, so he sailed to the new world. The guildmaster asked, so what brought him to their guild? MC sheepishly remarked. Didn't he know? It was about money. The guildmaster laughed in bewilderment and exclaimed, is he kidding? SSS-ranked players have power, status, and prestige. They'll never have to worry about money. Slad, confused, replied, no, he doesn't have that kind of money, and he lives in the village and is self-sufficient. The guildmaster laughed and asked, is he joking again? The protagonist was confused. Why didn't he believe it? The guildmaster suddenly became serious and said, jokes aside, he must have an S-rank badge or higher, and he can get free food, drinks, and lodging from guild member shops. The protagonist was surprised by this. Much later, leaving the guild, he looked at the organization building and thought, wow. For the first time, his rank had come in handy. Ethica was watching him from behind a tree. He sensed something and turned around, but she had already hid behind it. A dreamy smile played across the elf's face. Meanwhile, Disha and Romeri angrily asked their leader, what do you mean? Slad couldn't possibly have run away without telling them. Alex casually replied, he couldn't care less about that little fish. The girls, without a word, thought in disbelief. He just left without saying a word? Disha said irritably. That bastard ran away, betraying them. She won't rest until she hits him at least once. Romeri objected. Slad couldn't do such a thing. After all, he was the one who taught a half-breed like her the language. Disha didn't let up, but how could he? She didn't understand anything. She wouldn't be able to live peacefully until she beat up the guy who betrayed his comrades. Ares looked at his allies in confusion. After a while, the protagonist held the book in his hands in admiration, exclaiming, this is a story about heroes. He thought of it as a city flea market, a place where you can find everything your heart desires. So, surely, the stories in this book would contain information about the races. Dwarves are stubborn, but strong and agile. Elves show almost no emotion. They are shy and distrustful of strangers. At that moment, Ethica pounced on him, knocking him to the floor. The elf sheepishly apologized for this. The protagonist thought irritably. She seemed too different from the elves he'd read about. An hour ago, the guildmaster had asked him in surprise, a quest for fresh slime from the Karuna ice cave? MC had replied, yes, he'd like to try the ice slime candy they gave him as a reward. The guildmaster had exclaimed in bewilderment, no, couldn't he eat that every day? He had so much money. He'd rather do an easy quest like taming the dragon Elzad in the west. Slad had countered, no, where would that be an easy quest? The guildmaster had then suggested exploring the ancient ruins. The table they'd both been banging on while arguing suddenly began to smoke. Selenia, frightened, turned to the guildmaster and said the table was on fire. The protagonist decided it was best to retreat. At that moment, Ethica, holding the quest in her hands, asked what all the fuss was about. He was overjoyed at her arrival. The elf said there were so few quests she could undertake alone at her rank. If he was free, would he mind doing one together? The protagonist looked at the request and exclaimed happily, it's goblin extermination. He was just looking for something easy. The guildmaster looked at him in confusion. Then he cleared his throat and said that by nurturing newcomers, an adventurer's strength would grow. The guild would flourish, and with it, the economy of their bustling town. MC and the elf looked at him in bewilderment. After a brief moment of thought, the guildmaster said, well, let them set out then, and let them prepare Ethic well for the quest. The allies happily agreed. They began packing. He thought with embarrassment. They were going on a quest, but they had no money, so the most basic things had to be found at the flea market. Ethica, who had been rummaging through all the merchandise, called out to him, showed him a blade, and exclaimed, let him see. She'd found the dagger he needed. The protagonist remarked, it seems like it would do. The elf clarified, but why? His class isn't a thief, after all. He was about to explain it to her, but at that moment the shopkeeper entered and indignantly exclaimed, what's going on here? The MC sheepishly assured him it wasn't what he thought. The man continued, telling them to simply look around while he was gone. They should clean up the place right now, or they'll pay for all these things. The allies eagerly rushed to carry out his orders. Meanwhile, the guildmaster and Selenia were talking. The girl pouring tea for the master asked him, aren't they just supposed to deal with the goblins? Why do they give them this task so easily? It's strange. The guildmaster, sipping his tea, remarked on how rude he was being. Yes, the point is they need to deal with the goblins. Just yesterday, a group of experienced adventurers also set out on this mission and never returned. Everyone's whispering about this mission, and, just in case, they're avoiding it. Therefore, this mission is considered high-ranking. Selenia listened to him without interrupting. After some time, the allies set out on the mission. Ethica asked the protagonist if the goblins were the size of children, weren't they? She'd seen them in the elven thicket countless times. The protagonist replied that they were. Alone, they were weak and careless, but they can become dangerous when they gather in groups. Therefore, it is necessary to occasionally send out expeditions to clear the area. Also, there are goblins who attack girls and engage in indecent behavior. They are called hobgoblins. He vividly imagined what this might look like and shuddered. Then he continued, hobgoblins are the descendants of a girl from the earth race who became pregnant by a goblin. These creatures are smarter and stronger than others. Moreover, some individuals can grow to over 10 meters in height. Then a goblin mage appeared. MC wanted to tell her about this species too, but stopped himself, thinking, looking at her pale face, that he was talking too much. This is not at all something you should tell a girl, Ethica said with a smile. She understands. And he is so funny. She thought she was bothering him with her request to join her, but now she sees that everything is fine. If she had to assemble a team, she would only want to invite him. He thought that elves usually acted differently and distrusted people, but Ethica was completely different. At that moment she exclaimed, "Those are goblin tracks." They followed the tracks that led them to the monster's lair. Hiding in cover, Slad said, "It's them. Their lair is right in the middle of the forest. And how are they going to get rid of the guards?" Ethica exclaimed, "Exactly. She hasn't told him about her abilities yet." She assumed a prayer pose, recited a spell, and summoned the wind spirit Sylph. A creature immediately appeared in space. The protagonist exclaimed in surprise, "She can summon spirits? What, is she a spirit priestess?" Ethica replied that she was. He remembered and noticed exactly. Priestesses have a special skill. The more skin is exposed, the greater the intimacy with the spirits, right? That's why she's wearing only her underwear. Or rather, now he understands why she's wearing such a revealing outfit. And he thought it was just the habits of an exhibitionist. She looked at him indignantly and exclaimed, "So that's what he thought of her." He asked her to be quiet, otherwise the goblins would notice them. Joking aside, let her borrow Sylph's powers and shoot the goblins from here. The elf looked at the spirit and said, "Fine, but it seems her friend is more serious than usual." The protagonist, looking at her bow and arrows, said, "One arrow should split and hit 3 enemies at once." Ethica, surprised, noticed what he said. She'd never done anything like that before. He replied, he can't help her in any way, so she should trust her friend. The elf activated her automatic support and fired at the monsters. The blow was so powerful that all 3 goblin guards were struck. However, one survived. Ethica exclaimed in confusion. What was this terrifying power? She looked at the spirit and said in bewilderment, "This little one is amazing. She's so strong. She took down 3 at once." MC exclaimed admiringly, "Sylph is so powerful." The elf remarked irritably. She would have been glad if he had praised her too. At that moment, they saw one of the goblins stand up and prepare to attack them. Slad, without hesitation, grabbed his sword and struck the monster right in the neck, killing it. Ethica watched with pity. She said in confusion, "She definitely hit a vulnerable spot." He replied, "No, it's impossible to miss under the influence of automatic support." The protagonist looked at her carefully and began to dissect the corpse of the monster he'd killed. The elf exclaimed in bewilderment, "What is he doing?" He answered, "He's collecting materials. His body parts will help them get a reward. They'll use them as proof of victory. Goblins cost a certain amount." Seeing her disgusted expression, he continued, "An adventurer's work isn't as wonderful as a hero's. Money, fame, ambition, these selfish desires drive them. Only the one willing to do anything survives." It occurred to him that Ethica was too kind. Even with monsters, she was so merciful that she involuntarily deflected an arrow. He had no special skills to teach her. He could only show her what an adventurer's life was like. He handed her the blade and said she should try it too. The protagonist remarked that yes, it was a cruel method, but now she knew the truth, and she had a chance to return home. At that moment, the unexpected happened. A huge monster appeared out of nowhere and began rapidly approaching them. Confused, the protagonist thought, "A hobgoblin? How huge is he? Is he so mad that he doesn't even look at them? The enemy must be hostile to him for the debuff to activate. He and Ethica are in danger now." The elf quickly raised her bow. Sylph activated her automatic support, and Ethica, shouting at the monster not to dare touch her family, attacked the enemy, dealing him a powerful blow. MC was dumbfounded by her words. She rushed towards him, grabbed him by the collar and screamed, "This isn't what he thought." He asked in confusion, "What did that mean?" He immediately squealed that it hurt. Ethica said he saved her, risking his life, so they are family now, protecting those dear to her heart. Her selfish desire. Was that enough to be an adventurer? He remembered their recent conversation. She read him a book before bed, which he bought at a flea market. He asked the elf, "Family?" The girl admitted that elves did not get along well with humans, but they called their recognized comrades family, and they cherished these strong bonds for the rest of their lives. The protagonist recalled something from a book. They said that elves were cold-blooded and distrustful of strangers, but in truth, no one cared for their family as sincerely as they did. Looking at the hobgoblin she had defeated, and then at her pensive companion, she remarked, "A goblin's ear, if prepared correctly, it would make a good medicine. It would definitely help heal many bruises." He looked at her with a smile and said, "She really is kind." He would also like to complete missions and travel with her. Extending his hand, he exclaimed, "Welcome to the team." The elf looked from his hand to his in confusion, then happily shook it, exclaiming, "She'll try harder." Ares then asked Shicha irritably, "How could she just leave like that?" The girl replied, "She told me that her time as a member of the hero's team is over." The leader exclaimed angrily, "His team isn't just a bunch of adventurers. She was planning to run away and give up on saving the world. Was she insane?" He rushed after her and grabbed her by the clothes. Shicha turned to him and asked icily, "He wants to stop her?" Unlike the witch and the holy maiden, she was indifferent to the fate of this world. She thought the hero's team was a chance to get more treasure from the dungeons. What could be better? But did he even have anything left now? How did this happen? That guy Slad? Everything was fine until the one they called a simple porter left. Ares angrily slammed his fist on the table and thought, "Him again?" The leader exclaimed irritably, What does this have to do with him? Shicha broke free from his grip and declared, enough, she's leaving. And she's not doing this because she wants to run away or become a traitor. Ares screamed hysterically. Even if this useless idiot had participated in the battle, nothing would have changed. Approaching the door, the girl turned, smiled at the leader, and declared that's what she was going to check. After saying goodbye, she left. Outside the room, Shicha, smiling, heard Ares cursing. She thought, so from now on, she decides where to go. But what if Slad gets angry? Disha once said about his gift. So, she herself understands, when he's angry, he's terrifying. She should be extremely careful. Meanwhile, Ares recalled how it all began. The priest announced that Ares' coming-of-age ceremony was about to begin. Now they would learn his skill. The crowd chanted, he's a born hero. Let him save their world. And so, at 15, he became their savior. The only one who could defeat the devil. He didn't care about anyone but himself. But the entire crowd danced to his tune. He could only revel in the way they bowed their heads before him. He told them he would fight the devil, but he had a few conditions. But that idiot Slad stood in his way. He, Ares, was sure that if that trash disappeared, the girls would finally pay attention to him. Then why did it all end this way? Discord within the team over the departure of a simple porter. Meanwhile, Ethica was telling the protagonist, to the right, above, to the left, everywhere, there's only rocks, earth, and sand. How much longer must they drag themselves through this cave? The protagonist remained silent. She called out to him, and he caught himself, apologized, and replied that the goblins might notice them, so they needed to put out the torches. The elf protested. What is he talking about? It wouldn't be difficult for her, but then he wouldn't be able to see anything. He told her that his eyes would get used to the darkness in time. And once upon a time, his comrade was a skilled thief. Although he walked behind and couldn't see the traps, he was able to bypass them by mimicking their movements. It would be easier now. Here he was with her. She only needed to be on guard and cover him with night vision. Ethics exclaimed with delight. Then he could rely on her. But did they really need to be on guard? That hobgoblin was their leader. MC said. He thinks so. He's very large, so he's most likely the leader. However, the goblin was so lost that he didn't notice them in their path. It was as if he were running from someone. She stared at him in surprise. Rattles appeared ahead of them. The elf, approaching the edge of a huge pit, said, what an obvious trap. Who could even fall into such a trap? He shouted at her to stay put, but it was too late. The girl's legs slipped, and she plummeted into the abyss. Slad caught her arm at the last moment and pulled her out of the pit. Ethica, clinging to him, looked with fear at the spot where she'd almost fallen. She thought indignantly they'd set a false trap, and there was an abyss below. These goblins are too clever. The elf shouted into the pit. They may be goblins, but this is just too much impudence. The last word echoed. The protagonist thought, how deep? Besides, the position of this trap is well thought out. Whether they go around it or go straight ahead, one way or another, the person will fall into the hole, he said. Very clever. Most likely, a goblin mage is waiting for them. Ethica was surprised. A mage? Is he that powerful? The protagonist answered her. A goblin can use dark magic and send effects, exploiting negative emotions. He touched the surface, looked at the hole, and wondered if they could crawl under those rattles. No. If a goblin appeared nearby, they would be at a disadvantage. He wouldn't want to neglect Ethic's safety. MC looked thoughtfully at his companion, and suddenly an idea occurred to him. He jumped up abruptly, and his unexpected movement made the girl flinch. Slad asked her if she could summon the spirit of Nomu, as small as possible. Could she do it? Even though the small spirit was weak, they desperately needed it. Ethic cast a spell and summoned the spirit of Nomu. It was a very small creature, resembling a wooden man. She picked it up and, surprised, noticed it had worked. The protagonist told her to trust him. She and Nomu could handle it, so the battle begins. With the spirit's help, they widened the hole to a manageable size. The characteristic cry of goblins was heard ahead. The protagonist shouted to the girl, they're coming. Watching the monsters advance, he noted, as expected, the goblins were dodging the traps, and they were deliberately ringing their rattles. The goblins, bypassing the traps, rushed forward. MC thought, but they have a trap too. Waiting for the opportune moment, until the monsters were a good distance away, Ethica fired magic arrows from her bow, and the enemies were finished. The allies clapped their hands, and the elf exclaimed in admiration, wow, they pulled it off. It was a great plan. Slad, scratching his head in embarrassment, said, he just thought, if a smart goblin is in charge, then his subordinates should know the locations of the traps too. Then he looked at her and remembered the spirit Nomu, who can control the earth. He helped them expand the initial hole to an enormous size. The goblins fled along a path they considered safe until they fell into their trap. It was a simple plan, but no ordinary person could have set such a trap. He had learned from an old friend how to win by outwitting the enemy. Etika pressed the spirit of Nomu to her cheek and said, unforgivably, that they would have to ask it to fill in the hole that had been so difficult to dig. The spirit muttered something in its own language. The protagonist remarked, seeming to ask them to rely on it. The girl said tenderly, hard worker. After that, they began examining the rattles and everything nearby. Etika kept asking the protagonist, well, what's wrong? He replied, it's no use, there's nothing special here. She, noticing something, told him to look there. The road they had come from and other paths were connected. Also, there were a surprising number of footprints here. This room was definitely used for traveling between paths, so a goblin could probably appear here at any time. So what if we leave Nomu's friends here? They'll definitely manage. MC answered her, but a spirit can only be summoned in one place at a time. He'd prefer to travel this path with Nomu. The girl remarked that this time she would summon a larger spirit and they would all fight together. He exclaimed in surprise. What was she talking about? Right now? No, let her wait. But it was too late. Ethica cast a spell and summoned a spirit that turned out to be simply gigantic. Slad exclaimed in bewilderment. This was Nomu's friend? They couldn't pass until he woke up. The elf sheepishly apologized to him, adding that she hadn't planned to summon such a huge spirit. He began to reassure her, saying that it wasn't her fault. It was probably his fault. The protagonist thought that his automatic support had its drawbacks. This ability unconsciously enhances the skills of the target. It could be said that this skill strengthens a friend's body and slows down the enemy. This ability also bestows power, but it is impossible to control. That's why he recently asked Ethic to summon the smallest spirit. The goblin that appeared looked at the huge spirit in horror and dashed off somewhere. Ethic exclaimed in surprise. He escaped. MC noticed. It seemed so. The direction the monster ran in could be the boss room, so they need to prepare to strike. The elf exclaimed, then it should be her. The girl activated her magical earth and applied it to the exit where the goblin had fled. Slad exclaimed in surprise, wow, she blocked the passage with earth? By the way, they can block all other routes, then the enemy reinforcements won't get through. Ethic said, that's right, when the enemy weakens and tries to escape, a trap will befall them here. He added, they'll put the excavated earth back into this passage. Ethica exclaimed joyfully, let the battle begin. The protagonist enthusiastically echoed her words. He looked at his hand and suddenly wondered when he'd last enjoyed an adventure so much. He'd heard nothing but swearing in the hero's team, and after his resignation, people constantly challenged him for his skill. Ethica, noticing his sad thoughtfulness, asked him what had happened. Why was he frozen in place? She approached him and gazed intently at his face. A pleasant scent emanated from her. He exclaimed, no, nothing. Everything is fine. He thought, after all, this is what adventures are supposed to be. The allies continued on. Along the way, the elf noticed a rather unpleasant atmosphere. Skulls were visible everywhere in the walls, and someone's bones lay near them. The protagonist remarked, goblins love such rituals. It seems the mage is not far from here. Ethica stopped near a skull and, confused, noticed that it was a real human skeleton. At that moment, the aura suddenly changed, and the protagonist exclaimed, goblins! Fire erupted ahead. The elf asked in surprise, are they having an internal conflict? MC thought, but this fire, is it a fire magic spell? In that case, the boss is somewhere close. Suddenly, a throne appeared ahead. MC exclaimed in surprise, no, this isn't just a mage. It was a rare monster, a goblin witch. Indeed, a flamboyant woman sat on the throne, gazing off into the distance with a cheerful smile. Slad thought, goblins. Small monsters that gather in groups. Essentially, high-class goblins are divided into two types. Hobgoblins, who use physical force, and goblin mage, who wield hatred magic. Males treat females as slaves. However, occasionally, a female can mutate and gain the skills of a goblin mage, and then they rise to the top. Before them now stands a monster of a rare kind, a goblin witch. Witch's hatred of male oppression differs from that which drives goblin mages. Apparently that hobgoblin tried to escape from her domain. What kind of place is this? He turned to Ethica and asked her if this monster was in league with the other goblins. He needed to call for reinforcements. The elf drew his attention to the procession, and he wondered in surprise, had they captured the adventurers? The adventurers who had arrived here before their allies, the ones the guildmaster had spoken of, were slowly walking one after another in chains. He murmured aloud, that terrifying path, there were human bones there too. They were going to use these guys in some strange ritual. He knew he had to act, but he also knew it was a tough fight for a rookie like Ethica. Besides, this monster must have some rare abilities. At that moment, the goblins grabbed Ethica and dragged her away. The protagonist shouted her name. Suddenly, he remembered Ares dismissively calling him a porter and a mediocrity, and now he thought the leader was right. An ordinary man, without any exceptional strength. His skill worked on its own, so it went unnoticed. So he tried his best to use his numerous items behind the team, but he was still behind. He always remained in the rear. But now, he could help. Save those adventurers and Ethic. He would be the one to defeat this boss. He shouted at the elf not to attack the witch. Instead, let her attack the surrounding enemies with Nomu. The girl answered, okay. Suddenly, the huge dormant spirit Ethic had summoned awoke and rushed at the enemies, covering the protagonist. He shouted, yes, and ordered Nomu to advance. Ethica, using Nomu, attacked the monsters surrounding her, scattering the goblins in all directions. MC, dodging potential attacks, thought about the elf. Well done. He activated the massive fireball spell and charged at the witch. He thought, he won't let her hurt anyone. Grabbing the stone, he noted that no one uses this move. It's completely ordinary. However, it can be used in other ways. The protagonist activated the taunt skill and threw the stone at the enemy. The witch glared at him, and he realized she would definitely target him with this attack. And then, he would do what he must. The witch activated her magical power, and a huge fiery vortex controlled by the witch formed in space. A terrifying aura emanated from it. Ethica shouted at him to run, but the protagonist was waiting for the right moment for his fully automatic debuff to activate. When his skill activated, the goblins were caught in a fiery whirlpool created by their boss. The boss's magical power was dissipated. The witch screamed in rage. MC said darkly, "She's surprised?" Ethica watched in confusion. Slad thought the witch hadn't yet realized she was weakened. In her eyes, he was simply astonishingly powerful, so she'd use her poison claws and let her guard down. Everything happened as he thought. The witch began to extend her claws. He said, "Too slow." The protagonist rushed towards her and grabbed her hand, squeezing it so hard that a crunching sound was heard. She tried to attack him with her free hand, which held a magical attribute. He had to activate his defense to protect himself from the spells and poison claws. He told the witch out loud that she was already helpless. After a while, she let out a terrifying scream and fell silent, collapsing to the floor. The protagonist looked at her, realizing her hostility hadn't disappeared yet. Ethica exclaimed in confusion. What was going on? He thought the elf knew his rank now. He needed to tell her the truth. That's why MC said the witch was weakened by his unique skill, fully automatic debuff. She didn't even have the strength to stand. The elf asked in confusion. A unique skill? He asked confusedly. That's why Gonza had given up in the fight with him. Ethica exclaimed in confusion. What was he saying? He continued. First, the fully automatic debuff reduces the enemy's physical strength to the limit, and with each passing second, it causes accelerated aging. The changes are imperceptible externally. The effect increases with touch. That's why even the lightest touch causes bones to break with a crack, she said thoughtfully and surprised. Too powerful a skill. MC crouched before the witch and added, however, if hostility disappears, then everything returns to normal. Born of hatred, the goblin witch has no idea how to trust others. Ethica said with pity, poor thing, we must give her medicine quickly. The protagonist objected. It was useless. The witch was experiencing what's called an accompanying effect. It was also possible to poison or drain her blood. This is a rare skill that hits the enemy with an attack intended to kill the witch. Therefore, it is possible to destroy her only by allowing her to die a natural death. It was also possible to poison or drain her blood. So, his abilities proved useful this time. Ethica suddenly burst into tears. The protagonist tried to calm her down. She said she understood everything, but this witch was forced to live only in hatred and curse everyone. What a miserable creature. MC looked at her, then at the witch, and thought, now this hatred will be her undoing. He hoped that at least in her next life, next time, she could be happy. After some time, they freed the adventurers, who enthusiastically told them that they had truly saved them. If they hadn't come to the rescue, they would have already become part of this temple. Then they told Ethica she was a skilled bowman. They and Nomu were amazing, and Slad was cool too, but what did he do? The elf answered them. He used provocation. What an amazing distraction. The protagonist himself laughed sheepishly, feeling extremely awkward in front of them. Everyone set off and finally saw the exit. After some time, when everyone had safely escaped, the protagonist congratulated Ethica on completing her first task. She remembers what she said before they entered this cave, about how her selfish desire was to protect those dear to her heart. Those adventurers were strangers to her, but they were people who wanted to protect the city, no matter what. So, first, they would celebrate. She had saved them. Tears welled up in Ethica's eyes. The adventurers were overjoyed at the freedom and fresh air. Then the adventurers surrounded them, hugging their saviors. He told her he thought she was an excellent adventurer. After that, they all headed home together, exclaiming that they were going to have a party at the bar. On the way, Ethica turned to the protagonist and, thanking him, added that she was glad to go on her first adventure with him. If not for him, she would have failed. Therefore, she wanted to continue working as a team with him. He thought, right, they had talked about this during the mission, and he planned to stay with her. The protagonist answered her, okay, and she exclaimed enthusiastically. They would confidently continue their journey together with her archery bow and summoned spirits. She thought the next mission would be even more difficult than this one. He replied, we'll see about that. Sometime later, at the bar, she slammed her drink down on the table and exclaimed, a fully automatic buff? The MC noticed. Was she drunk? The elf brought her face close to him and indignantly said, so her archery prowess and summoning that powerful spirit are all his doing? How can she accept this without being drunk? He answered her in confusion. He couldn't tell. She looked so happy. Ethica sadly laid her head on the table, banged her fists, and said, she thought she was useful to him. The protagonist, jumping up, exclaimed, that's right, her abilities are amazing. His skill is useless without the support object's skill. She's helped him countless times today. The elf drawled, today they're going to his hotel. He exclaimed in confusion. What is she talking about? Eventually, they ended up in his hotel room. Ethica said admiringly, his room is simply incredible. Such a huge bathtub. The protagonist thought, she wanted to bathe? She added, well, good, and quickly began to undress. MC turned away embarrassedly, covered his eyes with his hands, and was indignant. He was still here. He hadn't gone anywhere. The elf replied, nothing. If it's him, then everything is fine. He thought it seemed he heard something, but he'll pretend nothing happened. Leaving the bathroom, he decided, no, it's Ethica. He'll just go for a walk. Leaning out the window, he thought, she's still underage, right? No, elves age slower than humans. Okay, wait, what is he thinking? At that moment, Ethica approached him and asked what he was doing. MC noticed in surprise that she finished quickly. The elf replied, it's because she's drunk. She looked around the room again and said what one would expect from an SSS-ranked room. The girl plopped down on the bed with a running start, exclaiming in delight at how soft it was. This made her so happy. Slad looked at her, confused, wondering what he was thinking about his teammate. He was such an idiot. Rushing to the closet, he said, "There should be some sweets around here somewhere. Does she want some?" Ethica replied, "Yes, she really does." The protagonist pulled out the sweets and, turning to her, apologized for taking so long. Silence greeted him. The elf was fast asleep. He thought, yes, of course she was tired after her first adventure. He carefully covered her with a blanket. The girl said his name in her sleep and added that it was fun. He thought, fun? Of course. How long had it been since he thought about adventures being fun? After his journey with his old friend had ended, all sorts of guys began to flock around him, interested in his skills. Then he joined the hero's team as a simple porter. His abilities were too well known on the old continent, so he gave up adventuring. However, now, on the new continent, with Ethica, he could make up for lost time as an adventurer. But he should put that aside for now. He needed to think carefully about how to save money for his travels. Returning to his room, he looked at Ethica, who was snoring loudly. The protagonist thought, no, he better think about where he could sleep tonight. He couldn't just lie down next to her. The nights on this continent were so long. Ethica fell asleep in his bed. She was still childishly innocent, but her body was quite developed. He cut himself off. What was he thinking? He had to spend the night elsewhere. He recalled the notes about S-rank privileges. One of the offered perks was free nightly entertainment. Often, a mistake between a man and a woman one night can lead to discord within their team. The guild provided an opportunity to prevent such situations. It's good that this system exists not only on the old continent, but also on the new one. Mitty came to him and informed him that this opportunity differed from a regular summoning in that he could also discuss pressing issues with a girl. He did his best. She gave him a glass of water and asked if he hadn't expected things to turn out this way. The protagonist asked what she meant. The girl said that when an elf calls a man of another race family, it equates to a desire to marry him. Such are elven traditions. He didn't know? He repeated, perplexed. Marriage? Mitty said. First of all, family isn't friends. The protagonist objected, but in a book he'd read as a child, it was written that elves call their recognized comrades that. She said it was incredibly difficult for a girl to wholeheartedly accept a man of another race. Besides, there was nothing surprising about it. A simple-minded elf was helped by a complete stranger, and an SSS-ranked adventurer at that, who wouldn't consider that a gift from fate. And if he so desired, she could become his second wife. MC pushed the girl away and blurted out sheepishly, "He didn't have the money." Mitty replied, "She's joking." She thought the child had no friends at home besides summoned spirits. Among their race, men don't even look at plump women like elves. The only thing they manage to impress their kind is their ability to summon spirits. He asked her if she knew how to summon spirits, right? Had she even been an adventurer before? The girl admitted, yes, she did. With these skills, she could become a C-ranked adventurer. Mitty leaned toward him and said that if she kissed him on the ear like that, it would be a marriage proposal. To show he accepted, he needed to kiss her back. That was the ritual. Let him take care of this child. Elves are very gentle, but if this man betrays them, they will not forgive it. Slad irritably asked her if she would stop intimidating him. Mitty laughed and said, but if they became teammates, he can say it's all friendly, right? He warned her not to try to lure him down a dark path. Sometime later, he returned to the hotel. Ethica was already having breakfast. Seeing him, she joyfully called him over. When he approached her, she asked where he had been. The protagonist answered her that he had been taking a short walk. At that moment, the waiter approached and brought him his breakfast. The protagonist thanked him and thought in surprise, wow. Before he could even sit down at the table, his food was already brought to him. He looked at Ethica and thought, after what Mitty told him, how could he look his companion in the eye? The elf smiled and offered him breakfast. Very delicious. He started eating, thinking he was overthinking it. He couldn't even ask her point blank. After all, if he was mistaken, he'd die of shame. She asked him how he liked these elven vegetables. MC had to admit they were delicious. When they arrived at the guild, Selenia asked them in amazement. They defeated the goblin witch, then she'd send a priest to bury the goblins. But how could a normal team destroy such a monster? They were both safe and sound. Ethica brought the protagonist forward and told her they were able to win because he knew what skills the enemy was using. The protagonist hurried to tell the surprised receptionist he'd once stumbled across this in a book. Selenia, remembering, smiled and said, of course, Mr. Slad is an SSS rank adventurer. He asked her if his rank was that cool. Selenia, confused, asked him, what kind of questions are you asking? MC looked confused and said he just suddenly wanted to know. The receptionist explained, firstly, if a person doesn't have innate skills like combat or sacred, they can't become an adventurer. Furthermore, to rise above rank A, one must have another rare skill in addition to their innate one. More precisely, rank S was created so that people with rare skills would know their worth. SS rank belongs to those who possess a unique skill, but that alone isn't enough. You also need to have achievements like saving a country. Rank S is great too, but among the special SS ranks, there are exceptional individuals who even founded entire countries. He remarked, oh yes, there was such a person. So what about rank S? Selenia said with a smile, it's simple. He's the savior of the world. The protagonist, confused, clarified, so they treat him like a human being, just because he saved the world? The girl replied, so that's it? It occurred to him that he didn't think it was so impossible. After all, his skill was working on its own. Selenia mentioned, by the way, would he sign some documents? After reading what was written there, he asked, is this a confirmation of acceptance of the reward? The registrar answered with complete seriousness, no. It's a marriage license. Let him marry her. Both the protagonist and Ethica were dumbfounded by this statement. He exclaimed in confusion, what is she saying? He should marry her now? Selenia suddenly became almost hysterical, begging him, please. She was in despair. How much longer would she remain an old maid? Simply becoming a wife on paper would be enough. She didn't care about her marital duties. At that moment, Ethica pushed MC aside and categorically declared, no. Selenia exclaimed in bewilderment. Why? She was asking outsiders not to interfere in this matter. The elf was indignant. She wasn't an outsider. Slad was her comrade. The registrar chuckled and suggested, so does that mean she wants to grab him for herself? Of course, SSS rank means status, money, and power, so it's no surprise, Ethica said irritably. A special rank and money are certainly good, but first and foremost, he's her close friend. That's precisely why she doesn't want him to marry a man who only wants his title and wealth from him. Selenia realized her attempts were futile. Under Ethica's intense and determined gaze, she gave up. The protagonist apologized to her and she replied, fine. She had to try, otherwise, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Ethica irritably told the protagonist that she would wait for him at the exit. MC wondered, confused, was she angry? Apparently so. Was he really that important to her? Selenia asked him, what about him? What did he feel for Ethica? He hesitated and headed for the exit, where the elf was waiting. Slad turned to her and thanked her for saying she didn't care about status or wealth. He was so happy about that. Ethica said, offended, there's no point in thanking her for that. That girl was just crazy. Or is this common for humans? The protagonist replied, no, even for them it's strange. She said it. That's encouraging. However, she thinks there will be many like her. He suddenly asked, does she want to marry him? After saying this, he stopped himself and thought, ever since yesterday there's been so much talk about marriage, so it just slipped out. The protagonist immediately apologized to her. The elf replied, that's reckless, he exclaimed. But isn't it customary for elves to call the person of the opposite sex they want to marry family? Ethica covered her face with her hands and said, embarrassed. He knew it. He wanted to say something else, seeing her embarrassment. But she added, it also means the elf feels gratitude. He has no reason to marry her, after all. MC responded, what if he says it's not true? The girl countered, no. She wants him to say that again when he gets to know her better. Wouldn't it be a hassle to marry right after meeting? She squatted down and covered her face with her hands again. Slad felt extremely awkward. He looked at her and couldn't help but laugh. Ethica exclaimed irritably, what's so funny? He said, she's just so cute when she's confused. The elf became even more angry and shouted at him to take away that grin. He'd had enough of watching a grandfather call his granddaughter sweetheart. After a while, he took her hand and said, so they still need to buy some equipment. If they don't hurry, all the shops will close. The girl was indignant. They hadn't finished their sentence. He remembered Selenia's words about his feelings for Ethica. In fact, he didn't know what he was looking for. That's how he'd ended up on a new continent, completely aimless. If Ethica would explain it that way, he felt like she was his family. Slowly, and with all seriousness, he wanted to make sure of that. That's how it should be, right? Their adventures were just beginning. After a while, he was informed that someone was waiting for him in the vestibule, some thug. The protagonist was surprised. Had he introduced himself like that? Stepping out into the vestibule, he froze in surprise upon seeing the new arrival. Shicha said, a very cozy hotel. She greeted him with a smile. She anticipated his question, asking, what is she doing here? He wasn't going to react to her appearance like that, was he? Slav replied that she could always find him, no matter where he was. The girl remarked, wow, how he trusted her. She came to him because she missed him. The protagonist replied sarcastically, yeah, right. Shicha said she had 3 pieces of news. It's worth starting with something that wouldn't leave him indifferent. Soon without him, the hero's team would be completely destroyed, and that would lead to the end of the world. Meanwhile, Ares' team desperately fought the monsters. When they finally managed to deal with the enemy, Disha was surprised they couldn't finish him off in one blow. Ares irritably remarked that the enemy was stronger than usual. She agreed, her blood running cold as he attacked her in her defensive position. The leader angrily asked her, is she blaming him for this? The holy maiden replied, she'd said nothing of the sort. Rumeri noted that Slad was usually the one assisting them. He'd point out the enemy's weaknesses on the battlefield. Disha said grimly, there's no doubt about it. Even in battle, Slad always stood aside. He was never useless. Besides, that guy might have been a simple porter, but Shicha was astonishingly strong. After such a loss, Ares hadn't even tried to find new members, and even less so, to go looking for Shicha. The leader snapped back irritably. Seriously, what was she thinking? They needed to move on. Suddenly, a wyvern appeared in their path. The team was unprepared for this new monster. Meanwhile, the protagonist asked Shicha in surprise, will the hero's team be destroyed? But why would she think that? She replied, of course, because he, an SSS-ranked adventurer, left. He thought she wouldn't notice. He knew. Someone who checked their condition every morning couldn't miss it. MC wondered how he was supposed to know what she did every morning. Shicha continued. After joining the hero's team, hacking and disarming traps always went smoothly. Too smoothly. So she started looking for reasons. If he'd been even slightly secretive, he wouldn't have used his real name. After these words, the girl laughed and continued. The second thing she wanted to discuss was leaving the hero's team. The decision she made would help her stay on top, although she feels sorry for those who remained. Slad thought, Shicha isn't a bad person. Adventurers always have to risk their lives. He said out loud that he didn't think the team would have failed if he had left alone. Her departure was a significant loss, so while she wasted her talents in the local guild, they would move to the big city and find a replacement for her. The thug exclaimed, betting 500 gold that Ares would leave town without reinforcements. The protagonist told her that if she wasn't with them, he'd have to deal with the attack alone. She said it was too reckless, as expected of him. He was overestimating him. In his opinion, Ares would be looking for someone in a small town with no A-rank adventurers, especially since he wasn't even considering men. The protagonist exclaimed in surprise, she thinks so? He's a good adventurer. Shicha jumped up in irritation and shouted at him, he's too naive. If someone whines about needing money, he'll immediately give them everything. The MC, confused, confirmed that it was true. He did indeed cover many people's debts, but he voluntarily acted as a guarantor, so he has no complaints. Shicha sighed, noting that now she understood why he always ended up with nothing. In any case, her bet had been successful. Ares had left the city yesterday with the same team. Slad thought perplexedly, there should be at least 2 attackers in the squad. It was impossible to defend the rear guard alone. If his movements were limited, the balance would be lost. In the worst case, the team would face total defeat. He said it out loud, but that was unfair. She already knew the answer when she made the bet. Shicha pointed out, hadn't she told him not to trust everyone? She had told him, right? The bet he'd made wasn't an isolated incident. The protagonist thought dejectedly, unable to even object. Shicha continued, she wouldn't leave him alone. Of course, he hadn't said a word about accepting the challenge, but that was no longer important. So, the last thing she wanted to talk about would definitely amuse him. Sometime later, over dinner, Shicha told Ethica that she was now part of their team. She stated her name and added that she and the protagonist were comrades on the hero's team. Nice to meet you. The elf looked at her in confusion and irritably asked MC why she only now learned he was on the hero's team. He replied, confused, he was a simple porter. However, he never even dreamed that a professional thug could join their team. Shicha noted that while he had such an amazing skill, it would be more advantageous for her to stay close. Ethica said thoughtfully, SSSS rank and the hero's team. She was beginning to think Slad was the hero. But doesn't he look too much like an ordinary traveler? Shicha agreed. Slad was a fine fellow, she should take his word for it. At that moment, the elf summoned Nomu. The protagonist exclaimed, so the hero's team is in danger, and they must catch up with them? The allies, without hesitation, set off. Shicha remarked perplexedly, very magnanimous, isn't it? Going to the aid of the man who chased him away. But now that he was the team leader, she'd be forced to obey him. Ethica asked if everything was alright. Let them intervene. She'd heard the hero had accomplished many feats. MC replied, it wasn't the best time to talk, of course. The elf countered, not the best. They're literally on their way. Slad said, the hero uses the sacred sword. Shicha mimicked him. He uses the sacred sword. And besides, he can't ride a horse. Ethica expressed hope that Ares would probably survive. Shicha said she wouldn't be surprised if Ares used those two as bait. The protagonist told her she'd fail her probationary period like that. A rude and arrogant man without a single virtue who doesn't listen to others. Isn't that the image of their hero? Shicha asked sarcastically. Doesn't he have any flaws himself? Ethica said sadly. Well, she's willing to help the team, not to mention the hero himself. The protagonist exclaimed, okay, it's decided. He asked Shicha if she'd calmed down yet. The thug replied that she had. MC thought she seemed displeased, but while pretending to be under duress, she continued to follow the most reasonable conclusions. It was actually important for her to go and check on the hero's team. He asked Ethica to stop Sylph's tailwind, which the spirit had used to speed them up. The elf asked him if something had happened. The protagonist pointed to Shicha, who was riding ahead and suddenly stopped, peering at something, and said she must have noticed something. He asked her what she saw. All three were amazed by what they saw. Shicha asked in confusion, could that really be the hat of the witch Romeri from the hero's team? She broke out in a sweat and muttered something about her plan. Ethica sounded confused. A plan? The cutthroat suddenly rushed forward. The elf called out to her, but she didn't even stop. Ethica asked the protagonist if the man who was here was okay. He answered grimly, no. Romeri wouldn't have left a parting gift for her mother in the middle of the forest if nothing had happened to her. Shicha returned and informed MC that she hadn't found Ares or the team nearby. There were no traces of them, or any dead monsters either. Slad drawled, I see. The hat must have blown in from the battlefield. Shicha said, then they need to go back. At that moment, Ethica stopped them and shouted, why are they so indifferent? Aren't their friends in danger? The protagonist apologized for everything turning out this way. They understand how it looks from the outside. Shicha added, they also understand their role perfectly well. If she continues on the adventurer's path, then someday she too will understand. The elf looked at them in bewilderment and thought, well. After a while, the protagonist thought about it, and yet, there was nothing he could do. The thug Shicha was looking for the leader, who was watching from here, looking for any changes. Ethica approached him and apologized for what had happened. He replied that it was nothing, He wasn't angry at all. To be honest, he himself felt uneasy at that moment, but Shicha calmed him down. She asked in surprise, "Shicha?" MC chuckled and asked, "Her comrade has quite a sharp tongue, doesn't she? But when it comes to hiding her emotions, she speaks in a measured tone." At such moments, oddly enough, everyone on the team calms down, including Ares himself. In fact, Shicha wanted to stay on that team, but something went wrong. Ethica said, "I see." Speaking of which, when they found Romeri's hat, she heard Shicha say something about a plan. The allies had no idea that the thug was standing behind a tree, overhearing their conversation. Slad asked again, "A plan?" The girl quickly replied. She had no reason to suspect, but at that moment, the expression on her face was terrifying. The protagonist said he knew Shicha was a good girl, quite greedy for wealth, like other thugs. However, although she puts on a mask of cruelty and malice, she secretly donates her earnings to the sick. Her expression may have been terrifying, but she certainly wouldn't harm anyone. They shouldn't jump to conclusions until they heard her answer firsthand. That's what matters most. In the future this girl is building, they will never regret anything. Suddenly, Shicha jumped out from behind a tree. The protagonist flinched in surprise and remarked that this idiot would get to him one day. The thug shouted to her allies, "She's found the tracks. There's no time to waste. They need to go." On the way, Etika told her that she and MC are so close. The cutthroat exclaimed in confusion, "Where did she get that idea from?" She laughed and then remarked, "Why was she so embarrassed?" Slad thought he shouldn't hear such talk. Then, Shicha said she found out something. She thought Romeri was safe. There were no signs of her burial nearby. Ethica sighed convulsively with relief and said, "How good." The protagonist said, "Surely the Holy Virgin would have seen to the burial if necessary. But Romeri wasn't fit to fight right now. She wouldn't have dropped her hat if she'd been conscious." Ethica asked, puzzled, "Does she have some kind of illness?" Shicha pointed to the ground and said there were small traces of blood, but if she were alive, she was most likely trying to restore her magical powers. "Let them take a look at this." She pointed to a furrow in the soil, and the elf said, surprised, "That's such a deep mark." The cutthroat replied, "Yes, Disha's unique skill, granting victory with a critical hit on the first attack." The protagonist thought, about 50 years ago the demon king Ushumgar suddenly appeared. He was the first and only one of his kind to build a paradise for the undead. Under his rule, monsters grew ferocious. They waged war on humanity. Then the demon king unleashed a spell, shrouding the entire world in a shroud of miasma, the spell of the undead rising. Usually, the guild sends a pastor or a holder of a sacred skill to perform the burial. After all, if the dead body is left behind, it will be affected, witches also need to be buried, but there's no monument or trace of a ritual nearby. Moreover, this slashing mark was probably left by a critical hit. Meanwhile, Ethica asked Shicha, "A critical hit?" She replied, "It's Disha's unique skill. It delivers a precise fatal blow to the enemy, exploiting their weaknesses." The elf exclaimed enthusiastically, "Really? With a skill like that, she must be the strongest." MC said, "No, it's not that simple. The Holy Maiden can't fight. She provides flawless sacred protection. A skill that grants victory with the first attack is undoubtedly powerful. However, combat abilities aren't inherent to the wielder of sacred power. First of all, the strike doesn't target monsters, so it can only be used when a person is cornered. But let her not mention this to Disha when they meet. Although they talk about a unique skill, for her, it's a special topic." Shicha said, "So, there are 2 sets of footprints ahead." Apparently, Disha was carrying Romeri on her back. "It's time for them to leave. Hurry." The allies rushed forward again, following the footprints. Ares and his team continued to fight the wyvern. The leader, tired from the battle, thought this monster was a rare species. He sat on his knees, his arm wounded, his strength ebbing. He noted that the wyvern was far stronger than anything they'd ever fought. He cursed out loud and said he felt unwell. Disha, who was trying to heal him, replied that it was a side effect of the healing. Romeri also struggled to hold back the monster, using her air blade against the wyvern. The enemy skillfully dodged her attacks, attacking in return. The girl thought that the air blade was a basic spell, but it was especially effective against a flying object. She'd already knocked a wyvern to the ground with it once. Attacking the enemy again, she jumped to her feet and thought she'd knocked it down, but the wyvern didn't fall, so it hadn't worked. This only angered the monster. The wyvern redoubled its attacks. Ares healed, retreated to a safe distance. Barely dodging the wyvern's attack, Romeri desperately screamed for him to help them. Ares, looking at the girls, said, "She's not long for this world. The wyvern must be very hungry. A shame, but what can you do?" The girl couldn't believe her eyes and ears. At that moment, Disha, mustering all her strength, attacked the monster, shouting that she would deal with that damn lizard. She activated her unique skill in midair and unleashed a critical strike, smashing the wyvern to smithereens. Barely standing, she said, "Good hit." Afterward, she heard the exhausted Romeri, crying, pronounce the protagonist's name. Disha thought, really, if he were here, he probably would have protected Romeri, just like that time. The first time she used her holy skill on him, he asked in surprise, "Healing?" He wasn't wearing armor, just a porter, but he was so humane and kind. Then he jumped up joyfully and thanked her for healing him. She tried to calm him down, telling him that he seriously almost died. He was so weak, like no one else, that he could have easily died, but he protected Romeri. Ares chuckled and told her she had succeeded. Had she strayed from her sacred duty? Disha simply asked him why he hadn't protected Romeri. Wasn't protecting that child his sacred duty in that situation? The leader objected. Why would he have? How could his sacred sword have helped from such a distance? Disha, in disbelief, screamed. He's a hero. He could at least have used an airblade. Ares sighed theatrically and said, what a nightmare. An airblade is a basic skill. He's so comfortable with his sword that he's completely forgotten about those normal attacks. What's the problem? Even if she died, he could easily defeat the wyvern with his magic. Disha, unable to bear it any longer, slapped him across the face with such force that he barely managed to stay on his feet. He cursed angrily. What the hell? The girl retorted contemptuously. He really is trash. The leader exclaimed angrily. What the hell? How dare she hit him? He doesn't understand what this even means. Disha hoisted Rumeri onto her back and said, they'll talk later. They need to take Rumeri to safety. Ares grinned lecherously, thinking that he'll definitely do it tonight. She's a holder of the sacred skill, so she's probably still pure. And after her, he'll take care of the witch, who can no longer stand. As soon as they take off their gear, when he's finished, he'll shut their mouths forever, giving them over to the monsters to devour. Now that pesky porter wouldn't be a problem. Meanwhile, the allies continued on their way. Ethica exclaimed, let them see. Even in a place like this, there's a house. Shicha wondered, perplexed. How had she managed to notice this before her? A huge mansion, like a palace, appeared before their comrades. The cutthroat exclaimed, she'll bet 1,000 gold pieces that they'll stay in this mansion. The protagonist countered, that can't be called a bet. The tracks of those two lead here, he said thoughtfully, looking at the ground in front of the house. Only 2 pairs of footprints. What about the other people from the mansion? Shicha said it had been pouring here just recently, such a heavy rain, so it's no wonder the tracks were washed away. The protagonist remarked, do you think so? Ethica exclaimed apprehensively. Really, they're going there? MC asked, so what? The elf hesitated, having a bad feeling. Her spirits seemed to have quieted. Slad suggested that in that case, let Shicha go scouting. The girl agreed. Ethica said sheepishly, perhaps she was mistaken. The protagonist told her to be true to her feelings, to always tell them if she thought something was wrong, even if it seemed like a trifle. Ethica agreed. At that moment, Shicha, returning from scouting, shouted, Ethica's just great. This mansion is actually a monster. The protagonist noted, as he suspected. Ethica was indignant. What did he just say? He knew about that? MC replied, no, even though they were dealing with 3 monsters that lured victims in this way. The girl asked in surprise, 3? Slad replied, the first was a house that lay in wait and absorbed magical animals. Inside the second house, a fake hotel, an infinite number of undead were hiding, which had become quite a phenomenon. By this time, the allies were already sitting around a lit fire. The protagonist continued, looking at Shicha. And besides, wasn't there an unexpected encounter waiting for them in the third house? The thug said yes. When they knocked, no one answered. That was suspicious. The protagonist noted, yes, such mansions have no owners, so no one answers. Shicha said that Disha definitely wouldn't fall for that twice, which can't be said about Ares. MC added, besides, someone who deals with the dead couldn't have failed to notice their presence, even if it were a fake hotel. But there aren't countless traces in this house, so perhaps they're dealing with a third type. This is a nightmare fairy, a unique monster. His companions looked at him in surprise. He dreamed it, and he'd gone into the house alone. Entering, he could hear his heart pounding in the complete silence. At that moment, out of nowhere, a creature appeared and exclaimed, welcome to her abode of dreams. The protagonist asked in surprise, dreams? So, he's sleeping now? The creature replied, yes he is. He's already in the depths of sleep. He was surprised. Is this the rarest species, a nightmare fairy? Currently Shicha, hiding behind a tree, exclaimed in bewilderment. A unique monster? Does that mean she's at the level of legendary monsters? The surprised protagonist replied, yes, it is. Of all the monsters, 16 species are considered the rarest. Mere mortals cannot compete with them, for the power of each one is comparable to that of a god. The nightmare fairy appears to them in various forms beyond this world. Therefore, in some countries, she is revered as a god. This mansion is not the fairy's body, but merely one of her forms wandering in their world. Shicha, stuttering with fear, clarified, so she just knocked on her door, shamelessly approached, and knocked. MC replied, he thinks there's nothing wrong with that. Thug exclaimed, nothing to worry about? Slad explained that, in fact, the nightmare fairy is not a bad monster. She won't get angry even if you touch her. Shicha clarified, seriously? So she's not under the Demon King's influence? She's friendly. Not like all those crazy monsters. The protagonist remarked, well, he wouldn't say she was sane. Only the truly lucky can escape the nightmare fairy's dreams alive. As a rule, those who entered her mansion never returned. Shicha jumped up and said she suddenly felt like going for a walk. Ethica shouted at her, is she going to leave and abandon her friends? She replied, she will do just that. Rarest species are the same as the Demon King himself. The elf asked in bewilderment, what does she have to do with this? Shicha shouted in irritation, does she even understand that the Demon King, who has devastated their world with his influence and chaos, is the weakest of the 16 species? Ethica asked in confusion. The Demon King is the weakest? The protagonist noted incidentally that the Nightmare Fairy is the 8th unique monster. If the strength of such monsters depends on their ordinal number, then it's somewhere in the middle. Shicha screamed hysterically. So another Demon King, a new invasion. She looked at Ethic and added, they can only return if they're lucky, then they shouldn't go there. MC said thoughtfully, he doesn't know about those two, but Ares definitely can't handle it. Many believe the fairy forces the lost to have terrible dreams, In reality, people encounter the embodiment of their deepest desires in the dream world. Indeed, then their hero is now a sleeping beauty, Shicha exclaimed in irritation. He'd come to terms with it so quickly. Slad knelt down and said, he thinks they can handle it. Thug asked sarcastically, and on what basis did he come to such a conclusion? He answered, simply, he'd fought a unique monster before when he was on a strong team. Shicha screamed in confusion. What did he say? Ethica winced and said, the two of them are so loud. Shicha didn't calm down. She'd never heard of this before. The protagonist sheepishly said he'd ended up there by accident. But thanks to that accident, he was destined for fame on the old continent. Erika said she seemed to understand now why he was ranked SSS. Shicha agreed with her. The protagonist, confused, said, but this time, he doesn't have that reliable team with him. It's dangerous for two people to go there together. First, he needed to talk to the Nightmare Fairy. He'd try to persuade her to return Team Ares. Shicha asked, perplexed. Talk to a monster of the rarest species? No, it's fine. She'll protect the rear. Ethica asked, what's her role? MC categorically objected. She absolutely couldn't go there. If their plan failed, she should tell the king that the hero was captured in the Nightmare Fairy's realm. She should stay here with Shicha. Ethica, watching him go, said, please forgive her. But what if he doesn't survive? He replied that she shouldn't worry about that. If it weren't for her, they would have entered the dream world without a second thought. Just as Shicha had said, everyone has their role. She had done it perfectly. So now it was his turn to fulfill his role. Approaching the door, he thought, isn't it supposed to knock 3 times? Right? When he knocked for the 3rd time, she appeared to him. This was a dream. Then, right here before him, was the Fairy of Nightmares named Little Nightmare. He had come here to talk to her. The fairy exclaimed in delight. Wow, he realized he was dreaming. In fact, everyone forgets it's a dream when they enter the dream world. The protagonist wondered if it was because he had no desire to drown in dreams. She exclaimed, whatever. He wanted to be spoken to. What a wonderful wish. She simply had to show him proper hospitality. Little Nightmare raised her fist, and as if from nowhere, servants and musicians appeared. Everything around her sparkled with bright light. He marveled at what was happening. Creatures glided around him, setting tables, decorating the hall, and all of this happened with lightning speed. Music began to play, and the Fairy of Dreams, seated on her throne ball, said to him, come on, let him eat whatever his heart desires. He said in bewilderment, he doesn't understand, this is a dream. Little Nightmare asked irritably, what? Was he underestimating her dreams? Everything that happens in this dream takes shape in reality. Drinking water keeps your throat from being dry, eating delicacies keeps your stomach full. Therefore, if he dies, he will truly do so, because you can't wish for immortality in a dream, because being immortal is impossible. The protagonist thought, so, contrary to the legends that all cherished wishes come true here, the fairy can't recreate anything she doesn't want herself. He said out loud, well, if she insists, he'll take her up on her invitation. Having started eating, MC was forced to note that everything here was so delicious. The fairy clapped her hands joyfully and said, I understand. He really loves sweets. He thought, as they said, the Nightmare Fairy is only trying to please the guests of her abode. That's why no one wants to leave here. He almost fell for it. Slad asked, by the way, how to get out of this dream anyway? The fairy answered, it's simple. As soon as he wants to wake up, he will, but he doesn't need that. Here he can live a carefree life, just like in his wildest dreams. He answered, but someone is waiting for him outside. Little Nightmare noticed. Did he mean her? At that moment, Ethica appeared before him. The protagonist called out her name in surprise, noting that the elf was completely naked. She approached him and suggested that they stay here alone. He protested, asking her to forgive him, but she wasn't the real Ethica. The girl objected. So what? As long as he was dreaming, he could do whatever he wanted. There was nothing wrong with that. He was a man. Let him have a little fun. The fairy added that they were in a dream world, so this precious child wouldn't be harmed. He could relax and not blame himself for anything. MC replied, everything was fine. He was already exhausted last night. Ethica's image began to fade before his eyes. Little Nightmare exclaimed irritably, how boring. He still couldn't lose his head in her sweet dreams. Now she understood. He was already sufficiently satisfied. Slad thought that if it weren't for the Adventurers Guild's precautions, things could have ended much worse thanks to Mitty. The fairy asked him what he wanted to talk to her about. He was surprised. She could read the minds of those who entered, but how could she hear them? She asked him if he wanted to wake those who had arrived at her abode. That wasn't allowed. Only they were allowed to decide whether they wanted to wake up. She thought for a moment and then exclaimed, oh my god, what a surprise. Fine, she could certainly grant his wish. But she wanted to hear the request from the traveler's lips. The protagonist replied, then he would say it. Let him enter their dreams. The scenery instantly changed, and he found himself in a forest, where birdsong echoed everywhere. He asked in surprise, what is this place? At that moment, the dream fairy appeared next to him. She gasped and said she was so happy. It was hard to believe he invited her along. The protagonist said, that's true. After all, she's the only one who knows everything here. Was that really so encouraging? She replied, of course. Many people know her, but not everyone wants to spend time with her. He thought, can't she only show you what others want to see? The fairy noted, exactly. This was the little witch's dream. He sheepishly noted that it was somehow impolite to barge in uninvited. Little Nightmare countered, It's fine. Of the three of them, this child was the one most eager to meet him. They found themselves near a majestic building that resembled a testing facility. Rumeri was standing nearby. Meanwhile, Ethica asked Shicha why MC hid his skills from the hero's team. The cutthroat was surprised, wondering why she was suddenly thinking about it. The elf admitted that the question had been on her mind ever since she overheard their conversation about the past. It wasn't hard to guess what would happen to the hero's team without such a powerful support skill. He underestimated his role, relying too much on his comrades. Could she even ask such a question? Slad shouldn't mind, in theory. At first, she hadn't even realized how much her powers had increased. She thought her spirits were simply in a good mood. Shicha replied that it was one of the features of the automatic support skill. It took her a whole month to realize she was under the effect of the buff, but only recently had she realized that, in addition to this, the protagonist also weakened enemies with a debuff skill. Regarding his caution, it might seem like he simply couldn't trust them with this secret, but then again, he was very naive. Besides, he'd laid all his cards on the table so easily, and when they formed a team with him, he'd even laid the truth on the table for all to see. So he wasn't even trying to keep anything secret. He must have had his reasons for hiding his skills from them. Ethica asked, puzzled, what reasons? Shicha said she didn't know. The elf irritably told her, well, then, there was no need to put on airs. The thug suggested, what if the protagonist told her all this because he'd fallen in love with her? Ethica flushed with embarrassment and said, what was she saying? That would be sweet of him. Shicha was delighted. Now she had a new reason to tease them. The elf asked why. Despite such incredible skill, he had such a modest opinion of himself. Shicha said it was because he quite seriously considered his abilities mediocre. The elf exclaimed in bewilderment, is that even possible with his SSS rank? The cutthroat remarked, yes, that's true. For example, can she imagine her life without the special abilities of a spiritual priestess? Ethica replied, it's quite difficult. She never thought she could lose touch with her friends. Shicha pointed out that's the point. Even as a high priestess, she considers herself an ordinary adventurer, right? They are inseparable from their abilities, especially when it comes to the unique skills people acquire from birth. It's no exaggeration to say that these abilities are part of themselves. For MCs, automatic buffs and automatic debuffs are commonplace. Ethica countered, but he should at least feel cool when he uses them. Shicha said, no, he can't use his abilities. Does she understand the role of the adjective automatic in his skills? Their abilities are always dependent on themselves, so they activate and use their abilities at will. But Slad can't do that because automatic skills activate regardless of the user's will. Ethica clarified, so that's why he's so indifferent. The other girl countered, it's not just that, he just doesn't think his skill is all that amazing. The elf remarked, quite cute. The thug chuckled, is that what she thinks? She even envied him a little. Such abilities freed him from the burden of responsibility. It's hard to come to terms with yourself when you have to face the consequences of your own actions. Ethica looked at her in bewilderment, then, hugging her, reassuringly said that her skill was probably no less amazing. Shicha, not expecting such a reaction, sheepishly said, well, not that much. The elf thought with a smile how she envied strong guys. At this time, the protagonist and the dream fairy were watching Rumeri sleep. Two girls were sitting on the grass, happily playing with each other. A woman in a hat stood before them, looking at them. The protagonist noticed with surprise. It was Remeri's hat. The fairy confirmed, yes, it was her dead mother. He said in bewilderment, I see. Which of the girls they were looking for was Remeri. She was a half-breed with deathly pale skin, and they were both no different from ordinary human children. The fairy asked him, was he even listening to her? MC continued to ponder, I see, so that's Remeri's wish. She just wanted to be born an ordinary girl. Little Nightmare asked him what he was going to do. He replied, of course, I'll go to them. He immediately approached the woman, greeted her, and said, wonderful weather, isn't it? She stared at him in amazement. The fairy admiringly noted how coolly he greeted her. He thought she praised him for every little thing. The woman smiled at both of them, greeted the dear guests, and asked how she could help them. At that moment, one of the girls jumped up and rushed toward him with hugs, joyfully exclaiming, Uncle Slad, he asked her. Remeri, is that her? He thought she was so happy, so different from the witch he knew. The girl answered, yes, her name is Remeri, and she likes Uncle Slad. The protagonist smiled and said, so that's it. Uncle Slad likes her too. Then he said, let her listen to him carefully. They are now in a deep sleep, and he has come to pick her up. He offers her to go home together. The girl suddenly frowned and answered him negatively. He was confused and thought it was such a shame to ruin such a happy dream for her. The fairy of nightmares will not harm her. Even so, well, there is no choice. The protagonist said, okay then, he leaves. He apologized to Remeri's mother for disturbing him. Remeri exclaimed, he's going back. Let him think again. He can stay here with them. Suddenly the woman asked if the second child would mind. The second girl grabbed his hand and replied that she would. He wondered in surprise, who the hell was she? Remeri's sister? It seemed they were the same age. He told the girls that they were waiting for him elsewhere now, and he is not part of Remeri's dream. Let them forgive him. With these words, he began to leave. The Remeri girl watched him go. Suddenly, he seemed to find himself in another room, one that seemed painfully familiar. He recognized this room. Remeri called his name and said that she didn't want him to leave. MC looked at her in confusion. Age, clothes. This was the Remeri he knew. Only her skin color was like that of an ordinary person. He asked, does she hate demonic blood so much? The girl answered naturally, if only she she could have been born a simple mortal, this wouldn't have happened. He didn't understand what they were talking about. Had she had such bitter experiences in life that she couldn't accept herself anymore? Slad asked if he remembered what he had once told her. Romary answered, of course. How could she forget such a thing? She was constantly reproached for her race. Merchants said they don't sell anything to stupid demons. Adventurers said food seems so disgusting when a demon sits next to her. And everyone, upon seeing her, said, "It's a demon, how scary," and only he accepted her completely. Could she hear it again? The protagonist remembered how they had spoken in this very room. He thought he had said something stupid, but she didn't think so. He looked at her, said her name, and, holding out his hands, said, "She is beautiful just the way she is." The girl, with tears in her eyes, extended her hand to him. He asked her if she remembered her goal. Romary answered, yes, she remembers. She wants to defeat the Demon King, so that the world will accept half-breeds like her. The protagonist confirmed, indeed. He thought it was hard to imagine. Even if she defeats the Demon King, there will still be those who will not stop despising half-breeds. But Romary knows this. She chose this path, even though she knew perfectly well how many difficulties awaited her. Grasping the doorknob to exit the dream, he decided. He wanted to help her. He said out loud then, "They need to go. It's time to wake up." The dream fairy watched them with a smile. Hand in hand, they exited the dream world. The girl smiled at him and said, "Good morning." Then she gasped, blushed, and looked down in embarrassment. MC thought she had been so sincere in the dream world, but now this was the real Romary in front of him, not her dream image. He touched her head and said, "Yes, she's missing her hat." Shicha, watching them, said, "A few days have passed." Emerging from her hiding place, she turned to her comrade with a smile. Romary happily rushed to her and asked where she'd been all this time. The girl laughed and replied, "It's a long story. But first, she needs to give this back." With these words, the thug pulled her hat from under her cloak and handed it to her comrade. Romary carefully took the accessory, hugged it, and said with a smile, "It's so dirty." She squeezed the thing tightly and apologized to her mother. At that moment, Ethica, emerging from her hiding place, exclaimed, "Everything's fine. They can call the brownie. He'll fix everything in a jiffy." The witch looked at her in bewilderment and asked, "What? And who the hell is she?" The elf smiled and said, "She's Slad's new friend," and told her name. Romary assessed her outfit with disapproval and glared at Shicha, exclaiming, "This is terrible." The thug retorted irritably, "She understands what she's trying to say, but what does this have to do with her?" Ethica approached Romary, grabbed her hand and said, "There's no place here that could be called home, but she can summon the spirit that inhabits every home, and then it will fix her hat in a flash." Romary stared at her for a long moment, then asked, "She's serious?" The girl began to chat, and the protagonist thought with relief they were getting along well. At that moment, Shicha approached him and offered to exchange information before he returned to the mansion. After a while, the allies sat around the fire. Romary said thoughtfully, "Ares was the one who drove Slad away." Shicha noted, meaning he was lying to them. Still, this rogue's actions were, as always, predictable. Romary told them everything that had happened. Because of Ares, the hero's team had gotten into a fight with a wyvern, a rare monster. Sensing imminent death, Disha saved everyone with a critical hit. Then she carried Romary on her back, encouraging her with warm words. Ares insisted on staying the night in the mansion they found in the forest. The holy maiden was against it, but agreed when she realized she needed rest. Listening to her, Shicha and Etika converged. The elf exclaimed, "How terrible a hero do you have to be to fail so badly?" The cutthroat shouted, "Ares is the worst possible." The protagonist said, "But he's a hero, whether they like it or not." The girls agreed that was true. Etika suddenly seemed to perk up, raised her hand, and said, "Let them forgive her, but she still doesn't understand. Is the title of hero really that important?" The protagonist and Romary looked at her in surprise. Shicha was also amazed, exclaiming, "Wow, she's never met anyone who doesn't know this." Romary told the elf that a demon king currently reigns over the world. She admitted that this was indeed true. The witch continued, "And he's immortal." Ethica exclaimed, "Is that really true?" Shicha sighed and said, "A new monster of the rarest kind, considered the weakest, but it's different from mere mortals like them." Romary said, "The Demon King had enveloped the entire world in his influence. Monsters began to run amok. Unable to free themselves from his power, demons began attacking humans." She clutched her dress at these words, but continued, "And yet they were once friendly. To defeat the Demon King, the sacred power of a hero who is currently Ares is needed." After a brief silence, she concluded, ending the story. Ethica responded, "She understood everything. She asks her forgiveness for causing her inconvenience." Romary remarked that it wasn't her fault. If anyone was to blame, it was the Demon King. And Ares, of course. MC wondered, confused. She compared the leader to a monster? She hated the hero that much. Ethica clarified, meaning this clueless idiot was the only one who could save their world? Romary looked at her with confusion and said, "Not quite. The hero's skill is rare but not unique. Someone other than Ares can also wield it." The elf was surprised. Was that even possible? She fell backwards. Shicha, approaching them, said that the hero skill might not be unique, but it only appeared once every hundreds of centuries. The witch remarked, "That's true, indeed. Never before had multiple heroes appeared at once," but she didn't want to give up hope. Slad would have been better off as a hero. The protagonist was embarrassed and said, "But he's just a simple, jobless guy." Romary snuggled up to him with a smile and said, Not simple. For her, he's a jobless hero. He laughed at the phrase. Shicha told him his feat was far more powerful than heroic. Did he understand that? He had not only awakened from the Nightmare Fairy's dream but also returned Rumeri to them. It could even become a legend. He protested. No, the Nightmare Fairy is surprisingly friendly with guests, so let them keep it a secret. He didn't want to run away from fame again. Shicha noted, silence comes at a cost, and ran, teasing him. He rushed after her and shouted, let her give him a friendly discount. She, laughing, asked, what did he say? She couldn't hear him at all. Rumeri suddenly said, it's decided. She's leaving the hero's party too. She wants to become the protagonist's comrade. Shicha asked her, is she sure? It's impossible to defeat the Demon King without the hero's sacred power. Has she decided to give up on her goal of glorifying half-breeds? The girl replied, no, there must be another way. The thug looked at her carefully, then smiled, and chuckling, said, that's right. MC didn't understand what she was talking about at first. Then it dawned on him and he exclaimed, exactly. He'd been wondering why she'd pushed him to follow Ares. That was the goal. Shicha stretched, loosening her body, and replied, well, the Wyvern and the Nightmare Fairy weren't part of her plan. When they found Rumeri's hat, she felt remorse for abandoning them. Scruffing her foot, she said, what a relief. Bowing, she added, I'm very sorry. Rumeri exclaimed in bewilderment, what are you even talking about? Ethica responded, confused. She didn't understand it herself. Shicha said, then let Slad explain everything. He muttered, puzzled. What was she talking about? But there was no other way, and the protagonist confessed. Shicha had deliberately run away at the same time as him, to teach Ares a lesson, and teach him the value of friendship. All three stared at him in surprise. Then Shicha ran up to him, grabbed him by the clothes, and screamed indignantly. That's not true at all. She wanted Disha and Rumeri to leave with her. He asked, perplexed. Why? The thug shook him and screamed. Does he even remember their desire to defeat the Demon King? A hero incapable of fulfilling his duty couldn't lead the team to success. Did he understand that? There was no point in continuing on with such a good-for-nothing scumbag. The protagonist, incredulous, clarified. Is she talking about Ares? Shicha continued, wishing he'd realized how important his skill was. Rumeri interrupted them, asking if they could forgive her. But what skill was he? When they told her everything, the girl rushed to MC, hugged him, and exclaimed, he was definitely her hero. Slad thought sheepishly. Now another person knew about his abilities, but it was Rumeri. After a while, he said it was time for him to go back. Shicha said, they still don't know how to cope without the hero's sacred power. But she was sure they could create a team that could defeat the Demon King. The protagonist thought they were overestimating him. He said out loud, if he suddenly can't return, they should leave here. All the girls pounced on him and shouted, don't say such things. He'll definitely come back. They saw him off. Approaching the door, he silently thanked his allies for everything. Knocking 3 times, he thought he promised to bring Dish back. Suddenly, a wall next to him began to crack and then exploded. It was a blow from Dish. He barely dodged her attack and wondered why he was fighting her in the first place. The Dream Fairy greeted him. Overjoyed at his return, he said he was glad to see her again. The action took place somewhere in nature, where a lonely house stood among the woods. The protagonist clarified that they weren't inside the mansion now. She replied that he shouldn't worry. She remembered his wish. They had arrived in a small piece of such a vast world. All he saw here was the dream of a holy maiden. She was a very noble child. Making such a significant dream come true was easy, he thought. So in the dream world, what matters is how noble a person is. MC replied, okay, thank you, and named her Little Nightmare. The Dream Fairy exclaimed in bewilderment, Little Nightmare? Why did he call her that? He said he thought the name suited her. He'd simply used part of hers. Did she mind? The fairy exclaimed, no, she really liked it. So from now on he could call her that, Little Nightmare. He was surprised, and that was okay with her, and he thought he'd crossed a line with such a nickname. Slad asked her if she really didn't care about herself at all. Little Nightmare clarified in surprise. He meant who she really was. The only thing she should care about was his desires. He wondered, his wish? The fairy has no true form in the dream. Here is only her image, which came in response to the call of his aspirations, to speak with the Fairy of Nightmares, to bring back his friends. She is with him to fulfill these requests. He himself created this image of the wish-granting fairy he read about in the old days. She noticed, precisely. Seeing the happy dreams of travelers is the meaning of her life. Form does not matter. The protagonist found this sad because he is a mere man. She transcends the boundaries of mortal reason. No wonder she is a monster of a unique kind. Little Nightmare told him he can converse with her in this form. His joy makes her happy. This is no longer just part of a dream. She flew right up to his face and exclaimed how wonderful. He is the first to make her dream come true. He was surprised. Her dream? The fairy, seeing his confusion, suggested he put this conversation aside. Right now, she needed to fulfill his wishes. Little Nightmare quickly disappeared into the sky, and he thought she'd clearly eluded him. Fine. He needed to go look for Dish. Approaching the building, he realized he'd entered a temple. A perfect row of divine statues hung in the air, an air of grandeur. However, this temple was so terrifying that it didn't even resemble a sanctuary. Why were there only monks here and no priests? A monk is a martial profession. They hardly look like believers. As he moved inside the building, he thought, people of this profession dedicate their free time to training in the garden. He knew it was all a dream, but it was a rather strange sight. After a while, he saw Dish, but what he saw greatly surprised him. The girl was practicing physical strikes with her limbs. Confused, the protagonist wondered what kind of outfit she was wearing. She looked so impressive. She looked the same age as his acquaintance Disha, with the same greenish gold hair, blue eyes, and slender body. But this wasn't a sacred robe. She was wearing the same training suit worn by monks wandering the temple. The only vestment of a holy maiden was the glove on her hand. He knew nothing about religion, but her prayer pose was a perfect image from his memory. Right now, it hardly resembled a sacred figure. This time it wouldn't be so easy. He'd have to penetrate the most mysterious depths of her desires. As an outsider, he was entering a place closed to others. After passing the forbidden zone, he thought, Little Nightmare was right. All it took was a wish. He carefully called her name. The girl spun around, striking him in the face. He exclaimed in bewilderment, "What's she doing?" Then, with lightning speed, she rose into the air, preparing to attack from above. The girl did it so quickly that he wondered what kind of incredibly accurate roundhouse kick she'd landed. The real Disha couldn't do that. This must be her desired form. He should have died instantly, but he'd managed to avoid that fate. Disha stepped aside and was about to attack him again, but then his automatic debuff kicked in, and she simply started running toward him with less than kind intentions. The protagonist began running away from her, noting all the while that he wasn't welcome. It was perfectly clear that skills weren't active in dreams, but how did her critical strike work? Would it activate until it hit its target? In the worst-case scenario, he'd die. She sped up and almost caught up with him. MC tried to pull himself together. No, he couldn't think about that. Death in a dream meant death in the real world. Continuing to run, he realized that she, too, could die from the effects of his skill. He stopped abruptly, grabbed her hand as she raised it to strike, and told her to listen to him. Why was she attacking? Aren't they friends? The girl pinned him against a tree and began to choke him. Then she repeated in an ominous voice, "Friends. That's why she wants to finish him off with one blow. Don't let him resist." Suddenly, she began to contort, arching her back incredibly and screaming. Slad tried to stop her, but he shouted that nothing good would come of her trying to hurt him. She rudely told him to shut up, adding that he knew perfectly well he deserved it. Disha suddenly fell to the ground, and it was obvious how ill she was. He crouched down in front of her and said that he still didn't understand why she attacked him. The girl curled up into a ball and replied, "He abandoned them so irresponsibly." He suddenly disappeared without a word. They all trusted him. Suddenly, her gaze cleared, she pronounced his name in surprise, and asked, "Is he a real Slad?" She jumped up from the ground and gasped in surprise. The protagonist didn't quite understand what had happened, but the skill's effects had worn off. Most likely, she was unconsciously trying to eliminate the unpleasant distractions and continue enjoying her sleep. After a while, walking at a leisurely pace, she said, "So the story of his escape was a lie from Ares, who in fact simply kicked him out of the team. But that doesn't excuse the fact that he didn't even say goodbye before leaving." She added indignantly, saying this, "She thinks a smack on the head would be entirely fair." He thought he'd had these thoughts even in Romeri's dream. He didn't trust the team, even though he called them friends. All that mattered was the existence of his skill. He thought nothing would change if he left, but they were trying to find him. Disha, seeing his thoughtfulness, asked, "What's wrong?" He looked her straight in the eye and declared, "This time, he's not going anywhere." The girl said irritably, "Of course." The protagonist said conciliatorily, "Well, don't let her get mad." She asked, "He means they're currently sleeping in the mansion of a unique demon?" If he was joking, then he should get ready for another scolding. MC countered, "It's the absolute truth." Disha said, "A dream is an imperfect reflection of reality. In the dream world, nothing was so believable." He then suggested she go see for herself at this temple. She thought for a moment and said, "Okay." She would have refused if Ares had suggested it, but since it was him, so be it, she'd go. He wondered if she'd believe him when she saw these strange monks. Arriving there, the girl asked in bewilderment, "Isn't this just an ordinary temple?" His astonishment knew no bounds. There wasn't a single monk here. Where were so many believers coming from? People in decent robes were everywhere, praying. He realized it was all subconsciously created. Disha simply didn't want to believe they were dreaming. Slad spoke, but something still seemed off. She objected, nothing unusual. He began approaching each priest and greeting them, but to his surprise, everyone remained silent. The protagonist fell to his knees and said in despair, "Everyone's ignoring me." Disha replied in bewilderment, "They're all busy, aren't they?" He objected, but surely they could have at least greeted him. He wondered if the priest had ever spoken to her? No, that couldn't be true. Disha had lived in the temple since childhood. It couldn't be that not a single priest had ever tried to talk to her. Was it really her dream to be ignored by the temple's servants? The indifference, the apathy of the priests, the ignorance of the temple's servants. He seemed to understand everything. But could he intervene? His insistence could hurt her. Disha impatiently asked him, "Is that all?" She wanted to get back to practicing. The protagonist repeated, perplexed. "Practice?" She confirmed. "Yes, of course, it's training in the garden. She's a monk after all." MC thought, "I see, so that's the thing." When she remembered him in the hero's team, he thought she was fine. But that was not the case at all. He looked at her carefully, addressed her by name, and said, "She is a holy maiden." She looked at him in bewilderment. What was he talking about? Her whole appearance expressed bewilderment at what she had just heard. Her entire being seemed to transform at that moment. She began to shake, and a vision appeared in her mind. She, still very young, had tested her skill in the forest and exclaimed in surprise, "I've never seen such a skill before. It's definitely unique." She ran home joyfully and was about to tell her parents, but she saw the priestess give her father a purse of money and ask if they would allow her to take their daughter to church. The parents agreed, and suddenly they saw her. Their daughter was crying and couldn't believe what she saw and heard. They began to ask her for forgiveness. Then Disha decided there was no need to cry. She had to be strong. Outwardly, this transformation went unnoticed. The protagonist repeated, "She is a holy maiden." She clarified, "What do you mean?" She had only recently embarked on the path of a monk. He was confused and wondered if he shouldn't interfere. No, he should give her a chance to decide her own destiny. The girl continued, "She did it so she could one day defeat the demon king." He asked, "Does that mean she wants that?" Disha replied, "That's everyone's dream. Everyone will be grateful and live happily if she succeeds. They rely on her. It's so wonderful." MC looked at her carefully, noticed how she clenched her fists, and asked if she was the only one who wanted this. The girl remained silent. Slad asked if she remembered how she treated his wounds when she had to save Romary. Disha said yes, she remembered it perfectly. He thought he hadn't been the target of the attack, so the skill hadn't worked, and the injuries were terrible. She repeated the words she'd said to him with a smile. A simple porter, yet so reckless. The protagonist smiled back and thanked her. Disha replied, "It's nothing special." He thought she'd always been like that. It wouldn't be surprising to hear her always say, "You're welcome," in response to his gratitude. She never saw anything special in helping. Treating wounds and saving those in need, that was the duty of a holy maiden. Ares was completely different, so they never found common ground. But he realized something. He said out loud, he was glad that even in her sleep she was still so kind. Let her forgive him, but monks can't use healing magic. Her eyes widened at his words. Suddenly, it was as if she'd been changed again. A dark aura began to emanate from her, and she screamed, "No, she's a monk." At that moment, the priests present chanted, and someone said, "The holy maiden isn't here. The holy maiden is here. Let her pray to God for their well-being. Let her help the hero defeat the demon king. Let her show the world God's blessing." MC thought, a common sight for the temple. Disha was playing the role of a priest in her dream. She fell to her knees before him, clearly in great pain. He apologized to her and told her she must remember. Slad knew her talent was like that of a hero. She couldn't abandon her role. By being born into this world, a holy maiden becomes someone others need, and it doesn't matter what she dreams of herself. However, Disha desires to save this world with all her heart, so much so that it is reflected even in her dreams. Suddenly, she gasped and said, she remembered. She was a holy maiden. The protagonist told her, but she can choose. She shouldn't try to forget anything, but simply choose who she wanted to be, a holy maiden or a monk. The next moment, Disha raised her mug of foamy drink and exclaimed, "How irresponsible." He thought she had no reason to become a holy maiden. Shouldn't she be glad she was born with such a unique skill? He told her, but she wanted to acquire a combat specialty. She protested. It was okay that she couldn't be who she wanted. It seemed the only one who allowed her to choose, just like that time, was him. She grinned and said, and truly, she could only hear such words from him. The protagonist responded. Now she would hear his answer. He projected an image into space, where she was vowing an oath before the people. They had been praying for victory for many years. Now, they could rest easy. She would fulfill her duty as a holy maiden, and end the years-long war with the demon king, restoring peace to this land. She vowed to restore their tranquility. Then the image crumbled, and Disha herself suddenly began to disappear. He thought he heard someone calling him. When he opened his eyes, Disha was standing next to him, stroking his head and telling him it was time for him to wake up. He wondered if the thing on which his head was resting, was it her lap? He jumped up in fear and backed away. MC looked around, realized he was in reality, and said, it must have been a dream. After a while, they set off to join their allies. Slad told Disha, by the way, he hadn't known she dreamed of becoming a monk. The girl responded sheepishly. She wasn't particularly interested in becoming one. She always did only what was required of her. It was her duty, after all, to help ordinary people. She constantly tried to convince herself that this was precisely what she wanted. That's why she wanted to achieve her own dream. When they arrived, Shicha was fishing. Romary, seeing them, rushed toward the protagonist in a fit of emotion and kissed him for saving Disha. Ethica was also jubilant. Jumping with joy, she regained control of her emotions, walked sedately up to Disha, shook her hand, and introduced herself. When everyone had been told everything, all the worries and joys had been discussed, Disha said, I understand. Then they must quickly save Ares. Romary disagreed, grumbling, no, it's better to keep him sealed in this dream. Shicha remarked that she agreed with Romary. The protagonist and Ethica looked at them in bewilderment. Disha said that he might be an incompetent scumbag, but they had been partners until recently. They couldn't abandon their one and only life's goal because of personal feelings. Romary rushed to her, hugged her, and remarked that she was still as adamant as ever, like peas against a brick wall. The holy maiden said, naturally, her duty is to accompany the hero and save the world. What difference did it make if Ares was only strong thanks to Slad's skills? Only the hero can use sacred power. There was no reason to hope that another wielder of this gift existed invested in their time. Only with Ares' guidance could they defeat the Demon King. Shicha told her she didn't think she was so stubborn. Let them forgive her, but she has nothing to add. She's not going to help Ares. Disha said sadly. Is that so? It's a shame they don't understand. She glanced sideways at MC and said irritably, he's been so silent. Maybe he'll tell her what he thinks about this already. Slad, eating fried fish, replied, of course, Ares needs to be woken up. That was the plan all along, the Holy Maiden joyfully clarified. So, he'll return to the hero's team? The protagonist said so, if he accepts him. But there's just one condition. He doesn't want Ares to know about his skills. Disha exclaimed in bewilderment. Why? He wouldn't be so arrogant if he heard about his abilities. When he tells him about it, everything will be different. Shicha wanted to protest, but Disha sternly told her to keep quiet for a bit. The thug exclaimed regretfully. Why was Disha so cruel? The Holy Maiden asked the protagonist what was wrong with using skills. Of course, it wasn't easy, but it was natural for people to use their gifts. Or was he so against working for the good of others? How could personal principles be more important than the fate of the entire world? He answered sadly. That's not the point. She asked in confusion. Then what is it? MC, unable to contain himself, shouted in irritation. Ares will stop fighting altogether. All four stared at him in surprise. Disha asked, perplexed. What did he say? Sometime later, the allies arrived at the Dream Fairy's mansion. Shicha and Romeri were clinging to Slad. Disha settled under a tree and sadly recalled what the protagonist had said. Ares will stop fighting altogether. They were, of course, surprised by what he had said. He continued, like them, but he didn't immediately understand. This was the man who had asked him to join the hero's team. At first, it seemed like it was because of his position, but it wasn't. He was shocked to hear the leader's true nature. As long as he was the only one who could save the world, he was allowed to do whatever he wanted, and everyone around him should only praise him. Only Ares could defeat the Demon King. He needed no one else. In reality, the hero's team was just a pastime. He didn't need comrades, only pawns. This man didn't care about saving the world. He was driven by a lust for power, a boundless ego. That was all that remained of the honorable title of hero. Disha countered. Despite this, she believed that even Ares had at least a shred of conscience. Otherwise, he wouldn't have faced certain death-fighting monsters. Shicha poured out some of the contents from the bottle, sipped the rest, and remarked, did she seriously think their hero would put his life on the line? This guy thinks he's the center of the world. Disha replied, they're all guilty of sin. Everyone imagined the world revolved around them as children. The protagonist replied, yes. Only Ares is certain of that now. Even after becoming a hero, he hasn't matured, his friend said. Romeri said, they've already realized Ares is acting like a child. So what does that have to do with his skills? He said his abilities are automatic. They won't adjust to him. Shicha clarified, so what then? MC shrugged and said, it's over. That's the reason. Romeri looked puzzled, but it didn't make it any clearer. Slad said, that's Ares. He would never accept help from anyone. Disha pointed out that her and Romeri's strengths weren't enough to defeat the Demon King. The protagonist picked up on this, which is why the hero would have to let him get involved. And he wouldn't want that, would he? The Holy Virgin exclaimed in surprise. And that's the reason? Doesn't that sound childish? So that's how it's connected? Really? Over such a trivial thing? Shicha said that it might seem trivial to them, but for Ares, it's so important that he's willing to hand over their world to the Demon King. Remembering this, Disha thought, yeah, who would have thought that the key to a hero's strength is self-esteem? Ares, chosen by a god, defeated the Demon King by turning to a worthless, in his words, porter for help. He'll never accept that. During their conversation, she objected to the protagonist. That can't be true. They were raised with the goal of one day saving the world with the hero. MC replied that he too had once thought he could be relied upon, but he was wrong. Dirt is too dangerous a mistake. Placing his hand on Romeri's head, he added, remembering her hat. Now he understands that. The witch stared at him in bewilderment. Finally, Disha said, okay, they won't tell Ares about his abilities after they wake him. She looked at him, at her allies milling around him, and thought, in the end, he'd convinced everyone, and it had been decided to save the hero. After this conversation, she felt somehow devastated. Ethica sat down next to her and asked if she was confused. The girl admitted that yes, it seemed she had lost her way. It was so unusual, she always had to move forward only to fulfill others' desires. Ethica remarked that instead of worrying about the unknown, why not think about new possibilities? The Holy Maiden was interested. For example, the elf said with a smile, about how each of them would hit Ares once. Disha even choked on her words. Seeing the confusion on Ethica's face, she said, please forgive her. She just didn't expect someone like her to say such a thing. The elf asked sheepishly, really? They'd discussed this with Romeri, but for some reason she felt like Slad had other plans for the hero besides saving the world. Disha stood up and said, it's so strange. They'd only met today, but it was as if she'd known her forever. After that, she smiled happily and exclaimed, good, she's unmatched in a fight. After awakening the hero, they'll all beat him up together. Shicha noted in surprise, what can she hear? How amusing. She'll use a critical hit, right? Well, right? After a while, when everyone had calmed down, Disha told the protagonist, so let him save this idiot. He grinned and declared, an important task. Approaching the door, he knocked 3 times as usual and found himself inside the mansion. He called out to Little Nightmare, and the fairy immediately appeared before him and sadly said that it was time for her and the traveler to move on. She sniffled, and the protagonist asked in surprise, "Is there a problem?" Little Nightmare shook her head from side to side before saying, "He's right." The witch herself had wanted to see him, and the holy maiden magnanimously awaited his apology. The hero was unlike any of them. MC asked if he could see his dream. The fairy replied, "Perhaps, but she wouldn't advise it." Some people's deepest desires can be others' nightmares. Each dream is its owner's private world. Does he still want to go? She jumped into the surprised Slad's arms and added, "Some souls should sleep forever. They will see their desired dreams and will be unable to harm anyone in the real world." Her words made him wary, and yet, he said, that wasn't the case. Their hero is the only salvation from the Demon King. Little Nightmare countered, "What if that's not true? What will he do if in fact sacred power isn't the only thing capable of destroying ancient evil?" The protagonist declared decisively, "No matter what, he will awaken Ares." The fairy looked at him in confusion. He continued, "They still haven't decided what to do next, but they should definitely bring him back." His companions trusted him. Besides, does he have the right to run away after everything he's done? He doesn't think so. Little Nightmare said sadly, "Yes, he's right." The protagonist asked her if something was bothering her. She exclaimed in surprise, "Was it really that obvious?" He agreed. It was true. You could tell by her. The fairy was indignant. What's going on? How can he have no shame in digging into someone else's heart? MC was indignant, and this was being told to him by someone who could read minds. He actually cared about her feelings too. The fairy called him impudent and shameless, and declared that all he wanted was to get into her soul. After a moment's silence, she added, "So what? She wants to strip naked in front of him too? Let him watch." A radiance so bright appeared around her that the protagonist had to shield his eyes with his hand. In an instant, everything around was covered in a beautiful night sky with a multitude of shining stars. Little Nightmare shouted to him, her true face, the night sky. How amazing her dream, he exclaimed in surprise, looking at the stars. What was going on? He wanted to voice his guess, but the fairy covered his mouth with her hand and admonished him how rude it was to call them victims. She helps them fulfill their deepest desires. They are here because of cruel reality and unfortunate fate. MC was about to object again, but the fairy interrupted him, saying she understood what he was trying to say. So many lives had died in this world without achieving anything. She too had a cherished wish. It cannot be seen, only felt. It is her dream to invite everyone in the world to her abode and grant them sweet sleep forever. At these words, the fairy's eyes sparkled like emeralds. He stared at her in horror. Various doors began to fly through space around him, colliding with each other, making a terrible sound. He stretched out his hands and began calling her. Little Nightmare said, without turning around, "This applies to him too. No exceptions." Slad cried out, but such a dream was too cruel. The last thing that flashed before his mind was the door. Sometime later, a carrier pigeon brought a message to the ruler of the kingdom of Saywood Cassiv, Saywood Belcraft. When the postman took the letter from the pigeon, he brought it to the king and reported an urgent message from the holy maiden of the hero's team. He read the message aloud. The hero's team encountered a unique monster, a nightmare fairy, but thanks to the active intervention of a group assembled by a specialized thief, the witch and the holy maiden were saved. The third visit to the enemy's abode was successful with the hero's release. However, the man called the porter is now unconscious. Therefore, they request urgent assistance from the king. Cassiv, who had been writing something, trembled. The speaker continued, "The hero's condition is stable and his mind has cleared." The king stopped the assistant and asked, "Did he just mention the porter's name?" As the girls languished in anticipation of the protagonist and Ares, they dozed off. Suddenly, Disha heard a cracking sound through her sleep and opened her eyes. She screamed in disbelief. The mansion is disappearing. Her companions jumped up and saw the mansion, indeed, seeming to vanish into thin air. They couldn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, they saw the protagonist lying unconscious in the grass. Rumeri pointed to the side and exclaimed, "Ares is here too." She spoke in confusion. "Did they lose?" Disha remarked. "What's the point?" Shicha remained silent, confused. Ethika said something clearly happened in the dream. The mansion disappeared, but those two got out. Surely, it wasn't about losing. Shicha spoke in bewilderment. Exactly. The boys returned alive, but they still haven't woken up. Besides, Slad seemed to have fallen into a coma. She was afraid even a forced healing spell wouldn't work here. Suddenly, rain began to pour down. She looked up at the sky, and mentally uttering his name, she wondered if something had happened in that dream. When the protagonist shouted to Little Nightmare that her dream was too cruel, he added that she would be alone forever. The fairy replied, "Yes, it is. It's true. Dreams are completely unrelated. Communicating with someone in a dream is tantamount to talking to yourself. Sleep is eternal solitude. However, everyone spends their time happily, without ever peeking into the shadows. So, all is well." She thought the mansion was an ideal world, a dream come true, until she met him. He asked in surprise, what was she talking about? Until she met him? Little Nightmare said it exactly like that. He was the only one who didn't lose his memories when he stepped through the mansion's doors. The protagonist, confused, clarified, "He's the only one. No one ever talked to her?" She replied that there were those who came here just to chat. but they couldn't even remember what sleep was the moment they entered her dreamscape. At the same time, everyone completely forgot about their desire to talk to her. Spinning around in space, she added that a forgotten dream couldn't be realized in a dream. He was different from the others. MC thought Little Nightmare was overjoyed at his arrival. For her, this truly was unprecedented joy. She continued, only with him did she manage to talk. Thanks to his strong desire to meet her, he was able to fulfill another of her dreams. Everything before had been a mistake. Talking to someone who doesn't sleep is so much fun. She didn't know that. Bitterness tinged her words. He looked at her with pity. The fairy continued, perhaps with her dreams she granted salvation to someone, but in reality, so many souls lost, dear ones forever. At these words, Little Nightmare was already crying bitterly. Slad, unable to bear her suffering, approached her. To her surprise, hugged her, and begged her forgiveness. He always thought the dreams she created were ill-intentioned, but in reality, she was very kind. After waiting for her to stop crying, he told her he was lucky. Perhaps he hadn't forgotten her, thanks to the automatic debuff. Since the illusion wasn't created intentionally, the skill only considered its power dangerous, so it deactivated it. Little Nightmare countered. No, his skill hadn't only affected the illusion, its effect was simply weakened. After all, she was immortal, so the aging effect couldn't harm her. The protagonist muttered in surprise. So that's how it is. So the automatic debuff's effect is powerless against the Demon King. She said, exactly. That was the point, but her unique power was affected by his skill. Then he'll be useful in the fight against the Demon King too. If he can destroy her, then surely there's a chance he can defeat him too. The protagonist wondered, confused, where she was going with this. Little Nightmare told him she couldn't control her abilities. Wherever she went, the mansion's guests would continue to disappear into the dream world without a trace. She begged him to touch her. She was offering him to test whether it was possible to kill an immortal. Looking at his astonished expression, the fairy added passionately, there was no need to doubt. He wouldn't be able to enter the hero's dream at his will. There was only one way to wake this child. She wouldn't have any regrets if she were destroyed by him. He felt like he was about to cry. Little Nightmare told him not to make such a sad face. This is wonderful, the MC exclaimed decisively and annoyed. No, this is not wonderful at all. The fairy smiled and said, he shouldn't be angry. It upsets her. He responded indignantly, and she's saying such things. Her words were far more upsetting than anything else. How could she ask a friend to kill her? Little Nightmare asked in surprise. Friend? They were friends? The protagonist almost shouted. Yes, they were friends. How could they not be after everything that had happened? First of all, he couldn't kill a child who was so remorseful. The fairy sheepishly asked his forgiveness. She was truly asking him for something terrible, but it had to be done. Suddenly he exclaimed, he has an idea. When she listened to him with surprised eyes, he clarified. Did she understand? The fairy exclaimed in bewilderment. How is that even possible? He replied. He doesn't know, but he believes they can work together. She spoke doubtfully, but if it doesn't work, he'll die. The protagonist said he came to the dream world to bring back his friends. Now he has no reason to leave her alone. So, this time he would like to see a dream. Her real name is Night Vision, and there's no dream she cannot make come true. Little Nightmare looked at him in surprise and said, yes, she understood. That's right, there is no dream she cannot make come true. At these words, hope lit up her eyes. He exclaimed, raising his hands up, so let her believe in herself. The fairy joyfully somersaulted in the air and shouted, she can do it. She believes that everything will work out. She trusts his faith in her, so she needs to hear his wish. Let him say what he wants. MC asked her to be his partner. The fairy suddenly disappeared. He called out to her in bewilderment and thought, did it work? Suddenly, blood began to flow from his nose and mouth. He felt himself weakening and collapsed unconscious to the ground. After some time, he opened his eyes, sat up in bed, and looking around, thought in confusion, is this the royal chambers? Slad pinched his cheek to check if he was dreaming. At that moment, he heard Little Nightmare's cheerful voice, asking how he slept. The protagonist was very happy to see her, but immediately noticed with alarm that she was still in the same state. So, was this the same dream? The fairy countered, no, it's not. They were no longer in a dream. Everything around them was real. He found it hard to believe, and he clarified, is this true? She laughed and exclaimed, yes, they had done it, just as he said. He noted in surprise, so this skill works on her. His automatic buff, Little Nightmare said with a smile. They really did it, he thought, taking his analysis and conclusions seriously. The automatic buff had worked on her, so the buff had to work too. The plan was simple. First, he and the Little Nightmare became friends. Her magic power increased thanks to his skill. Then, she managed to control her abilities, and all that remained was to do something like that. The other half was entirely up to her. He asked, but why did he fall asleep? The fairy made a sad face, apologized, and said her power had suddenly exceeded its limit and she hadn't been able to control it right away. He fell into a deep, difficult to recover sleep. MC wondered, by the way, why she was in this form, even though they were in the real world. She exclaimed with a laugh, yes, it's amazing. She had barely managed to transform her mansion into a new appearance, which she borrowed from his memories. And that's not all. Now, no one will forget reality while dreaming, and she has the power to change other people's dreams at will. The protagonist smiled happily and thought, that's definitely a unique species. Her full power was simply astonishing. The fairy continued excitedly, turning Ares' dream into a nightmare, and he quickly woke up. The protagonist said, I feel sorry for him, but if it were real, then why was he here? Little Nightmare said his friends had come to see him, so he'd better ask them. She'd take a little stroll around the area for now. He didn't have to rush. He wanted to stop her, but the fairy had already disappeared. He wondered if it was okay to bestow such power on a monster of such a unique species, and if you think about it, it wasn't a very thoughtful move. At that moment, Ethica popped in to see him. MC looked at her and couldn't understand why his heart was pounding so wildly. She cried out, and he woke up. After that, the elf, without a second thought, rushed toward him and hugged him so tightly that he almost suffocated. Slad suddenly felt his body react to her. He began to scold himself. What a fool he was. He'd just recently used adventurer services, so why was he reacting like this now? The protagonist pulled Ethic away from him and said he couldn't take it anymore. He'd suffocate. She jumped out of bed, rushed to the door, and shouted, she'll call the others right now. The protagonist wanted to stop her, but the door had already slammed behind her. Confused, he began to think about what to do. He hadn't calmed down yet. He had to force himself to calm down. Shicha came in first and asked him if something was wrong. MC, with a forced smile, assured her that everything was fine. The girl placed a plate of fruit in front of him and said she peeled the apples for him. Slad thanked her and said he'd eat them later. Disha, who had just entered, remarked with a smile, looking at him. It seemed the hero's return had cost him dearly. Shicha noticed, and Ares himself woke up almost immediately. Ethica and Remeri cried out with tears in their eyes. They were so worried. The protagonist asked, but what happened while he was sleeping? And why were they here? And where was the hero now? Disha and Shicha looked at each other and nodded, signaling that they needed to tell each other everything. The Holy Virgin had said it was a long story. The most important thing now was to tell him one piece of news. After awakening, Ares went to court and reported their departure from the team. Betraying the hero was tantamount to treason. The protagonist asked in surprise, accusations of treason? He truly was a foolish man. Disha continued. Moreover, he had sued those who saved his life. Now let him listen carefully to what happened during the month he slept. MC was surprised by the length of time the Holy Virgin had reported he'd slept. When they pitched their tent near the fairy's mansion, it was raining heavily. Ares sat down by his bed, put an arm around Remeri, who was monitoring his, Slad's, condition, and said casually, he doesn't understand whether some fake mansion or a haunted house is to blame, but how can he sleep for so long? Remeri angrily hit him on the head, wondering irritably why he woke up while their comrade didn't. The leader didn't let up, saying he was irritated that this guy decided to run away on his own. Why did he even need to come back? Disha had made a remark about that, by the way. The protagonist told them he'd been kicked off the team. He refuses to explain it. Ares was outraged by what she was saying, and they believed this nonsense? Had they forgotten who they were supposed to trust unconditionally? The Holy Virgin said sarcastically, the man who started running away instead of saving them. The leader shouted angrily, the protagonist is a useless porter. What difference does it make whether he's there or not? Shicha said MC was telling them about the enemy's weaknesses on the battlefield. Ares objected. He didn't need this chatter when he could defeat the enemy with a single blow. Remeri added, he was ready to protect her with his life. The leader shouted angrily, becoming cannon fodder is the most suitable destiny for a blockhead. The girls indignantly told him that if Slad hadn't come to his aid in time, he would already be dead. The guy protested irritably, no. This is out of place. He's trash anyway. Let them explain to him what kind of elf this is. Ethica stared at him in confusion and then replied, she's Slad's friend. Ares first looked at her in surprise, then burst out laughing and exclaimed, is that true? This incompetent guy has a girlfriend. Having finished laughing, he approached her, grabbed her chin and said contemptuously, she's being led by the nose. This sleepy idiot is only good for stealing other people's junk. Let her listen and admire him. He is an incomparable hero, Lord Ares. Wouldn't it be better for her to join his team? To tell the truth, anyone wishing to join must be at least A rank, but he will allow her to join as his lover. Ethica, frightened, began to cry, and Remeri rushed to her to calm her down. The elf, wiping away her tears, noted that it was indeed as Slad had said. Ares asked in bewilderment, what did she say? The girl looked at him with tear-filled eyes and said, he really is a poor man. He's only in love with himself. The girls froze, awaiting his reaction. The leader grinned and said, Slad said that again? What the hell is that? Elvish? Ethica stared at him in confusion. Shicha, shaking her head, told him that was the name of the one he called a blockhead and trash. The leader noticed, so that's it. Slad, is that his name? Remeri turned to him irritably, asking sarcastically, let him tell me, does he know her name? Ares hesitated. The witch exclaimed, he won't tell me? No, he simply can't. He's never called her by name. The leader, flustered, countered. That's not true. Well, what was her name? Rieli, huh? Ethica looked at him in confusion. Remeri, Disha, and Shiza looked down in disapproval. The Holy Virgin said, she dares to suggest he hasn't bothered to remember their names. To him, they are not comrades but service personnel. He doesn't even know their names. He dispelled all doubts in one fell swoop. Ares waved it off. What difference did it make? It was such a trifle. Shicha approached Ethica, raised her hand, and told him, by the way, she was now part of Team MC. Remeri approached them and added that she supported this decision. They would defeat the Demon King together. Ares exclaimed in bewilderment. What was wrong with them? His comrades hugged Ethica, shielding her. He laughed maliciously and said, so that's it? So that's it? Slad is so good? Kept them awake all night? So it wasn't just sabotage, he didn't expect them to betray him. Rumeri clenched her fists and rushed at him indignantly. She dealt him such a blow that he flew a good distance away. Shicha pointed the blade of her weapon at him and told him in an icy tone, "Enough! Shut him up. Don't let him compare him to himself." Disha, having told this, added that Shicha looked incredibly cool, saying all this to Ares' face. She turned to the thug and asked if she was embarrassed. Why didn't she tell him everything herself? Turning around, the holy maiden noted in surprise that she had already vanished. Fine, she'd tell the rest of the story herself. Even someone like Ares needed a camp for the night. But here's the problem. What did he think the leader had done? He tried to climb into Ethika's tent, but she threw him out of the camp like a bullet. When they asked him how he could have come up with such a thing, he replied, "So what? Even if they weren't on the same team, overnight rendezvous were not forbidden, and so they decided to mock him as punishment." Shicha gloomily asked him if perhaps he would have learned his lesson if he had lost his manhood. Rumeri made a scissor gesture with her fingers, and she, Disha, said, "They'll test it now. It doesn't affect the hero's abilities in any way. It's not a pleasant sight. We need to finish before the protagonist wakes up." She turned to the girls and asked, "Are they starting?" Ares, white with fear, asked what exactly they were starting. Disha answered, "The competition." And they each took turns landing a hard blow on him. Then she, Disha, praised her allies for their good blows and, flexing her fists, said, "Now, let him grit his teeth." He screamed in fear. "She's not going to use her signature move, is she?" She mockingly said. She can't hear what he's mumbling, whether to use it or not. She approached him closer, and he twitched in fear. Disha crouched in front of him and said there was no need to use her critical strike. His death would cause them a lot of trouble, but he shouldn't be in such a hurry to lose consciousness. There was one more candidate left. An angry Rumeri approached him, and screaming for him to die, struck him with such force that he was thrown into the air, spun through space, and then crashed to the ground. Disha noted with a smile, as expected from a unique skill, unprecedented power. Rumeri laughed with pleasure. Disha smiled, remembering the story, and continued. The next morning, he, Slad, hadn't woken up. Shicha suggested continuing on to the capital. After all, that was their original destination. They hoped there might be a way to wake him up there. When they arrived, Ares was still twitching, as if from a nervous tic. Shicha asked him irritably, "Is he still here?" Rumeri said they needed to get the protagonist out of here quickly. The leader screamed hysterically, "Shut up! Why are they all so cheerful?" On the way to the capital, they encountered a monster affected by miasma. Luckily, only Ares had a hard time in the battle. She bet his auto-buff skill activated automatically while he was sleeping. Rumeri said, "Well, that's it. The hero's team is no more." Ethika told Disha, who was carrying MC on her back, that she was certainly worried about him, but she doubted outsiders were allowed into the palace. Let her take care of him. The holy maiden promised her this and asked Ares what he was laughing at. The leader spread his arms, walked forward and said, "He's a hero. He'll go and meet the king. They'll all regret betraying him, and now they're accused of treason." Slad, listening silently, remarked, "I see." He wondered how it was that he'd slept for a whole month. Was this really about him? Disha said sadly, not expecting the king to listen to Ares and hold a trial. A brilliant former SS-ranked adventurer, King Cassiv. If not for his courage, not to mention his wisdom, humanity would have been destroyed by the Demon King long ago. It had been the king's idea to create a hero's team to defeat the Demon Lord. That was precisely why she couldn't understand his decision. After a moment's silence, she added that while she doubted Ares' foolish arguments would be heeded, the trial would be in 3 days, and since he'd woken up, he should appear there as well. The protagonist remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. Ethika said she knew little about humans, but surely they'd be all right? She hoped they wouldn't be executed. Tears welled in her eyes at these words. Disha rose from her chair and declared that she was on the hero's team's side, but she would protect them all. She'll show everyone Ares' true colors herself. Rumeri asked, was she sure? If she did that, Ares would likely be unable to continue his heroic activities. She hesitated, but the protagonist firmly said, no, he could. No need to worry about that. In any case, it wasn't the worst thing. In fact, they could find themselves in a worse situation. Ethika exclaimed in confusion. What did he mean? MC addressed Disha and Rumeri by name and said, in his understanding, they already knew. Brawls in city taverns, thefts from aristocrats' mansions, Ares goes unpunished for all of this, because he's a hero, Rumeri exclaimed. However, the guards have caught him several times, Slad said. And that was it. Ares wasn't sent to prison or forced labor. A hero is always acquitted. Ares may be foolish, but when it comes to self-preservation, he's surprisingly wise. He likely knew exactly what he was getting into, which is why he sought a trial. What he doesn't understand is the king's intentions. If he had simply pandered to the hero's wishes, he would have thrown them all in prison. But instead, they were given quite comfortable conditions. He's in no position to judge anyone right now. That's why he sees no point in denigrating Ares. He glanced at Ethika, who was comforted by Rumeri, and asked her what she was doing in the royal palace. She looked at him, puzzled. He continued, they were summoned here because of the trial, weren't they? He doubts she has anything to do with all this fuss with the hero's team. The elf replied, confused, when the soldiers arrived at their hotel. They said that if she was in his squad, she should come with them. The protagonist clarified that Rumeri wasn't with her. Ethika said yes, I think she was shopping. He noticed, I see. So they asked her to appear in court? The girl responded with confusion. She remembered being told to answer any questions asked of her in court. Disha exclaimed. So she's a witness. Then she can't be here. If they're accused of conspiring, they won't be able to testify. The protagonist thought to himself, since they were forbidden from communicating, she should be under house arrest. If they truly intended to hold a fair trial, then perhaps this time the hero wouldn't go unpunished. And so, the day of the trial arrived. The allies entered the courtroom, where there were many people as spectators. Ares looked at them and smirked sarcastically. MC, Erika, Shicha, and Romeri stood behind the podium. The judge slammed his gavel on the table and announced the beginning of the hero's trial. Kasif said they would begin with the plaintiff's demands. Let the hero Ares step forward. The leader eagerly rushed to the center of the hall and stood before the king. His Highness declared, he claims the witch and the thug left his team on a whim, and this caused him great harm, correct? Ares replied with a smile that this was true, and was about to add something about them, but the king cut him off, saying, enough. The leader looked puzzled, but he wasn't finished yet. Kasif shouted menacingly at him to step back. The boy looked at the king with fear, not expecting such an attitude. The ruler declared, next is the holy maiden Disha. The king told her she was the only one remaining on the hero's team. Did she agree with the hero's assertion? Disha declared, no. What the hero said was absolutely untrue. Ares rushed toward her with insults, but was restrained by the guards. The king ordered the court mage to impose a forced silence on the hero. When the mage carried out his will, Kasif pointed out that only witnesses had the right to speak without permission. If this happened again before the spell expired, he would leave the hall immediately. Ares, not expecting such a turn of events, quieted down. Kasif turned to Disha and continued, so she, the holy maiden, claims the hero is lying. However, in fact, 3 members of the hero's team left it. What does this mean? Ares bared his teeth, but could not say anything. Disha asked the king's permission to begin the story in order. Having received approval, she began her story. Finally, she added that the porter Slad had been expelled from the team by the hero himself. The protagonist thought she had explained the situation correctly, while managing to conceal his skills. The holy maiden added that the hero had left the witch to be devoured by a wyvern, thus abandoning her in a dangerous situation. The witch Romeri left because she couldn't tolerate his behavior any longer. The king chuckled and said he understood. Then he turned to the protagonist and asked if he had anything to add. The protagonist was surprised. Was he addressing him? Out loud he answered, no, nothing special. He actually shuddered in fear. Ares tried to shout something again, but the spell he'd cast prevented him from doing so. MC sighed and thought, God, he still can't calm down. The king slammed his fist on the table and said that since the holy maiden's testimony matched the accused's, they would consider this an internal dispute and not interfere. Therefore, the accused were acquitted. The allies were pleased with this decision. But Ares was not at all satisfied with this decision. The accused couldn't believe it. Was it that simple? Kasif said. And now they'll move on to the question of reducing the hero's powers. MC thought irritably. He knew it. The reason that prompted the king to bring the matter to trial lay elsewhere. Subordinates brought reams of papers, placed them on the king's desk, and Kasif announced that he had received complaints against the hero Ares. He picked up the first complaint he came across and continued, however, accepting only those whose content he approved. Complaints that raised doubts or suspicions were excluded. Shicha, looking at the pile of complaints, wondered in bewilderment. Why so many? Romeri sighed and uttered the name of her former leader. Kasif looked at the hero and said, apparently, the time had come to admit his sins and face the truth. Ares stared at the ruler in bewilderment. The king declared it was time to move on to the matter of terminating the hero's authority. The protagonist thought, Ares is so calm. Well, that's logical. No matter what accusations are brought against him, after all, only he can save the world. What will the king do? Kasif called for Shicha to come forward. The cutthroat replied, yes, very well, and stepped into the center of the room. The overlord had said she possessed the unique skill of super memory. Hadn't she? The girl bowed her head and replied, yes, he was right. The protagonist noted with surprise. He hadn't known about that. Shicha had never mentioned her skills. The king had said that a hero was the only exception to the rule. He had more freedom of action than others. He had said that, hadn't he? He would say more. He needed to verify whether Ares was truly worthy of being a hero. Shicha confirmed, yes, she had heard it with her own ears. MC thought it was such a cliche that he couldn't even remember having said it. In his opinion, everyone, including Ares, simply ignored it. Kasif continued, shaking the decree. But Ares, being a hero, abused that freedom, failed to fulfill his duties, and behaved as he pleased. His sins simply cannot go unnoticed. He turned to Shicha and noted that all of the hero's deeds had been witnessed by her. Could she recreate these memories using the court mage's ability to expose lies? She looked at the king in surprise and replied, if he so desires. Slad thought in surprise, wow, if you combine super memory with expose lies, you'll get the most powerful testimony in history. The court mage activated his skill. Kasif said she would need to help document the hero's deeds in another room later. The protagonist was surprised again. Wouldn't that be the case now? And why use expose lies now? The ruler continued, asking Shicha to answer his question honestly. Is super memory her own skill? She hesitated, and finally said, no, it's not. The protagonist hadn't expected such an answer, and looked at her in confusion. The king told her not to be afraid. He wasn't going to accuse her of a crime. How did she acquire this skill? The girl, overcoming her shame and confusion, admitted that she had stolen it using her unique skill stealing. Everyone present was astonished by what was happening. MC was simply amazed. He hadn't known she had such a stunning trump card. Finally, he began to understand what the king was planning. Kasif thanked her for her honesty and asked her one last question. Could she take the hero skill from Ares using her own and transfer it to another person? She sheepishly repeated, her skill is skill stealing. The king said, he just needed to know if it was possible. Let her answer him. The girl said yes, it was possible. Kasif smiled slightly and said, no more questions. Let her forgive him for making her remember all those painful moments. She was free. Suddenly, Ares, whose silent spell had worn off, shouted, make them stop. Give him a chance to explain himself. He rushed toward Shicha, but stopped just in time under her icy gaze. The protagonist noted that the forced silence seemed to have worn off. Until now, he hadn't been able to utter a word. Previously, Ares had been protected by his hero skill. However, it turned out that it could not only be taken away, but also transferred. Ares' only stronghold had collapsed. The king said that under any other circumstances, he would have ordered him to leave the court immediately, but he would listen to him this time. The leader shouted, he will change. So he begs them not to strip him of his hero status. Let them not do this. He fell to his knees before the king and begged for forgiveness. Kasif said he believed a person has 3 chances to start over. Ares cried out, hopefully. Well then, the king frowned, pointed to the stacks of complaints, and asked sternly, in his opinion, this pile of papers looked like 3 sheets of paper? He'd gone too far. The best conditions, the best comrades he could have given him. He threw it all away, along with his vast potential, like a piece of trash. The protagonist and Disha looked at the king in confusion. Ares, completely dejected, began to beg for his forgiveness again. Kasif declared, it's too late. He would never forgive him. The king shouted this last sentence with all his anger. Ares seemed to shrink to the floor in fear. Then he stood up, leaned against one of the tables, and cursed everyone. The guards immediately grabbed him. Kasif said he would soon pass judgment. He could consider himself spending the rest of his life in an underground prison. The guards dragged him away. Ares began to curse. He fought for peace. And this is how they repay him? It's unfair. He resisted as best he could, shouting whatever came into his head, but it was all in vain. After the door slammed behind him, those present could still hear his scream for a long time. The king stood, exhaled, and declared that the trial had lasted longer than planned. He addressed his allies and said they would have a 3-hour break, including a meal break. After a while, when the comrades were alone, Ethika declared, Ares is finished. It had all happened so quickly and easily. She thought she hadn't even done anything. Rumeri clapped Shicha on the shoulder and said, well, she's amazing. She should have used that amazing skill on the leader earlier. MC told the witch, let's not talk about that now. Shicha apologized to them and asked permission to leave. When she left, Rumeri looked puzzled. Did she say something wrong? Slad replied, the topic of skills, especially unique ones, is a delicate one. He thought Shicha was the most sensitive person in this regard. Now he realized she had clearly been avoiding conversations about them. Rumeri said dejectedly, I'll apologize later. He wondered if this would ever happen again. The protagonist stood up and said he would go look for Shicha. Rumeri remarked that she thought it was pointless. She wouldn't accept his support anyway. He replied that he knew this, but he couldn't leave things as they were. Let them both wait for him here. He'd be back soon. As he walked out into the hallway, he heard Little Nightmare calling him. He was surprised by her appearance. The fairy led him to one of the doors and told him to come in. When he did, the following scene presented itself to him. Shicha was sitting on the floor next to the bed, a bag next to her, and things scattered around. The protagonist thought in confusion, a travel bag? Was she really going to leave without even warning them? The fairy told him he had to go and get this child before he lost her forever. She activated her skill, and the allies seemed to be engulfed in flames. They flipped in space, and an unfamiliar room appeared before the MC's eyes. He looked around and thought, this place must be Shicha's dream. Suddenly, she appeared next to him. Slad asked her what she was doing here. The girl replied, perplexed, that she should be the one asking. She had gotten here before him. He looked around again and asked, what is this? Shicha replied, the happiness she destroyed. Confused, he asked again, the happiness she destroyed? The cutthroat asked him to listen to her. When she was an adventurer on the old continent, she had the alias of a skill thief. As the name suggests, she stole skills. She took skills from bad people and used them to help others. It would be very hypocritical to do such a thing again. It's just that, back then, she hadn't considered that bad people also have families. One day, she saw a family consisting of a woman and 2 children who were crying bitterly at the grave of their breadwinner. She will never forget that moment. Of course, the skill she stole from that man was super memory. She didn't think that he would end his life. She simply wanted to teach this shameless criminal a lesson. She intended to return his skill to him as soon as he realized his mistake. But only after his death did she understand that skills are part of a person. They can't be separated. They're natural. Taking them away is cruel. That's why she vowed to never steal skills again. The protagonist thought in amazement. So the king knew Shicha wouldn't be able to use his skill. That's why he staged this spectacle, pretending to find out if Shicha could steal a hero's skill, to make Ares believe that hero status isn't immutable and can be transferred to anyone else. Shicha continued to send money to the deceased's family, even though their mother hadn't recovered. The children overcame the loss of their father and grew up to be wonderful people. Now they even have their own families. Slad spoke sympathetically. I see, Shicha remarked, glad he understood that in a situation like this, he shouldn't speak well. He thought, this is a broken past and it's already over. There's nothing good in it. Shicha said she knows it's very selfish, but she can't. She can't steal Ares' skills. It doesn't matter to the king. She knows he thinks revealing the existence of skill theft is enough. The protagonist asked then, why was she planning to leave? The girl, after a moment's silence, said she didn't want everyone to know about the skill itself. Let him forgive her. She can't help it. He replied, everything is fine. He understands how she feels. By the way, Rumeri wanted to apologize to her. Shicha smiled and asked him to tell her not to worry about it. The protagonist objected. She should tell her herself. She was about to protest, but MC stepped towards her and firmly declared he won't allow it. The fact that she won't use skill theft anymore is certainly a good thing. However, her intention to leave isn't quite right. And yet, if that's what she wants, they can't stop her. But he won't let her leave without even hearing Rumeri's apology. Shicha lowered her head and said, he's hitting where it hurts. He said after all, she ran away from that family. She wondered what if they didn't forgive her? What if she didn't deserve forgiveness? And she kept putting it off, believing that she would eventually apologize someday. But it was too late, right? She wanted to be forgiven, to have some kind of influence cast on her. Helping the family without saying anything is the easiest way, right? Shicha, cornered by his true words, cried out tearfully, yes, that's it, and she will keep running. Run the easy way, and always be alone. MC replied, she won't be alone. She managed to keep her composure that day, didn't she? The girl asked again, that day? He reminded her of how Rumeri had been in such despair when she found the hat in danger. And he, even after finding the hat, was as calm as a boa constrictor, thanks to her alone. Although she blamed herself more than anyone else and wanted to run away, he looked her straight in the eyes and continued, so let her not run away anymore. The girl, with tears in her eyes, looked at him in surprise. Slad had said she couldn't change the past, but the present was in her hands, right? She turned away from him and called him an idiot, her shoulders shaking with suppressed tears. Then she turned sharply and said with a smile, he loves giving such wise advice, and he always hits the nail on the head. The protagonist smiled too and replied, it's very easy. She just needs to apologize for rushing out without a word. After some time, the thug returned to her allies with the protagonist. Rumeri exclaimed upon seeing her. She was so upset. If she had abandoned them like that, she would never have been able to return to life. Shicha cleared her voice and without raising her head asked for forgiveness. Rumeri rushed to her and hugged her so tightly that Shicha almost choked. The witch exclaimed, and let her forgive her. She said hurtful things to her. MC thought happily. One way or another, everything seemed to be resolved. Ethica, trying to contain her emotions, which was failing miserably, shouted to her allies that she didn't want to ruin their party, but she was so happy. With these words, she jumped up and down with joy. Everyone stared at her in surprise. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and the secretary entered the room. She apologized and added that she came with news of today's court hearing. Seeing the protagonist, with all the girls happily lying on top of him, she confusedly apologized for interrupting them. The protagonist objected, saying she'd misunderstood. After a while, the allies left the courtroom, exhausted. MC thought today's court hearing had been mostly about uncovering Ares' crimes. Ethics harassment had also been testified to, and overall, everything had gone smoothly. But he still hadn't been able to clear up the misunderstanding when they'd been caught in bed. He couldn't wait to get home and rest. Suddenly, knights appeared out of nowhere, and one of them addressed Slad and his comrades. The man said they were to escort them by order of the king. Ethica looked at her allies in panic. The protagonist sighed heavily, thinking, it's not his destiny to rest today. When they entered the room where the king sat, they were surprised to see Dish there. The holy maiden was delighted at their arrival, but asked the king in bewilderment. He'd called so many people despite being unaccompanied. Kasif chuckled and said, don't worry about his safety. Even if they all rushed at him at once, they wouldn't stand a chance. His words radiated such a hidden threat that the allies practically felt the aura shift around them. He looked at the protagonist and continued, what about him anyway? Or rather, his abilities. He's already told all his comrades about them, except Ares, right? Kasif approached him, took him by the shoulders, and asked, isn't this guy dangerous? All the girls looked at them in surprise. The king put an arm around MC's shoulders. Slad addressed the king by name and exclaimed in irritation, sounds like he's some kind of shady character. The ruler laughed. Well, he really was a rather strange fellow, but that's beside the point. He looked at the confused girls, chuckled, and said, we need to clear up this misunderstanding. He meant that the protagonist had a powerful skill. By the way, they could stop with these formalities already. That's why he ordered the guards to leave. Shicha shook her head, bewildered. She doesn't understand what's going on. Ethica smiled, asking the king if he was okay with familiarity. What a relief. The international language is so complicated. Rumeri noticed, he's so friendly. And only Disha bowed to Kasif and said that people like them have no right to disregard politeness when speaking to him. Kasif chuckled again and asked MC, is the holy maiden always like this? He replied, Yes, she's quite a serious person. The girl hit him on the back of the head, irritably remarking, he should look at himself. You can't address the king so brazenly. The ruler remarked that he must observe all his etiquette, even when receiving his old friend. Why are the clergy so strict? The girls were confused by the words of the king, an old friend. The protagonist smiled and told his companions that he and Kassiv had once been teammates. The girls, as if on cue, without a word, exclaimed in surprise. What was he saying? He thought he was beginning to get used to their cries of surprise. The king laughed and said, he's just a former adventurer who's suddenly become king. Let them just come forward if the elder extends his hand. He waved his hand over the table of delicacies and added, if they don't want it, then he won't drink anymore either. Disha turned to the king with reproach and surprise, but Rumeri raised her hand and, addressing the holy maiden by name, added, enough, the king has given his permission. When the allies sat down at the table and began to eat, everyone was delighted by the deliciousness of the dishes before them. Erika shoved food into the protagonist's mouth and told him to eat too. He was delighted. It truly was delicious. Disha indignantly told her comrades that the king should begin the meal first. Kassiv joyfully exclaimed, that's right, then they will throw a banquet. Let them drink and be merry. This is the king's order. Kassiv himself, the protagonist, Erika, and Rumeri raised their glasses. Disha and Shicha watched in confusion. After drinking, the ruler said, if only they knew how difficult it is to handle all these legal proceedings. There were so many different circumstances surrounding this case. MC told him that all this was wonderful, of course, but let him tell them the reasons behind it. The king chuckled and said, they still can't see the whole picture. Okay, then, let's have a frank conversation. What do they really think of Ares? Rumeri immediately said, he's pure evil. Disha added, useless trash. Edicum said, such a hero doesn't inspire confidence. Kassiv said that was the main reason why a trial was necessary. He'd been a notorious dictator since childhood, chasing after every skirt. Just when his heroic skill was revealed at his coming-of-age ceremony, a premonition arose that this was the birth of the most vile savior in history. However, the fact that he is a hero is undeniable. First of all, there's a precedent for heroes defeating all the Demon King's predecessors. That's a thing of the past. But the fact remains, everyone began to believe the legend preached by the priests. The elite of the old continent gossiped about the same thing, and his compatriots, with whom they'd been through hell together, urged, since a hero is trash, they should surrender. They just need to burn their relatives who've turned into evil spirits. He opened his mouth, but couldn't speak. He had no choice but to let Ares be the hero, regardless of his personal opinion of him. The protagonist had spoken, so he gathered them. Kassiv replied that yes, it had been an important decision. As he'd said in court, he was proud of the people he'd brought together on this team. At first, everything had been fine, but in his pursuit of military achievements, Ares had been firmly on the wrong path. He undoubtedly considered himself the strongest hero. Little did he know that it was all thanks to MC. Perhaps inviting him to the team hadn't been the best idea. Rumeri countered that it wasn't. Disha remarked that if it weren't for him, the hero's team would have fallen apart even faster. Shicha added that she also disagreed with that assumption. The king chuckled in confusion and whispered, Slad, he's popular with the girls, as always. The protagonist snapped back, well, no more popular than him. Ethika exclaimed, everything will be fine as long as Slad is with them. The king laughed and cheerfully remarked, oh, a little half-elf will soon be born? Rumeri said this was harassment. Disha said that if the two of them are going to marry, she will grant them her blessing. The protagonist remarked, a quiet, peaceful life in the elven thicket. That sounds quite nice. Ethika screamed indignantly. The conversation had gone off track. Shicha joined in the general merriment, asking, what about the house? She knows a good dwarf builder. She'll get them a 50% discount as a go-between. Ethika indignantly tried to stop everyone. The king, laughing, remarked, so where were we? They need to get back to talking about forming a team. Ares said he wouldn't work with men. That's why he mostly picked out girls for him, and among the boys, he only agreed to Slad as a porter. Rumeri exclaimed, and she was a volunteer. The king had noticed, rightly so. Her enthusiasm made her an ideal candidate, but more importantly, she had excellent skill. The witch clarified, was her skill unparalleled? Kassiv said, yes, it was. It would be a shame if Ares abused his comrades. He was looking for those capable of standing up to him. Disha asked if that concerned her too. The ruler admitted yes, but that wasn't the only reason. The temple always has strict requirements, so he chose her first. Shicha remarked irritably, was she really chosen because dwarves are strong in combat? The king chuckled and said, it was simply Ares' hobby. The protagonist wondered if he hadn't been counting on skill theft. His insurance had really worked. Kassiv continued. Hearing their zeal, he thought it was a complete coincidence that everything had worked out so well. But then again, the number of complaints grew along with their enthusiasm, and they already knew the rest. Ares' decision to expel the porter, who had earned universal acclaim, had turned into a disaster in an instant. Disha noted the sudden end. The king continued. First of all, do they think he's even capable of defeating a monster of such a unique species? The allies hesitated, unsure of what to say. the ruler remarked. A very difficult task, isn't it? So that's how it is. Pouring wine into a glass, he said his plan to allow the hero to defeat the Demon King had ended in failure. After forming a team, the happy servants of the hero's faction were overtaken by disappointment, as Ares was causing too many problems. The members of the royal family of the old continent, who had supported him, were furious at their ruined reputation. The elite reviewed all the complaint reports. As expected, they wanted to punish Ares, so they pounced on the counterplan he'd been mulling over from the start. Disha, perplexed, asked, "What plan?" Kosov looked at his allies and said they should pursue peaceful coexistence with the Demon King for the sake of saving the common people. Disha shouted in irritation. "That's impossible," Rumeri also said with a disgruntled expression. "She can't accept that." The king sighed and declared, "That's the reality. There's no guarantee that the sacred power will be able to defeat their enemy this time either." The acolytes only gossiped about how this skill helped defeat the previous Demon King, who wasn't exactly a unique monster. Besides, the Demon King is waging a major war, commanding an entire army of evil spirits. Therefore, killing him isn't necessary. The plan is to defeat the army and negotiate a peace treaty with the instigator of the war. Talk of the hero ending in a battle with the Demon King was child's play. Shicha noted with disappointment, meaning it was pointless from the start. Disha exclaimed angrily. If he thought that, why even create a hero's team? She knew he had no other choice. But if he'd initially considered it pointless, then what were they all fighting for? It didn't matter what the people said or what the believers blared. It didn't matter whether Ares was even a hero. It would have been better if he'd simply ignored him. Kasif paused for a moment, then said, "Slad, the reason for this." MC looked at the king in confusion. The ruler continued. When he learned that the protagonist was now on this continent, a thought flashed through his mind. Maybe it was him? Perhaps the one who defeated the fourth unique monster, the Dragon Empress, 10 years ago would be able to do it? The girls, except for the thug and ethic, were stunned by what they heard. He defeated the fourth unique monster? Shicha remarked. Ah, so they both hadn't heard about it yet. The elf added. He told them this before meeting the Nightmare Fairy. Disha and Rumeri pounced on the protagonist. Didn't he want to tell them anything? The protagonist responded with confusion. Well, his comrades fought desperately and were ready to say goodbye to life more than once, and then they won. Rumeri exclaimed, so dryly, he added, his mere presence was enough for them to do so. The king exclaimed, what is he talking about? He's crazy. But that's what he was hoping for. Ares was clearly deluded about his own powers because of him. If only he could defeat the Demon King while still feeding on these illusions. That was the plan. So, most of all, he's the one to blame. With these words, the king slammed his fist on the table, as if admitting his guilt. He then stood and begged for forgiveness, adding that he was deeply sorry. His allies looked at him sympathetically, and Slad told him there was no need to regret it. Circumstances vary, and he did what he had to. More importantly, he wouldn't have met his friends if not for this plan. The girls smiled at him, agreeing with his opinion. The king said thoughtfully, it's his fault, but he wanted to apologize as his heart was heavy. In any case, thanks to the trial, he had managed to strengthen his relations with the clergy and the royal family of the old continent. So, Ares can now officially be stripped of his hero title. It's time he answered for all his crimes. There's no need to make a fuss about this matter by publicly stripping him of his skills. The king turned to Shicha and added that he had treated her poorly. The girl chuckled and replied that she, too, should gradually move forward. Truth be told, she didn't entirely agree with his peace treaty plan, but when she saw the legends come to life with her own eyes, it seemed like making fairy tales come true wasn't such an impossible dream. Kasiv apologized once more and asked if he could use this power one more time. The thug, after a moment's thought, surprised her friends by answering, okay. She would master the Ares skill. After a while, the protagonist opened the window and enjoyed the fresh air. Ethica approached him and said, there it is. Looking at her flushed face, he asked if she was all right. Had the alcohol really gotten to her head? The elf smiled and said, don't worry, she's fine. She placed the glass on the windowsill and asked if it had been the right decision, wasn't it? The protagonist admitted he wasn't sure how right it had been. After all, Ares was the one who was supposed to bring peace to these lands. However, he persuaded Kasiv to let him read the complaints they had seen at the trial, and then he learned that Ares had harmed too many people. And yet, he had never deigned to apologize to them. And yet, the world was forced to accept Ares only because he was a hero. The only reason he wasn't sent to prison or the mines was precisely this. He was arrogant, selfish, and ungrateful. It was hard for him to even say a simple thank you. Women were merely tools for him to satisfy his needs. He didn't care about the people around him or humanity as a whole. And so soon, he would be stripped of his hero title. Ethica said, I see. He, as always, looked out for everyone, even Ares. Maybe he would forgive him? The protagonist exclaimed, don't worry, he would never forgive him. He had never apologized to his comrades, or to anyone for that matter. Cursing was always pouring out of his mouth, and his failures were always someone else's fault, but not his own. That's how he knew him. MC turned to her and thanked her. The girl asked, perplexed, why? She was simply worried about him. Slad said, for helping him decide. Ethica asked, confused, decide on what? The protagonist smiled and said it was too early for him to retire. He would continue being an adventurer. Extending his hand, he asked if she wanted to join him. She looked at his hand hand in confusion and said that before meeting him, she knew nothing about the outside world. Although they hadn't known each other for long, he had taught her a lot, and she thought he would teach her much more. She was lucky to have met him. She extended her hand to him with a smile and happily said, "So yes, please, let him take care of her." Sometime later, when the protagonist was stretched out on a soft, comfortable bed, there was a knock at the door. Disha asked if she could come in for a minute. He peeked out of the room, rubbed his eyes, and asked why she wasn't sleeping at this hour. She asked sheepishly if she could come in. MC, surprised, said, "Of course." He let the girl in, made tea for himself and her, and stared at her silently, waiting for her to speak. Disha suddenly dropped her head onto the table and begged his forgiveness. Slad was confused and exclaimed in bewilderment, "What's wrong with her?" The Holy Virgin, without raising her head, said it was all her fault. Lord, how stupid she was. How could she have imagined she could control that monster? He understood. So she also read those complaints about the hero? Disha exclaimed indignantly. There's no place for someone like him among the living. She should have killed him with her own hands. Then perhaps so many people wouldn't have suffered. She raised her head, her face streaked with tears. He said, embarrassed, that he himself wasn't fully aware of the terrible things he'd done. Even Shicha was in the dark, and she couldn't have known everything either. The girl countered, no, maybe everyone else couldn't. But she should have guessed. It was the temple that protected the hero from punishment. He couldn't turn his back on Ares when he'd glorified him for so long and so fervently. A hero's skill is a gift from the gods, and if it was bestowed on a monster, then the gods had made a mistake. MC noted sadly, truly, what church would want their god to be able to make mistakes? Gods don't have that right. Disha said she was sure it was the temple that hid the hero's atrocities. This was probably Skills' doing. He asked, puzzled, Skills? The girl explained that the temple had always been radical, but there's an organization there that's willing to do anything to prove the god's superiority. If they're truly involved, it makes sense why they couldn't notice Ares' antics. The protagonist looked at her sheepishly, and she continued, to be honest, she had to resort to their services once too, but despite her role in the temple, which gave her access to its central power, she didn't notice these manipulations. As a saint, she was blinded only by her task, to guide the hero and defeat the demon lord. The protagonist said Ares wasn't solely her responsibility. He was also to blame. They were comrades, but they barely spoke to each other. He gave up too soon and stopped trying to build a relationship with him. Besides, they could have asked Shicha to keep an eye on him. Even Rimeri turned a blind eye to his antics to achieve her own goal. And Shicha couldn't strip Ares of his ability because she felt guilty for her past mistake. They were all to blame. Disha exclaimed in bewilderment, but how could this be? He continued. No matter how hard he tried, his words couldn't relieve her remorse. Placing his hand on her shoulder, he added, but let her know one thing. He'll always be there to support her. After all, that's his unique skill, right? So don't worry too much. The holy maiden grabbed his hand, pressed it to her chest, and exclaimed, she swears she will definitely carry out reforms in the temple. Let him believe her. Dropping him onto the bed, Disha hugged him and repeated, let him believe her. He sheepishly replied that he did. The girl added, she will never let him down. The protagonist exclaimed in surprise. He never thought she could be so inspired. She always tries so hard, and she gets her thoughts across quite directly. She often threatened to hit him hard, but she never meant it. The Holy Virgin asked if he remembered what they talked about in their dream. She'd finally found it, her own desire, the path she'd chosen. He joyfully replied, that's wonderful. The next day, walking in hunger, he thought, the scars Ares left on this world are deep, but they will take responsibility for his sins. Although he was found innocent at the hero's trial, he will now live with this burden. Now his new adventure begins. Arriving in the city, he bought almost everything he needed. Checking his list, the protagonist said that he still needed slime jam and the ingredients for apple pie. Suddenly, a noise caught his attention. He pushed through the crowd and asked what the noise was about. There was no fight. He was told that the hero was being transported. He had been found guilty at the trial and placed in a cage. Numerous guards were barely holding the cage in which Ares was raging. He screamed furiously, this is unfair. Why are they all staring at him? They have no right to keep him here. Let them release him immediately. He's a hero. Ares suddenly spotted MC in the crowd and began angrily shouting at him that he would kill him. He managed to get the guards, tired of his antics, to give him a few punches to calm him down. But still, the former hero screamed at Slad. This is all his fault. Ares, swinging his fists, simply burned with the desire to hit him. He broke free from the guard's grasp and, shouting that this was all his fault, rushed at Slad with his fists. He screamed that they had sold him out. The protagonist's skill automatically activated, and Ares, before he could hit him, suddenly began to weaken before his eyes. The protagonist, holding a bag of apples, looked at the fallen fruit and thought, I see. He remembered Ethic's words that he, as always, was keeping an eye on everyone, including Ares. Maybe he would forgive him? He told her then not to worry. He'd never do that. And now, looking at the distraught former hero, he thought, yes, Ares was anyone but a comrade to him. It was surprising that the automatic buff was still affecting him. The former leader lay on the ground, twitching helplessly, reaching out to MC. Slad crouched before him and said, now, he's really saying goodbye. Standing up, he gave the surprised Ares a long look and then walked away. The guards ran up to the former hero and grabbed him. The head guards shouted at his subordinates, "Why aren't they keeping him under control? He could hurt civilians. Catch him now." The former hero hurled insults at the guards and threatened to kill them all. The protagonist thought sadly, his target has changed, so the automatic debuff has worn off. Ares isn't just attacking him, he's attacking everyone indiscriminately. He's no longer a hero, but a monster. When he returned home, the girls joyfully greeted him with a set table. Mary asked what all the fuss was about outside. Shicha remarked that they were already tired of waiting for him. Disha said he'd wanted to try some apple pie, and now they'd done it. He froze in bewilderment. Etika rushed to him, hugged him, and told him not to be so cold. This was their long-awaited meeting after 2 weeks. "Let him come to the table," Shicha remarked. "That's right. Instead of grumbling at each other, they should have a drink." Etika agreed. "Exactly. All together, and bottoms up." The protagonist looked at them with a smile, thinking, Disha had recently returned to the temple and started training with the monks. The priests obviously told her that this was unacceptable for a holy virgin, but she had chosen her path. Rumeri was invited to the royal palace, where she brews potions for the frontline warriors. She's delighted to have the opportunity not only to fight monsters, but also to combat discrimination against half-breeds. During this time, she and Etika have become very close and now often visit the merchants' stalls together. Shicha now works for Kashiu, performing some dirty espionage work. She's saddled with a huge debt for the skill theft incident, so she now provides various services to the king for free. She's truly a darling of fortune, and Little Nightmare has been flitting about the capital lately, bringing sweet dreams to children. However, she constantly haunts his dreams at night. Apparently, she's chosen them as her new abode. The former hero was sentenced to death, which was entirely expected, given the number of crimes he committed and the gravity of some of them. For example, harassing the daughter of an aristocrat. He no longer had the hero skill. Shicha had taken it from him, and Disha had been assigned to guard him. Essentially, the hero's team was finished. Shicha, Rumeri, Disha, they had lost the meaning of their adventurous life. Sometime later, the allies were gathering herbs. Ethika approached him, holding a bunch of herbs, and asked if this was enough. But he stood frozen, looking up at the sky. He became embarrassed, and she patted him on the back and asked what was wrong with him. She felt something strange, looked at the sky, and abruptly ran to a high cliff and saw that the castle was engulfed in a storm. Ethika called out to Slad in horror and said that something was wrong with the sky above the city. He felt a strange sensation, and she loudly said that a disaster had occurred. Whole crowds of zombies and skeletons surrounded the capital. He looked at this and wondered. A sacred barrier was erected around the capital. How did they get through it? She was going to go there to help, but he stopped her and thought that the zombies and skeletons were very weak, but there were too many of them. Not 100, not tens of hundreds. There were about 10,000 of them. They should entrust the attack to the undead Kusiv. Someone flew next to them on a huge monster, called out to him and asked, "Isn't he, by any chance, the porter from the hero's team?" He landed next to them, bowed with a broad smile, and said it was a pleasure to meet them. He was the commander of the Demon King's army's undead squad, Zelhard the Sixth. He looked at him and wondered, this is the commander of the Demon King's army? An incredibly important person. The undead themselves, of course, couldn't overcome the barrier. However, with a summoner of the demon souls, the situation changes dramatically. Under the influence of the forbidden skill, the undead are capable of much more. The summoning was performed near the capital, so no one noticed the approaching monsters. The only thing worse than the undead themselves is a summoner capable of controlling such a huge horde. This is the power of a high-ranking commander of the Demon King's army, Ethika asked loudly. He controls these undead, after all. Why would he do this? He said with a serious expression that, frankly, he had come to help the hero, to save him from execution. The protagonist was a little confused by this and wondered, had he come to help Ares? He stood before them and said that the hero had greatly interested their master. An arrogant human character, a sinister soul that even the undead shunned, and most importantly, monstrous combat power. Making him a hero was a waste. He was much more suited to the role of one of the Demon King's army. He held out his hand in front of her and thought that if he thought about it, he was right. His soul was so black that if only he weren't a hero, he would surely have become one of the leaders of the Dark Army. Zelhar said that, in short, he was a scout. If they still hoped for salvation, it would be better to start running. But would that be any use? He thought that fighting countless enemies would be quite difficult. If he were alone, he might be able to somehow cope with the automatic debuff, but she was nearby. Such a crowd could not be distracted by a maneuver of a provocation skill. Moreover, throwing stones at him was useless. Something had to be done, otherwise she would be in danger. He turned to her and loudly said that she should leave him and run. However, unexpectedly for them, a powerful surge of energy occurred. Ethika called upon the spirit and loudly said that Ares had committed too many atrocities. He would not go unpunished. MC was surprised by this and loudly asked what happened at all. She stood in front of him and said that Sylph blew the undead out of the way. He was very surprised by this and loudly asked when she had become so strong. She said that they went on missions for a whole month while he was away. Of course, she had become stronger. They would talk about this later. For now, he had to light a fire. He had to trust her and hurry. He quickly made a torch and thought how good it was that he had brought the enchanted flint with him. He called her and asked, "That will do, right?" She agreed, and Zelchar flew high into the air and said that she had managed to surprise him, but there was no point in it. He raised his staff above his head and, with a mad smile, said loudly that if they hadn't noticed yet, he possessed the skill Soulmaster. Slad had a hunch and thought that this was the first time he had heard of such an ability. He said that as they might have already guessed, it was a unique skill. With it, he could summon and control many times more undead than a typical soulcaster. It was a shame that they were weak on their own, but he could do it like this. He summoned a multitude of zombies, which gathered into one huge monster and loudly declared that the golem of the dead was ready for battle. Would she be able to blow away such a huge monster with her wind? He waved his staff and loudly ordered the golem to crush the two. However, at that very moment, the fire from the torch in his hands began to intensify, and another spirit appeared next to them. He was very surprised by what he heard and asked, "Is this the spirit of fire? The salamanders?" Wait, she summoned another spirit, but Sylph didn't disappear? Ethika said calmly that she had mastered multiple summoning. He was very impressed by this and thought that it had been a long time. He looked to the side and thought that the golem of the dead had turned into a pile of ash. Zelhar looked at them with a wide grin, laughed, and said that fire is the undead's weakness. But in this case, it is useless. Everything is useless. As long as he has the Soulmaster skill, they cannot win. He resurrected this golem and sent this monster towards them again. They were surprised by this, and she said that it really was reborn. He looked at them and said that, in general, his skill is capable of endlessly summoning an army of the dead, so he can revive the golem as much as he wants. The protagonist was very surprised by this, and thought that this was too much. She said loudly that then they would simply burn it clean. Her spirits attacked the huge monster again, but it immediately recovered, causing him to laugh loudly and say it was all useless. She had an idea, took her bow and arrows, and asked what if they removed the one controlling the monster. She fired a very powerful arrow, but he dodged the attack and said it was a good thing he brought an arrow ward with him just in case. He got angry because of this and thought that the arrow ward magically blocked material projectiles. Physical attacks wouldn't work. I wish Romary were here with her long-range magic. Ethics asked if he could put a debuff on him. MC said that first he needed his attacks to be aimed directly at him. He thought that this demon wasn't ordering them to attack. The golem, like any undead, simply hates living beings, so it attacks of its own free will. He said that if he let the golem attack him, the skill might work, but there was no point in it at all. Even if he temporarily defeated the golem, he could simply summon other undead. She said that's how it was, then he'd have to make do with her power. He apologized and said that if only his debuff wasn't automatic and he could use it at will, then he would be right now. She touched his face and said that he didn't have to apologize. Everything would be fine. She just needed to try a little harder. He was surprised and asked if she had a plan. At that moment, a huge golem attacked them, and she counterattacked with her magic and loudly declared that her opponent was his. She was breathing heavily from fatigue, and he wondered if his mana was really running out. He wasn't even out of breath. Could it be that he wasn't reviving the golem of the dead, but summoning new zombies, which then formed into him? He can't be infinitely powerful. Wait, if the Soulmaster skill can endlessly summon undead, then why isn't he still? He didn't have time to finish his thought because Ethika began to collapse from fatigue, asked him for forgiveness, and said that she could hardly hear the spirits' voices anymore. He gently lowered her to the ground and said that even so, she was simply amazing. She said that he was much more amazing. She is just a beginner who uses the spirit's power without having her own. The spirits were able to fight the Demon King's powerful army because he was with her. He didn't understand what she meant, but she asked him to listen to her and said that he should understand that his comrades were amazing only because of him. He should be proud of his strength. She had already played her role. Could he please finish this scene? After these words, she lost consciousness and the spirits disappeared. Because of this, a wide smile appeared on Zelhar's face, and he said loudly that it seemed she had reached her limit. He's probably already in despair, isn't he? He doesn't have to worry. Right now, with all his kindness, he'll escort them both to the afterlife. He didn't have time to finish because Slad said that the fifth monster's middle name was a unique species, the Lord of the Dead. Now he realized he was simply a liar. A little earlier, he thought that only one small detail had given him away. If the army was infinite, then he should be able to summon many more undead at once, and accordingly, recreate many more deceased golems. Why had he been dragging out the battle with her? It suggests that his summoning and control capabilities are not truly limitless. His ability, Soulmaster, also refers to incorporeal undead creatures like ghosts or phantoms, but he only summons zombies and skeletons. Unique skills are given exclusive names that reflect their operating principles. So, a name like Deadmaster or Corpse Master would be much more logical. Why Soulmaster? That's the first question. The second question concerns excessive performance. The undead reconstruction reconstruction skill consumes the same amount of stamina as controlling the dead with Soul Master. It's strange that despite this, he still hasn't shown symptoms of mana deficiency. So, does that mean that reconstructing the undead doesn't consume his magical power? Currently, Zelhar chuckled at what he heard and said that he was quite well informed. Such things are usually known only to the undead summoners themselves. They, the summoners of the departed souls, worship him. The protagonist said that he has an inexhaustible supply of recreated undead, just like the Lord of the Dead. It can't be that some ward of the 16th Demon King could compete with the afterlife. He became very angry about this and loudly asked, what did he just say? Even if he lied a little about his abilities, the fact remains that he is finished. He loudly called out to the golem of the departed and said that it must crush this freak. At that moment, the monster attacked him, and he loudly asked, does a simple porter think himself a hero? It would be better if he just ran away from here. MC stopped the monster's attack with one hand, released very strong energy, and many zombies and skeletons began to fall to the ground. Zelhar was shocked by what happened and loudly asked, what was that all about? He pointed at it with a calm expression and asked, what's wrong with him? He can summon as many undead as he wants, so he should do it. He raised his staff above his head with a tense expression and loudly called upon the undead. Because of this, the crowd of zombies and skeletons began to retreat from the city walls. He looked at him with a calm expression and said that apparently they were not rising, but he was calling them to himself with his staff. What else can he do? Because the Lord of Souls can only extract magical power from the dead at a certain distance. This skill allows the caster to control corpses by transferring deceased souls into them. When the bodies are damaged, the ghosts return to the Lord, thereby restoring his magical powers. This is all because the possessed dead became too far away for him to replenish his full reserves of strength. Not having the opportunity to increase his combat power, he called for reinforcements from the capital, and, to prevent this from happening again, made the monster larger. The souls from the golem defeated by the wind returned to him, because he did not fly too far. If things had continued like this, he would have trampled them effortlessly. But she summoned the salamanders, and so the battle dragged on. The limit of his army is 30,000, isn't it? This is the maximum possible increase in magical power with the artifact. In this way, he extracts souls from the slain dead, restores mana, and revives the undead with the Soul Master skill. That's the secret of his fake limitless power. Zelhar tensed up at what he heard and loudly said that with his analytical skills, he couldn't be an ordinary porter. Who the hell was he anyway? Slad pointed a finger at him with a serious expression, loudly stated his name, and said that he, the one who overthrew the Dragon Empress, Tiamat, 10 years ago, was an SSS-ranked adventurer. He laughed loudly at what he heard and loudly asked, what kind of nonsense was he talking about? It couldn't be that someone like him had defeated the Demon King's mother. He said in a calm tone that he didn't know the current Demon King was born to the Dragon Empress. He didn't take it seriously, and said that the army that had arrived numbered in the thousands. Didn't he think it would be better for him to take the elf and make a splash? He asked with a serious expression. Who had told him to crush that porter a minute ago? Unexpectedly for Zelhar, his dragon fell to the ground and loudly asked what had happened to it. He looked at it and said that it must have run out of strength. He should quickly recall all his warriors from the walls of the capital to restore it. He was about to ask something loudly, but at that moment, numerous powerful explosions occurred in the forest, which distracted his attention. He began to worry even more about his limitless army, and the protagonist approached him and said that it seemed even Ethica had noticed that his powers were not limitless and decided to take a risk. She made a premature move by calling for reinforcements. Sylph is capable of transmitting sounds through spiritual wind magic. With her first cry, she conveyed a message to her comrades. What came of it, he could observe with his own eyes. At that moment, his comrades were fighting against a crowd of monsters. Zelchar saw this and loudly asked, are those the witch and the holy maiden from the hero's team? Since when did they become so strong? He stood before him and said that they simply used to obey the hero, more precisely Ares, who did not allow them to develop their potential. He ran towards him, loudly skied in displeasure, and said that he would definitely kill at least him. He did not have time to reach him because someone hit him hard and took the staff from his hands. He saw Shicha and loudly asked, when did a noble thief appear here? She looked at the staff and said it could be sold to the guild as a research material. In fact, they came across someone very poor. At that moment, a multitude of zombies fell to the ground, which surprised him, and loudly said that it only obeyed the spellcasters of departed souls. She leaned towards him and said that she was simply a noble thief. Although the stolen skill had limitations, it ignored the operating conditions of most artifacts. In short, the limitless army was no longer under his control. He became very worried about this, began receiving debuffs, and loudly called them freaks. After that, MC fell to the ground and said that they had miraculously pulled it off. She turned to him with a smile and said that their date had been quite difficult. He, with a displeased look, said that collecting medicinal herbs was no joke to him. By the way, had she been hiding there this whole time? She could have intervened earlier. She shook her head in refusal and asked how she could help in such a situation. He looked confused and said, for example, that she could steal a skill from him. Shicha asked, He's joking right now, isn't he? Unique abilities can't be obtained by stealing skills. In short, it was out of her competence. At that moment, the rest of the team ran up to them. Disha called out loudly in a worried tone and asked if they were all right. She ran up to Etika, examined her and said how happy she was. Apparently she was just low on mana. He called her and said that he was grateful that she responded to their call. She replied, "He speaks as if this victory did not come easy to him." He said that, in fact, that was true, because if he had stood still, the debuff would not have affected all the undead and he had to try harder. Rumeri glanced to the side, noticed Zelhar lying on the ground and was about to ask something, but he said it was a demon. She approached him, and he looked into her eyes and asked what a half-breed wanted from him. With a serious expression, she asked if he knew a demon named Carnid. He closed his eyes and said that he never heard that name. She said that then she didn't need anything from him. He smiled and said that she was a half-breed, but she dared to look down on him. What was she doing on the side of those who despised demons? How about granting him a quick death? She looked at her comrades, refused, and he laughed and said that it turned out she wasn't stupid, because killing him was pointless. After all, the Demon King was capable of reviving the fallen. Disha was very surprised by what she heard and loudly asked, "Can he resurrect the dead?" Shicha shook her head in denial and said he was simply lying and should admit defeat. He raised a shaking hand and said they could think whatever they wanted. It would actually be better that way. The king had inherited the ability to dominate life from his mother. He was, after all, the commander of a squad of departed souls, not some pawn. His hand fell to the floor. He gestured to the side and said that he would surely be revived. When that happened, he would come for their souls. They were surprised by this and asked if the Demon King really could resurrect, then he could also resurrect their mother. However, could such a thing really be possible? There are no artifacts with such properties. If this were true, then it would seem that domination over life is now a bad thing for someone who handles it carelessly. Slad, looking a little confused, said that he wasn't lying. The Demon King can resurrect the fallen, but he doubted he would be granted this honor. At the same time, in the castle of the Dragon Demon King, Shumgar, he loudly asked if Zelhar the Second One was really killed. A servant stood in front of him and said that it looked like that was the case. He was surprised by this and asked how he could lose. He recognized him as the commander of a squad of deceased souls, counting on his unique skill. He called the overlord with a confused look and asked what he planned to do. He said in a very serious tone that of course he was going to bring him back to life. Such skills are worth their weight in gold. He called him and ordered him to rise. Unexpectedly for him, nothing happened, and he asked, "What do you mean by that?" The servant looked at him with a confused look and asked what happened. He said in a surprised tone that he was not reviving. Why isn't he answering his call? The servant became very nervous and said loudly that he didn't know either. Perhaps this master refuses to return? He said loudly in a dissatisfied tone that his orders were unconditional. They weren't subject to anyone's will. He said with a confused look that there was no other explanation. He continued trying to resurrect him, but nothing worked, and he loudly asked what he was doing wrong. He killed many demons nearby with this cry, and the shocked servant came to his senses and was about to say something in horror. Shumgar sat in front of him and said that he was revived by him. Where is his gratitude? He bowed before him and said that he was immensely grateful. He called this decision correct and asked if there was no reason to doubt his power. Then, why wasn't Zelchar responding? He asked with a worried look if he could ask something. Perhaps this would help determine the reasons. He gave his permission and said that he must sort this out. He asked with a worried tone, "Can the Master's great power resurrect absolutely anything?" He was surprised by what he heard and asked if he answered, would he be able to understand the reason? He looked very frightened and said that it was possible, but not certain. He nevertheless agreed to reveal this secret and said that there are 3 types of creatures that he cannot resurrect using the power inherited from his parent. These are rare species, those he has never met in person, and those whose lives were taken by old age. The servant, looking shocked, said loudly that Zelhar II was killed back then, taking away years of his life. Shumgar asked, "Is anyone capable of such a thing?" He said loudly with a frightened look that such a unique skill is quite possible. He thought it over and said that it sounded reasonable, much more logical than saying that he was going against his orders. The servant raised his head, about to say something, but at that moment, the king released a powerful energy that killed him, immediately resurrected him, and asked, did he just allow himself to doubt his strength? He deserves 10,000 deaths. He killed him 10,000 times and said that they will end here. He must rise. They must return to the problems at hand. They will meet the hero the way he wanted. It did not work. This is a problem. This is a problem. They need to find another way. Is this guy worth what he thinks? The greatly injured servant immediately agreed with the master. He was dissatisfied with this, immediately killed him and resurrected him. He loudly called out to the commander-in-chief of the Black Raven and said that he must capture the hero Ares alive. He can handle it, right? The demon said in a serious tone that since this is the master's order, he will certainly do it. After some time, Kassav asked, Did they say the revival of the dead? If that's true, then they're in a lot of trouble. He called the protagonist by name and asked, are creatures that have used up their lifespans really invulnerable to resurrection? He agreed and said, if it's about the skill he received from the Dragon Empress 10 years ago, monsters that died from the accelerated aging effect due to his debuff were unable to rise again. The king thought he was right. The Dragon Empress's army consisted of the most powerful warriors. They continued to resurrect again and again, but then his skill changed the tide of the battle. He said that, no matter what, winning battles is meaningless if the enemy's military forces aren't being reduced, so they need to change tactics. He stood before him and said that at least their enemy uses the skill less randomly than the Dragon Empress. He only resurrects 1 or 2 at a time. Shicha stood next to him and said that resurrection is a very mysterious skill. If the Demon King was so eager to get Ares, wouldn't it have been easier to wait until he died from the execution? Disha, looking thoughtful, said that indeed, something didn't add up. Rumeri stood nearby and said that it should be assumed that there are limitations to resurrecting the dead. Kasev said that they should put the issue of limitations aside for now. It was more important to resolve the Ares situation. What if he really was resurrected after the execution? He really shouldn't be killed so recklessly. Disha asked, however, did it even matter? He no longer had the hero skill anyway. Shicha said that in any case, he would fit perfectly into the Demon King's army. Rumeri leaned towards her and said that without help, he was just a weakling. He would end up in the Demon King's army, and then what? After that, he would realize he couldn't do anything. They began to get nervous, and MC said that if something happened, they could use a debuff on him. However, the king waved his hand and said he didn't have to become the executioner. For now, they had no choice but to postpone his execution. He clapped his hands and said with a wide smile that he was grateful to them again. They had helped him out once again. He would reward them sometime later and was grateful for their hard work. Shicha started to leave and said that it was time for her to take her leave then. Disha was also getting ready to leave and said that it was time for her to return to the temple. Rumeri also followed them and said that work was already waiting for her. Slad was about to say something, but he couldn't bring himself to do so, and they noticed this and turned to him. He thought, parting is not the end of the world, but why does he feel so lonely? Nothing like that happened when Ares kicked him out of the team. Then he easily resigned himself. Their ignorance of his skills felt like they didn't see the real him. But now everything is different. He has found those who know those who are ready to walk hand in hand with him, true friends. He wants to experience exciting adventures with them again. He said he had a proposal. Would they like to team up again? After some time. When morning came, he was reading the newspaper and it said that these were the pseudo-hero's last days. 2 months had already passed since Ares was sentenced to execution. He was very surprised by what he read and spat out his coffee. And Ethica was sitting next to him and asked what had happened. He said loudly that they had reunited the team, but for 2 months they hadn't gone on a single normal mission. He really wanted it, but in the end he began to deteriorate. At first, he followed his principles, but in the end, he greedily took advantage of the rank privileges. They have not just a house, but an entire mansion, not only ordinary food, but also desserts. He took the king's words about not having to worry about anything too well. Before he could even blink, he had merged with the flow of carelessness, and he had dragged her along with him. Moreover, he had brought her to such a state that she did not realize the scale of the disaster. She said with a puzzled expression that they had hardly had any adventures, but everything was wonderful anyway. He should look at her. This suit is cute, right? He thought with a displeased expression that it was cute, but the refined life was not something to accustom new adventurers to. He slammed his hands on the table and loudly asked, in any case, how could one have all the benefits of an SSS rank, but only take quests to collect herbs and exterminate goblins? She looked up and said that he was right. This was already boring. He agreed and said that she should tell him more about her thoughts on the matter. She said with a puzzled tone that it seemed better to rely on his opinion. The protagonist was dejected by this and thought that she had become like a hopeless child who was incapable of making decisions on her own. He put his hands on her shoulders and said that today they should get down to real work. A little later, they came to the other's room and Erika put a note on the table in the office and loudly said that they should look at this task. Shisha asked, is this some other task about exterminating goblins? She couldn't join them today. Rumeri said that she could help if they needed to collect herbs, but she didn't want to go with the goblins. She picked up the note with a joyful smile and said that they had something interesting today. She took it, began to read and asked, is this the reward for killing 30 beasts? She thought it was something questionable. She pointed to the line and said they should look here. Adventurers will be promoted from E to D rank. The main reward for the quest is the opportunity to advance in rank. If successful, she will be a D rank. She said that now she understood what caught her attention. Rumeri said that she agreed. She was still an E rank after all. Besides, why don't they do rank up quests? She asked if that was great. MC happily thought that this meant she cared about her adventurer rank. He asked then could she make more potions this time? The girls were very happy to hear this and started tossing Shicha around, and he looked at them from the side and wondered how tired they were of these goblin quests. He happily said that he would go call Dish, and they should get ready in the meantime. A little later, he came to the town hall, in the courtyard of which a battle was taking place between several people. A crowd of people stood around the place, and one of them loudly announced that Eska from the village of Runoa had won. He passed by them and thought that the selection of a new hero had already begun. After Ares lost his title, people began arriving from all over the world who considered themselves worthy of the title of the new hero. Also, it seemed that Disha didn't like this whole idea of the selection. At that moment, she was passing along the same corridor and greeted him. He also greeted her and asked if she was going to the laundry. He offered her his help, and she thanked him for it. They arrived at the laundry, started washing clothes, and he asked why the holy maiden was doing laundry. Isn't that a job for the younger students? She said that everything was fine. She decided to do it herself. He asked, by the way, why she wasn't overseeing today's hero selection. She said that she didn't see the point in overseeing it. This way, they wouldn't find a suitable candidate soon. This selection is conducted solely out of faith in the might of the legendary hero of the old continent. It is merely a test of the body. However, one cannot become a hero simply by following one's own ambitions. One becomes one by doing everything possible for the well-being of their world. People who only want the title of hero simply will not pass the selection. Slad was a little surprised by this and thought it was harsh, although because of Ares, it could not be otherwise. She turned to him and asked, by the way, what brought him here to her. He handed her a note. Disha read it and happily said that it turned out that Ethika was taking on the task. Then she would help them. He thanked her and asked, however, what about her work at the temple? She calmly replied that, as he could see, she didn't have much to do. The priest handled practically everything. A wounded person who specifically needed the help of a holy maiden would definitely not come here. Surprisingly, it was a simple position. In general, she would be more useful to them. Maybe she'll even meet people along the way who could be suitable for the hero's place. After that, they arrived at the guild building and heard someone loudly ask what she was doing there. He saw Ethika standing at the counter, and the worker laughed and said that it was all thanks to her hard work and qualities, ideal for service personnel. She saw him, climbed over the counter, and ran very quickly towards him. She turned to him with a worried look, loudly called his name and said that he should run. This woman is dangerous. This girl turned out to be Selenia. She looked at him embarrassedly and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. How is he doing? He's all right, right? He didn't recognize her, and she walked away a little and said that she once made him an ardent proposal. The protagonist began to think about these words and asked loudly, is she talking about that marriage application? She bowed, introduced herself, and said that she apologized for not introducing herself last time. He asked loudly in a shocked voice, what was she doing in the capital guild? She laughed and said that she heard that he stayed in the capital, but there was no way she could let him go. He shouldn't be so rude. She worked tirelessly and got a position in this branch. She also worked to improve sales results. He called her by name with a confused look and said that her love or perseverance was amazing. He was about to say something else, but his team members said that their relationship was so interesting. A marriage application. Are they going to get married? Is this an affair on the side when he has ethics? Something made her fists itch from this. He turned to them with a very frightened look and said that he had no affairs. Besides, he was not even dating her. A little later, after he was beaten, he said that Lady Selenia was the one who took care of him when he was kicked out of the group. They had nothing else in common. Ethika was sitting next to him, pointed to the side, and said that this girl was making this up herself. She just said with a smile that it was obvious. MC was unhappy with this and wondered why they beat him then. She came up to him and said that he was so boring, but so be it. This time she forgives him. She ran to the side, turned around, and said with a smile that she wanted to be a good wife for her future husband. After these words, she ran away, leaving his team confused and dissatisfied. After that, when she returned to the counter, she called Ethika and asked if, in order to increase her rank, she decided to carry out the assignment to kill orcs. He said that she said that as if it was something strange. She said with a smile that nothing of the sort was true. Firstly, she was a professional and selected tasks precisely based on people's capabilities. Secondly, she wouldn't give a group led by him such a terrible task. He was surprised by what he heard, turned to them, and asked, wait, when did he become the group leader? Shicha asked with a puzzled look. Who, if not him? Slad was a little taken aback by this and wondered if he could handle it, considering he'd never been a leader before. Selenia showed him a note with the task and said that they needed to kill 30 orcs. Disha read it and, with a displeased look, said that it was a request from that very royal army. She said that they needed to kill orc scouts from the Demon King's army. The payment was piecework. You just needed to kill a limited number of monsters, and it was naturally more impressive than the tasks from the guild itself. And of course, it would help them rank up. They needed to find the orc camp and kill them. He thought that killing one orc gave him 180 gold and another 150 gold for completing the task. It seemed incredibly profitable. Shicha approached her, jumped on the counter, and said that, however, no matter how many similar orders they took, nothing good ever awaited them. They seemed to have killed a hobgoblin, but he was as threatening as an orc, and they didn't really earn anything. She grinned and said it was okay if they didn't want to, since another group had already set out to find the camp. She was surprised by what she heard and asked if as many people as they wanted could participate in this task. She leaned over, grabbed her head, and with a malicious grin, said that everything was correct. If the other group managed to get rid of the required number of orcs much faster, Lady Ethica would miss out on the chance to increase her rank. What would they do then? She was very unhappy about this, and the protagonist, with a calm expression, thought she was trying to get them to pay more, but there was no point, since someone else had already taken on the task. After all, another group of adventurers would simply appear to complete the same task for the reward already assigned. She began to call the royal army greedy, with a displeased expression, and the rest of the team looked at her with puzzled expressions. He stood nearby and said that now he understood everything. It was not for nothing that killing orcs was considered a mandatory condition for rank advancement. The royal army deliberately ensured that as many adventurers as possible decided to participate in this task. From these very warriors, another army was essentially being created. Shicha said loudly that, as expected of King of Adventurers, he immediately saw through their true intentions. She laughed and said that she had only recently arrived in the capital and had no idea what they were talking about. In any case, she recommends taking this quest if they want to rank up. So, do they agree? He agreed. So she took the seal and was about to put it on, but suddenly she grabbed her hand and loudly said that she should stop. She asked loudly, looking crazy, "What is the reward for killing mutants and rare monster species?" She turned to her with a slightly worried look, and said that they always pay the same for any work. She asked with a smirk, "So such monsters should just be avoided? Okay then. She's sure some D-rank group can handle an orc giant or a tyrant for them." Selenia was worried about this, asked her to wait, and said that adventurers should help each other and set a good example for the younger generation. Shicha leaned over, grabbed her head, and said she was right, but adventurers should look out for themselves first. The group decides for itself whether to participate in the battle or not. Or do they not have the right to refuse? MC stood to the side and thought he understood what she was hinting at. If adventurers found colleagues in trouble, they might help out of the kindness of their hearts, but no one would want to do it as a duty unless they were paid. Because for adventurers, adventures are, first and foremost, a job. She said with a sly grin that she, for one, couldn't care less about others. He looked at this and thought that even back when he was in the heroes party, he had learned one very important rule: never interfere in her negotiations. Even Ares had followed this rule in his time. She approached him, hugged him, and said that, especially since he was an SSS-ranked adventurer here, such a respected person should be paid accordingly. Selenia was very displeased with her words, lowered her head, and said that she understood that if they killed particularly strong monsters, she would somehow come to an agreement with the guild master. Shicha was very pleased with this and said that was great, and then they came to an agreement. Disha said that it would not be difficult for her to get rid of an extra mutant on the way. Rumeri stood nearby and said that it couldn't be helped since it was important to her. They began to leave, and she said that now they would receive an additional reward for the monster they would have had to kill anyway. They were surprised, and he said that, however, she had said that she didn't care about the others. She said it was true, but he would definitely fight, and she wouldn't be able to stay away. In any case, there was no time to waste. They needed to kill all the orcs quickly. After some time, they were all riding in a cart together. Ethica started smearing herself with something, and one of the team members noticed and asked what she was doing. She said she was smearing herself with an odor-eliminating potion. Lately, she had started using it before every mission. Rumeri approached her and said that she thought it was just regular perfume. She sniffed it and said that it really didn't smell, but she was too dependent on it. She happily said that they didn't want the scents of goblins and other monsters to linger on their skin, so the seller recommended this potion. Moreover, she wanted to smell good in front of him. Slad turned to her and said that even if she stank, he wouldn't say a word. She was very surprised by what she heard and said loudly that, however, she still didn't want him to even think about it. She looked at them from the side and said that he was the very picture of delicacy. How difficult it would be for her if she married him. He was confused by these words and said that, by the way, it was only the 5 of them who went for the first time. Maybe they should have taken another vanguard with them. She approached her and said that Ethica could summon dwarves, so there shouldn't be any problems. Besides, he was quite capable of standing in the vanguard position alone, so it would be on him. He was very surprised by this, and she turned around and said that they had already discussed everything. Rumeri said that they had also made a decision while he was sleeping. He wondered why they had decided everything for him. They said that the enemy in front of him would immediately weaken, and it would be easier for everyone to fight. By the way, Disha doesn't know about this yet. He said loudly in a worried tone that he had only ever engaged in close combat against goblins. They, with carefree smiles, said that everything would be fine. They would somehow manage. Disha sat in front and said that it seemed like someone was waiting for them behind the rocks. Shicha sat nearby and said that it must be bandits. She turned around and said that her demon detection was not responding and she did not feel the miasma. The girls inside, looking happy, said that he should act. This was his finest hour. They got out of the carriage, and they said that as soon as the bandits appeared, she would shoot an arrow at them. He could consider this happening tactical training. He trembled with fear and thought that there was nothing more frightening than being on the side of the bandits, at whom Sylph was aiming. He was just an ordinary person. He was not capable of this. Disha approached them and asked if they seriously wanted to engage him in close combat. It was too dangerous, after all. The protagonist was overjoyed by her words and hugged her. Ethica said that as soon as he became their target, a fully automatic buff would activate. Rumeri said that, however, if he didn't fight in melee, nothing would activate right away. Shicha said that, besides, they wouldn't abandon him alone. Everything would be fine. Disha thought this over and said that weakening the enemy right away made sense. He was very upset about this, but they said it was fine, because they would fight alongside him and would definitely protect him if necessary. Training before meeting a strong monster would only be beneficial. He was very upset about this and thought how he wished Rumeri were in his place now. He still agreed to try to stand in the vanguard, and Disha approached him and said that she would heal his wounds if necessary, but he still needed to take fewer injuries, so she would cast a protective spell on him. He saw his mother in her, was touched by this, and thought that only she was so kind to him. He wiped away his tears, agreed, and said that everything would be fine. He looked to the side, noticed Little Nightmare, and mentally asked, "Is she here too?" She agreed, and said that this was their shared adventure after all. He said that then he should tell the others about her. She asked him not to do this, and said that if they found out that one of the 16 pillars was among them, they would start to get nervous, and she could not allow that. Besides, there was no time. His opponents were already ready to go into battle. They walked further. Shicha called Rumeri and said that the first blow would be hers. She stepped forward and used the Scorching Mist spell. One of the bandits thought it was magic that created a slightly scorching mist, which is used to detect enemies. However, none of the Basilisk gang was impressed by such a pathetic trick. Suddenly, when the spell took effect, they all screamed loudly in intense pain and started running away from them. MC thought her spells were still merciless. Due to the automatic buff, her Scorching Mist became so powerful that it was hard for the enemy to breathe. Shicha loudly said that she and he would fight those who tried to cross the bridge, and they should attack those who tried to escape. Etika agreed, grabbed her bow, and fired multiple arrows using the summoned Sylph. The remaining bandits loudly called them pathetic freaks, and said that if they wanted to fight so much, they would get it. She ran forward and said with a smile that she would run ahead, and he should back her up. He agreed, and two bandits ran towards her and simultaneously attacked with their axes. She deftly jumped over them and stole the weapons from their hands. They were both confused by this, not understanding where their weapons had disappeared to, and she, with a smirk, showed two axes and asked if this was what they were looking for. At the same time, two other bandits attacked Slad and loudly asked why he was walking around without armor. He understands that this makes him an easy target, right? He looked at them and thought that thanks to the fully automatic debuff, the power of any enemy attack becomes 0. However, he was still incredibly scared and wanted to escape from here as soon as possible. One of the bandits jumped towards him and loudly said that this time he definitely wouldn't miss. He struck a strong blow with his sword, but the blade of his sword broke and fell to the ground. They were both surprised by this, and he thought that this was no longer the effect of his debuff. It turns out that this is the holy armor that she cast on him. Immediately after that, he grabbed the bandit by the clothes, activated the general skill Throw, and thought that after all, the vanguard wasn't for him. Shicha called out to the bandit leader and said he was alone. Did he want to continue this pointless fight? He called out to his comrades in a tired voice and loudly asked if they had already lost. He fell to his knees and said he couldn't take it anymore. She joyfully called out to Rumeri and said she had to deliver the finishing blow. She approached him and cast the forced sleep spell. The rest of the squad ran up to them and said they had dealt with everyone. They noticed the very frightened and tired protagonist and said it was unclear who had defeated whom. She couldn't even imagine that he would be so exhausted from one fight. He asked them not to look at him with such pity, and they said that he shouldn't be upset, but he easily defeats goblins. He said in a dissatisfied tone that this was not at all comforting. Disha sat down on a stone and said that putting him in the vanguard had been a bad idea from the start. His physical skills are rather mediocre. He can stand in the vanguard only thanks to a fully automatic buff. Tactics make sense against stupid goblins, but not against humans. Rumeri approached him, apologized, and said that they shouldn't have forced him to do this. He said that they shouldn't blame themselves because he thought he could handle it. She sat next to him and said that despite this, he was still a hero to her. He stroked her head and thought that he was still sad, but these words made him feel a little better. Ethica pointed at the tied-up bandits and asked what they would do with them. She just said they would take the leader with them and bring him to the nearest town, and the roadside guards would take the rest. She was surprised by this and asked, "Will they just take the leader and leave the others here?" She smirked and said that the leader usually had the highest reward. Disha said they wouldn't be able to take them all anyway. If the guards arrived, they would be hanged or sent to atone for their sins in the mines. If the monsters outran the guards, then it was God's will, and they would answer for their deeds in blood. She could only assist by using lighting or washing their bodies with holy water so that they wouldn't turn into undead after death if the monsters ate them. She looked worried and said that meant they would die either way. The bandit leader woke up, looked mad, and loudly agreed, asking if she didn't feel sorry for them. They would leave them to be eaten by monsters. That was too cruel. They should go their separate ways. He promised that they would no longer attack anyone. They only had to untie them. Shicha called Romary again, asking for her help, and she used a word of truth spell. After that, she leaned towards him and asked what he would do if they untied him. He chuckled at this and said loudly that he would do the same as before. He would continue robbing and killing. Those were the best things in this world. He was about to say something about what they would do to them, but she immediately ordered him to be quiet, saying that she had heard it herself. They would not become model citizens, would not go to the temple to atone for their sins, and would not take knightly vows. These guys are like Ares. They see joy in terrible things. Upon hearing about him, she immediately suggested leaving, and she sighed and said that at least he had helped them in some way. MC thought he was glad that Ethica understood that there were those who were not worthy of sympathy. After some time, they stopped on the road, looked to the side and asked, "The orcs came here from these mountains, right?" Romary said that they came from the north of the mountains, to be more precise. That's where the lands of orcs and demons are located. They went on and said that up until the Great War 50 years ago, this territory belonged to them, but His Majesty Cassive reclaimed these possessions. So this man is good at more than just drinking alcohol? So this territory is the border of the kingdom of Saywood, right? That's right. The Idra Mountains are famous for their difficult terrain, so it's impossible to send an army there, and adventurers are the ones who kill orcs and other undead. In that case, why not block the mountain roads, thereby protecting the orcs? It would work as a temporary measure, but there was a high risk that the orcs would simply start digging tunnels, which would cause even more destruction. Orcs aren't very smart. They'll see an obstacle and go through it, whether they were meant to get to the other side or not. He called Shicha and said that she should look for traces of the orcs while they rested. After she found it, she returned to them and told them about it. They went forward, and she said that the orcs were too stupid to cover their tracks. Finding them wouldn't be that hard. There was an orc camp up ahead. There were about 10 of them, no mutants. So what would they do? Romary, looking very inspired, said that she could fry them with her magic. Slad, looking a little worried, said that, however, they came here so that Ethica could increase her rank. She stood up happily and said loudly that she got the hint and could handle them herself. He hid behind a rock and said that she should deal with at least most of them and be careful. She turned to him and said that she had planned to burn them with the salamander, but since that was the case, she would use the sylph bow. Disha said that she would cast holy armor on her just in case. Romary said that she would use a magic title then. Ethica looked at them happily and thanked them for it. They were embarrassed by this and said that there was no need to thank her. They were a team after all, so she would further enhance her defense just in case. Muscle strengthening could be used. By the way, why not use all the strengthening spells? The protagonist looked at them from the side and asked if this wasn't too much for a fight with ordinary orcs. Shicha sat next to him, looking at him with a grin, and he was confused and asked what was wrong with her. She said that a familiar smile simply adorned his face. He had the same smile during his time working with Ares, when he took care of the others. By the way, now she understood how he felt then. He was surprised, called her, and thought that because of the influence of the past, not long ago, she kept her distance from everyone. He raised his head and with a small smile said that he was glad to hear it. After some time, they set up camp. She knocked on the ground and said that Ethica had fallen asleep. He with a small smile said that it was good. She had expended a lot of energy fighting the orcs. Romary looked at him and asked what was wrong with him. He asked, hypothetically, could she have been strong from the very beginning? Disha asked why he had such thoughts. She hadn't even fought goblins. She was a newbie. Romary said that, however, she really did perform better than usual in the last battle. She hit every orc in the head or heart without missing a beat. However, it was all thanks to his fully automatic buff, wasn't it? He looked at the bonfire and said that he thought so. Ares also received a buff from it, but she did much better than him now, and the former hero also had a holy sword. Disha said that if you think about it, he was right. He said that once upon a time he was in a party with a couple of E-rank adventurers. They also benefited from the buff, although it wasn't as strong, at least until he leveled up. She asked, even if that was true, isn't it good that she is so strong? He said that it was good, and he was happy for her. Romary approached him and asked, then why was his face like that? He said that she couldn't feel her power because of him. As soon as she became an adventurer, she immediately joined him. So she believes that she has achieved everything only thanks to his buff. An adventurer who doesn't even know what he is capable of. She approached him and said with a smile that they both don't realize how strong they are. She left, and he said with a small smile that ethics is really strong, and he is only strong due to skill. It got quite cold. He will go get more firewood. He left, and she called him. After he walked away, she screamed very loudly. A wide smile appeared on her face, and Disha was very confused about this and tried to ask something. A little later, in front of all the team members, Rumeri said loudly that they should all listen to her carefully. She wanted to discuss something with them. The reason she gathered them here is because she wants to share with them a brilliant plan. It is called the New Heroes Plan. She pointed her finger at him, and they were all very surprised by what had happened. MC ran up to her, about to ask something, and Shicha called her and was about to say something about his skills. He loudly agreed and said that because of his unique skill, he was even kicked out of the squad once, and they still haven't found a job because of it. Disha, with a slight smile, said that on this continent, they called him the invincible unemployed. Etika said that he doesn't have the skills befitting a hero. Rumeri said that he doesn't need any hero skills, it's enough for him to just act like a real hero. He didn't understand anything at all and asked if she was hinting at him using his buff more often, however, doing it constantly. She said that she was always thinking about how he should act, so that he would be considered a hero. Is it possible to come up with a way to use the buff effect specifically on him? Is it possible to cancel the skill penalty? She thought about coming up with some kind of elixir that would help solve this problem. She looked at them and said that she saw that they did not share her point of view. For mages, an adventure is essentially an eternal search for answers to such things. No matter how hard they try and no matter how many times they fail, they won't stop. That's just how mages are. They found it frightening, and he thought he now understood what her mother had taught her. She said that when she learned Ares' true identity, she was very disappointed, but she didn't want to give up. She thought a lot, and she took incredible pleasure in concocting a potion that would discourage him from any interest in the opposite sex. Shicha said she could be quite a sadist. Rumeri went to her and said that, unfortunately, since he was considered a hero, he had mental stability, and therefore she wanted to ask her forgiveness. She was surprised by this and loudly asked what she had to do with it. She hid from her behind a stone and said that she didn't know what she was planning, but she was asking for mercy. She turned away, walked away, and said she'd been distracted and was asking to be allowed to continue. The buff's effect increases with leveling, but as he'd said, there were many nuances, so she reconsidered the concept of the plan itself. If it's impossible to activate the buff in advance, she simply needed to become stronger. All she needed was to transfer her immense power to him. She said she now understood why she'd asked for forgiveness. Rumeri knelt before her and said she was asking for forgiveness, but she had no one else to turn to. She just said she didn't care as much as she used to, especially since she owed her a favor. Ethika became concerned about this and asked what they were even talking about. She said Ares had always asked her to use her thief skill, which allowed her to steal and turn skills into candy. If he ate that candy, he could obtain her skill. She was still kneeling, loudly asking for forgiveness, and said that she knew that she hated using this skill, but she was asking to steal her enormous power. She looked at her and said that since she knew about it, she should stop and surrender. She raised her head and loudly said that she was a mage, and she did not need this skill. She didn't even use it. However, this skill would be useful to him. Slad called her in a worried tone, but she didn't pay attention and loudly said that she was sure that he would use it for good and for its intended purpose. It would be much more useful to him than to her. She still agreed, approached her, and with a small smile said that they could try. She can still return it back to her if necessary. After that, she activated her ability, ran up to her, touched her body and took a small candy. Rumeri was very surprised by what happened. Her body began to shake and she fell to the ground, but he managed to run to her and caught her. Shicha looked at the candy and said, "Here it is, a skill of immense power." He turned to her and thought, did she just steal this skill from her? It was incredibly difficult to see how she could steal a skill. She called out to her and asked, she had this skill since birth, right? Because of this, her body needed to learn to control it in order to live a normal life. Most of her body's muscles simply cannot function without this skill. In other words, she cannot move normally without it. She reached for her staff, tried to stand up, and said in a tense tone that she still wanted to give it to him. They could see she could stand on her own. She tried to pretend everything was fine, but she became worried when Disha called her and said she didn't want to upset her. But if it weren't for his buff, she wouldn't have been able to move a finger. She was shocked by this, and Shicha said that she had already explained this to Ethika. Skills can't be considered separately from their owner. Even if she thinks she doesn't need this skill, her body says otherwise, so she has to take her skill back. Immediately after that, she fed her the candy back. After some time, at night, the protagonist left the tent, went to her, and said that she did a great job on guard duty. She turned to him and asked why he came. It was still too early for the guard change. He agreed, and said that, however, he wanted to check on her. She said that Rumeri had already apologized for reminding her of old wounds. She's fine, really. She handed him the soup. He thanked her for it, and she said that she was more worried about her. She asked her about it only because of him. She had encountered skill theft before, and should have known that bringing it up risked sowing discord in the group. In short, helping him was much more important to her than their entire group, although she herself didn't seem to even realize it. He thought that he didn't believe it. She valued them all equally. Their group was one of the few places where she, a half-breed, could feel at home. She asked if he remembered how she joined the hero's group. At first, she was drawn to Ares, but his mask of kindness didn't last even a week. He remembered this and thought that it was true. Even after she learned the whole truth about him, he supported her every day. He said that, however, the desire to help him become stronger. Before, he was just a good-natured porter to her. However, after he saved her from the demons, she changed her mind and was sincerely grateful to him. Shicha agreed and said that their attitude had definitely improved. When she learned the truth about his skill, her eyes lit up. She was happy to learn that the one she looked up to wasn't just a kind porter, but an SSS-ranked adventurer. At that moment, she said she wanted him to become a hero. He remembers that, right? Back then, Rumeri called him her personal jobless hero. She didn't understand what she meant at the time, so she ignored it. Among them, she admires this hero the most. In any case, it's best to keep an eye on her. She clearly doesn't intend to give up on her plan. She went into the tent and wished him a successful guard. He looked at the soup in his hands and wondered if he was a hero in Rumeri's eyes. They may be comrades, but he still doesn't know much about them. The incident with Ares strengthened the bond between them, but they still have a long way to go in getting to know each other. The next morning, they walked carefully through the forest, and Disha said that there were 6 monsters infected with miasma ahead. Shicha ran ahead and said that she would check now. The 4 of them remained and said that she was really so cool. Why did she suddenly bring this up? Unexpectedly, why doesn't she say it to her face? Although she admits, stealing skills seemed like an incredible ability to her too. Ethica said with a smile that just think, she is capable of not only stealing others' skills, but also giving them to others, or even taking them for herself. She said it was incredible, but something else was even more surprising. After yesterday, she was convinced that if she wanted to, she could defeat anyone. The others turned to her and asked how strong her ability was. She thought she was exaggerating. She said that she could give them a clear example. What would happen if she stole her spirit priestess skill? She was very surprised by what she heard and said loudly that she would never do that to her. Disha was a little confused and said that they should just assume. She said that she didn't even want to imagine it. She said that they couldn't remain friends, and not only that. Spirit priestess allows you to communicate with other spirits. In other words, she will lose everything. MC thought with a surprised look. He understands that this is a common reasoning, but why does it hurt so much? She said in a calm tone that she would also lose all her class skills, including spirit summoning. Similarly, with her holy power or witch quality, he thought she was right. Adventurers, like demons, draw their strength from class skills obtained during their journey or completing forbidden missions. She said that the witch quality will allow her to use all types of magic. However, there is nothing to take from him. They crawled towards him, and she said that unique skills couldn't be stolen, and besides, he didn't have a class, nor any class skills accordingly. He said loudly, looking worried, that he could, however, use provoke or throw, and that those could also be stolen. Rumeri said that those were just general skills that she already had. The girls hugged each other, and he looked at them and wondered why he felt like an outcast. Shicha returned, the girls grabbed her, and she asked what they were even doing. They said that she loved her and that she had done a great job. She said loudly, in a displeased tone, that they were too close. She had a bad feeling about this. Disha watched this from the sidelines and said with a smile that she was very glad that she was a good person and would not use her gift to harm her loved ones. She asked if she could report what she saw already. There were 6 individuals ahead, all high orcs. She said with a slightly worried look that who would have thought they would enter the kingdom's lands. However, had she seen the royal army? She said only their equipment and nothing more. Ethica turned and asked, were they really that strong? Rumeri said that high orcs were a type of demon. Slad thought that most people mistakenly called them mutated orcs, but physiologically speaking, they were demons, not ordinary monsters. Ordinary orcs were divided into types of work. High orcs, however, were still considered fighters. He said that they should be feared precisely for their class skills. Ethica, looking worried, said that then, they definitely should be more careful. Shicha, smiling, said that she shouldn't be nervous. They didn't know about their existence, so it was possible to catch them off guard. Disha said victory wouldn't be easy, but they had all the advantages. Rumeri called her over and said she'd cornered Zerhani once, so they could handle this too. Ithaca happily agreed, saying she'd fought a demon before. Immediately after, the 2 of them ran toward the monsters, using powerful magic, causing massive explosions. The rest of the team covered their faces with their hands because of the dust that had risen, and he said it looked like they didn't need their help. They both looked at what was left after their attack and asked, is that all? She was right, it was easy. Disha said that without Ares, dealing with the monsters had become much easier. It seemed to be thanks to Ethica. The protagonist said he was reveling in the idea of delivering the finishing blow, which prevented her from using her powerful spells. She said that now, if additional protection was needed, they can always summon the gnome. Rumeri said that he should either be put on the front lines. He immediately refused, thinking that the enemies hadn't even had time to do anything. They'd simply been prevented from attacking with destructive magic. All that remained was to prevent the remaining orcs from escaping. Sylph's strategy of using wind to enhance the fireball was very effective. Their team is so powerful thanks to them. Ethika said that she, by the way, realized then that he was essentially their local strategist. Rumeri agreed and said that he always comes up with excellent tactics. She was very happy about this, hugged her, and said that she understood her. Disha, with a thoughtful look, said that if you think about it, it was he who came up with the tactic of using Ares as bait. She turned to her and asked if she hadn't come up with it. MC said that he had rejected all his ideas, so he asked her to suggest such a strategy for him. This tactic was combined with his reckless ideas, which he could only execute thanks to the sacred armor. Rumeri approached him and, with a joyful expression, loudly declared that, in essence, he was the power broker, manipulating him from behind the scenes. He, looking confused, said that without knowing the context, it felt like he was some kind of villain. She called him her hero again, and he said that it wasn't just his strategy. The orcs themselves probably weren't that strong. Shicha said he was mistaken there. They were very strong indeed. Through appraisal, she discovered that their weapons and armor were of first-class quality. Plus, they had items that increased magic resistance. They were elite fighters from the Overlord's army, and she also found a written order from the Demon King. He was worried about this and thought they were getting into all this just to raise the ethics rank. But in the end, they found something truly important. Disha looked at her and thought that this was somehow unlike her. Usually, when she finds something valuable, she immediately tells everyone about it, but now she was too quiet. When she heard about the order from the Demon King, she ran up to her and asked, "Is this really a joke?" She held it in her hands with a tense expression and said that it seemed the Overlord had given these high orcs some kind of secret mission. This meant that based on the contents, they would be able to track the movements of the Demon King's army and, as a result, get clues that would lead them to him. After some time, they returned to the guild, told each other what had happened, and Selenia loudly asked, "What did he just say? Maybe there was one high orc and the other 6 were ordinary?" This attracted the attention of the people around, and Slad, with a worried look, wondered if it was really that hard to believe. Rumeri used magic to place a number of items on the floor and said they would also like to sell this. She was very surprised by what she saw, and she said that this was high orc equipment. It was all made of a lightweight material, mithril, so it wouldn't be difficult to carry. He guessed that the magic she used was called hyper-compression. She shrunk the items for ease of carrying, but didn't change their weight, which perfectly matched their unprecedented power. Selenia was very surprised by this and loudly said that they were heading to the district near the capital. In that case, what were they doing near the Idra Mountains? He thought her concern was justified. The C and E rank group reached the mountains from where demons were arriving, and not just any demons, but ones wearing special equipment. If less prepared adventurers had been in their place, they would have died there. Shicha approached her and said that, by the way, in addition to the equipment, they found an order from the Demon King. She was very surprised by this and understood everything. Etika, looking happy, said that they shouldn't think they'd forgotten about the bonus for battling strong monsters. She calmly agreed, and the protagonist thought he expected her to be shocked, but surprisingly, she took it calmly. Selenia said that, however, the guildmaster is not here right now. Would they be okay with receiving the reward tomorrow? Disha agreed, and Shicha, with a slightly displeased look, said that everything was as she thought. She had wanted to introduce them to the guildmaster from the very beginning. Etika was surprised by this and asked, however, wasn't it in their interests to receive the additional reward? She said with a small smile that in general it was true. They needed to meet with the guildmaster to discuss the amount of the reward. However, she had already sought to introduce her to the guildmaster before that. At least their interests did not conflict. She was very upset and said that it turned out she had deceived them. She denied this and said that she had managed to obtain a generous reward for them. She should remember the art of negotiation in seeking mutual benefit. Dictating your terms is a sign of unprofessionalism. Selenia said with a smile that as an apology, she was asking to be allowed to treat them to dinner tonight. She ran up to him and, with a cheerful look, said that they should properly rest and enjoy the food after a difficult journey. Etika, in a displeased tone, loudly said that she should take her hands off him. She said with a smirk that, as she had said earlier, they had nothing to worry about. Later, they came to the tavern and began to eat and drink a lot. Shicha raised her mug and said that they should drink to her rank increase. Disha looked at her and, with a slightly worried look, asked how many mugs this was already. Rumeri, with a displeased look, said that she was drinking like an old man. She leaned towards her and asked who drinks this sweet stuff anyway. She looked at her and said that it was actually Alswale, a very strong drink. She looked at them and said that they couldn't pour them anymore. They should see. Ethik had already become ill. She started hiccuping with a red face and said that everything was fine. She said that was not true at all. She called him and asked why he didn't keep an eye on her. MC thought that wine from a luxury hotel was great, but nothing compared to alcohol among comrades. He never thought that he would ever again be able to just drink in a tavern like an ordinary adventurer. Shicha said that in any case, they were getting closer to their goal. Romary turned to her and asked, is she talking about ethics rank promotion? She denied it, called her stupid, and said that her goal was to make this group S rank. Disha said that if they wanted to take any orders, A rank would be enough. She said with a smile that, however, by becoming an S rank group, they would get rid of all the bureaucratic hassle. They would not be slaves to current circumstances. They would be able to do only what they wanted with all their hearts. She didn't have time to finish because a man approached them, apologized, and asked if he was Sir Slad by any chance. He turned around at the voice with a frightened look and agreed. He felt some strange feeling coming from him, and he said with a smile that he was right. What luck. He looked at this guy and thought that he literally exuded darkness. Even darkness was nothing compared to this all-consuming darkness, like the piercing gaze of a raven looking into the soul. The stranger leaned towards him and said that he had brought them simply wonderful news. He looked at him nervously and asked if he and his group were currently celebrating a rank increase. Maybe they could discuss it later? This caught his attention, and he said that, however, he already had an SSS rank. He agreed and said that, however, this was not about him, but about his comrades. He said with a thoughtful look that he asked for the benefit of the doubt. This group did not deserve the honor of being called his comrades. He needed allies who could go to the top with him shoulder to shoulder. The protagonist became angry at what he heard, clenched his hand into a fist, and said that he had the nerve to insult his comrades in such a way without even introducing himself. He asked, so he didn't understand him? He is Weiss, the leader of the Feast of Triumph clan, known as the Black Crow. He bowed with an insolent grin and asked, did he remember him now? He thought that a clan was an association of several groups of adventurers. They distributed orders from the guild among themselves and took on joint missions that were available only to clan members. It was an unofficial but tolerated form of organization by the guild. He said with a serious expression that he had never heard his name before. He was surprised by this, and Shicha said that the Banquet of Triumph was one of the influential clans in the kingdom, the core of which was made up of A-rank adventurers. He looked at her with a displeased expression and said that right now he was talking to this gentleman, not to them. She said that if he wanted to take their leader, then this conversation concerned them too. She put her hand behind her back and crossed her index and middle fingers. MC noticed this and thought that usually in groups, there were signs that only the members of the group understood, like this one, meaning not to succumb to provocation. Weiss said they'd better discuss it among themselves. If they knew who they were, they should understand that interfering wasn't the best idea. She said with a calm expression that she didn't expect the Black Crow leader himself to come recruiting anyone. So who told him about this? He said with a smirk that his informant preferred to keep their identity secret. Unfortunately, details were a clan privilege. He turned to him, called out, and asked if he'd like to join them. He refused with a serious expression and said he was quite satisfied with the group he was currently in. He turned around and said that then he'd be leaving them for today. However, he should get to know them better and only then make a decision. Unexpectedly for everyone, Ethica, with a displeased expression, splashed alcohol from her mug on him. He was very worried about this and thought that although she knew the code gestures, she was too drunk to understand it. She said loudly in a displeased tone that she didn't know who he was, but she wouldn't let him take him. He became very angry about this, grabbed her by the throat, and said that as he could see, she had no manners. He wanted to know how many vulgar outfits like hers could be bought with this one suit. Slad became very angry with his behavior and said that he should get his filthy hands off her. He would repeat it to him again. He should get his hands off his comrade. He was surprised by his strength, let her go, politely agreed, and said that he in no way wanted to become his enemy. His words attracted Shicha's attention, and she wondered how much this guy knew about him. Weiss went to the exit and said that he was sorry that their first meeting went the way it did, but as he said earlier, he was not saying goodbye to them. He thought with a self-confident grin that he would eventually come to him on his own. Ethica stood up and said loudly that she would pay him back for this 1,000 times over, but scum like him would never see him again. He approached Selenia and said that he apologized for such a mess. He gave her the money with a quick wave of his hand and said that she could consider it an apology. Shicha took a sip from her mug and said that one of the reasons she wanted to make the group S-ranked was so that such freaks wouldn't even dare open their mouths in their direction. A little later, the protagonist was carrying a drunk Erika. She called out to him and said that he had become so strong. He thought that this wasn't the first time she had touched him. He needed to pull himself together. He called out to her and said that she should stop. Maybe she would go herself? She said that she would always be by his side. He remembered that Shicha also teased him by saying that he should try not to eat her on the way. He thought it would be faster to go through the back streets, but then there was a chance of running into bandits. Given her condition, it was better not to risk it, so he could only endure. Several bandits approached him and asked if they could help him carry the girl. He was surprised by this and wondered what kind of stereotypical killers these were. They were walking towards him and said that they could also escort him to bed. He wondered, in the end, they were even accosted on the main street. He said that they should not waste time on people like them. They said that he should not be modest. This girl will only get in the way of such a weakling. He should let them make his life easier. She heard this, woke up and asked, did they call her a burden? To say such a thing to a girl? Their mother did not teach them what is allowed to say to a girl and what is not. She summoned a huge spirit, which with its attack threw them very high into the air. She came up to him, climbed on his back and said that he should praise her for that. He agreed, thanked her, moved on and thought that in the future, when she was drunk, she shouldn't say anything. Later, Weiss found them in an alley, doused them with water and loudly told them that they should wake up. They knelt before him and loudly said that they were asking for forgiveness. They failed. He said with a serious look that he didn't care. He never expected them to succeed anyway. He thought that everything didn't go according to plan, but he wanted to see with his own eyes that very automatic debuff that was rumored. So, without further ado, he ordered them to kidnap the elf. He thought about something and asked, they can summon spirits, right? One of them agreed, and he said that it seemed like just yesterday this elf was an E rank, like them. Would they be able to summon the same spirit? One of them said loudly in horror that they would never be able to handle this. Even if it was for a moment, her Nomu was simply enormous. He thought that initially, this was a group of heroes who eventually decided to continue their activities as adventurers. Therefore, among people, they are considered quite strong, but not her. Does this girl, despite her inexperience, really have such power? Or does this guy, do he really have something besides an automatic debuff? He planned to use her as a hostage. However, he still had plenty of trump cards. He said that this SSS-ranked adventurer would be his. Later, MC stood outside and thought that he somehow put Ethic to bed and was very tired. So much had happened that day. He hoped that the cool night air would help him clear his mind and calm his anxiety. But what exactly was bothering him? Maybe it was him? At that very moment, Weiss appeared next to him, called him, and said, what a coincidence this is. He was surprised to meet him and asked what he was doing here. He said it was just an accident, nothing more. He thought it was impossible. The headquarters of the Feast of Triumph is in another part of the city. So he was following them? He asked with a friendly smile if he would like to have a drink with him. He refused and thought that he not only couldn't stand this man, but hated him, although he rarely had such feelings for anyone. He didn't even understand why he hated him so much. He started to leave, and he asked if he didn't want to know the reason. He wanted him to know about the Feast of Triumph, or rather, about him. He should think about his comrades. Wouldn't this information be useful to them? However, he shouldn't misunderstand. He has no evil intentions. As said earlier, he doesn't want to become his enemy. Later, they came to an establishment where the waitress brought them dishes and poured wine. Weiss said that if he was interested in a certain hostess and wanted to spend the night with her, he could say so. This bar belonged to his clan. Slad thought that beautiful girls, delicious food, wine, and first-class service were a wonderful establishment. However, he got up from his chair and said that he was not going to join his clan. He sat calmly in place and said that it seemed they really did dislike him. He said that his comrades had already told him about him, the leader of the Feast of Triumph clan, known as the Black Crow, a cold-blooded guy who does not shy away from any means to expand his clan. They have close ties with the Thieves Guild, and he often cooperates with them. He is also acquainted with many aristocrats in the kingdom, which is why no one can tell him what to do. Weiss said with a slight smile that to be honored with such words from him was the greatest honor for an adventurer. Would he reconsider his decision? An adventurer with 3 titles and an SSS rank? They would offer him complete freedom, money, wine, women, everything he desired and guarantee luxurious conditions. He asked, however, why he wanted him specifically. He asked, wasn't it obvious? It was to rise even higher. Soon he would be recognized as an S-rank adventurer. But that was not enough. He needed more fame and victories. Could an adventurer have any other goal? All he was required to do was formally be listed in his organization. That would be enough for all the other clans to treat them with respect. The protagonist stood up from his chair again and thought that now he understood why he felt such hatred towards him. He asked, so he was like a piece of furniture to him? Weiss asked in a calm tone. Did he mind that? An automatic debuff is just decoration for him, right? More precisely, it is just an appendix to the skill. However, aren't skills just luck? If you're lucky, you got it. If you're unlucky, then no. He just happened to be among the lucky ones. That's all. He's probably bothered by the difference in their values, but that's a small thing. As long as he joins the clan, he can continue to hate him, perceive him as a poisonous snake. He doesn't mind. If he wishes, they will never see him again. If his current group is so dear to him, he is ready to accept them too. He just needs him to join the clan. He should just join the clan. That's all that is required of him. He was always told the opposite. He thought that, however, he didn't need his skill, only the name and status. MC called him and said that he would tell him directly. He agrees that he has always been lucky. He could just wait for the enemies to fall dead on their own. However, it was not fun at all. Weiss said the last words with him and said that they finally agreed. He too didn't find such adventures interesting. After this conversation, he walked down the street, followed by a member of the Feast of Triumph clan, an A-rank thief, Bertha, who said, "This is very interesting. This is a young man who doesn't do what the clan leader demands of him.